Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the D in WhatIf, with another fanfiction. This is the first part of What If Deku failed the entrance exam for UA. All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Chapter 1, Secondary Options. Chapter Text. So, back to the beginning. For those of you who are new, welcome. To those of you who have read this before, good to see you again. This will serve as the start to a small remaster, though I feel that label is a bit too grand as I'm mostly just doing a more thorough proofread of these early chapters, maybe changing around some wording to make things a touch more coherent. All part of my endeavors to branch this story off of its original website. Well, enjoy. Notes at the bottom. It was here, an innocuous little envelope sitting on his desk. Izuku stared it down, returning to an old nervous habit as he drummed his fingers across the polished wood finish. At the very least, he wasn't mumbling incoherently. With a final push of courage, the boy seized the package in both hands, giving a firm, savage rip which tore the envelope in half. A curious little discus clomped against the desktop. This was supposed to be his exam results. Midoriya threw his arms in front of his face, shielding his eyes from the sudden flash that filled the room. Squinting at the space just above the flattened disc, Izuku eyed the holographic display. A loading screen. Booyah, I am here as a projection. The young hero hopeful almost fell out of his chair when his mentor's face flashed into existence with a terrific yelp. He'd just managed to catch himself on the edge of a bookshelf, staring in awe at the visage of his all-time favorite hero. All Might. Why is he? The pro-hero backed away from the presumed camera, revealing his garb of a golden, pinstriped suit. It was so far removed from his hero costume that Izuku twice attempted to rub the image from his vision. The man was even wearing a tie. I'm sure you have questions, the projected All Might boomed, thrusting his invincible chest forward. Well, to answer the obvious, you're looking at the newest UA faculty member. Midoriya all but swooned. The thought of learning under the tutelage of the #1 hero in a premium institute like UA was simply beyond words. Reality rushed back, and as Izuku remembered he had not gotten a definite confirmation of his results. All Might cleared his throat with a short cough, and then another. The unnecessary action did not bode well. Young Midoriya, I would like to take a moment aside to show you something. Please watch this. All Might raised his left palm. A rectangular screen with a short round of footage playing atop it. Wait, is that? Izuku perked up at the person on display, a familiar head of chestnut hair and the rosiest case of perma blush there ever was. The girl with the gravity quirk stood in view of the camera, engaged in a tentative conversation with who appeared to be present Mike. Sound filtered into Midoriya's room, clear as a bell, the girl launching into a small tirade. Is it possible for me to give him some of my points? I mean, it's just ridiculous that someone could take out that giant robot and not receive anything for it. She's talking about me. Izuku flattened his palm over his heart, clutching the loose fabric of his shirt. He honestly could not remember the last time someone other than his mother had spoken out on his behalf like that. The girl on display continued, he saved me. I was the reason he couldn't get any villains. She paused, taking a single, calming breath. So please, can't you just? Present Mike moved for the first time, leaning forward to lay a hand on the girl's shoulder. Though the pro-hero was facing away from the camera, the moment of silence painted a solemn air about the scene. And then he spoke, I'm sorry. That was it. The flat finality in his tone, when present Mike was known as one of Japan's liveliest heroes, was all the evidence Izuku needed. A glaring crack formed, running right through him. It's great that you want to help that young man, but it's out of either of our hands now. That's just the way the exam is. He watched the girl's expression fall, her stature slumping in defeat. The boy swore he saw the makings of tears forming in the corners of her eyes. The sight did little to help Izuku's own growing despair, but the sentiment was welcome. Present Mike released his grasp on the girl's shoulder, instead plopping his palm atop her head. But hey, the exam proctor reprised. Don't feel too bad for the kid. He showed a lot of heart out there. I doubt he's the type of guy to sit down and surrender. Present Mike finished with a sure thumbs up, contrasting the girl's silent bewilderment. The footage ended and All Might's smiling visage returned, though somewhat lacking its usual luster. Midoriya, my boy, I'm sure by now you already know, but I have to make your results official. The camera tracked the gold-clad hero as he rounded a small, circular desk, grasping a short stack of documents. All Might slapped them twice against the tabletop to bring the sheets into alignment. Izuku Midoriya, applicant number 290. You passed the written test with a score in the range of average. However, you scored no combat points in the physical portion of the exam. Izuku looked away, unable to meet even the eyes of a recording of his mentor. I know, he whispered, tone hollow and empty, I know that I failed. The papers snapped against the desktop, snatching back Midoriya's attention. All Might's expression brightened. On the other hand, for the selfless rescue of your fellow examinee, Ochako Uraraka, 60 savior points were added to your score. Izuku lifted, the triumph in his mentor's voice too infectious to ignore. For a moment, that tiny ember of hope inside the boy blazed white-hot. Then All Might delivered the final verdict. With a total score of 60, Izuku Midoriya, you did not pass the minimum score of 65 in order to pass the physical exam. I'm sorry. And there it was. Izuku was no longer in his room, being told his future by the world's #1 hero. He was a 4-year-old, sitting on a stool in a clinic office, being told his future by a stoic doctor as his mother stood by. Despair took hold of him entirely, and in short order he let it go. Midoriya was not that young boy, innocent and full of promise. Living had tempered those views, hardened them against the harsh reality of the world. Izuku had grown accustomed to adversity, to being the constant failure amongst his peers. Being turned away by Yue was a crushing blow, but present Mike's words from earlier rang truer than ever. Izuku Midoriya was not ready to surrender. The holographic All Might thrust a hand forward, pointer raised to the sky. But there is another score I wish to share with you. Izuku watched his idol scan back over the sheet of paper, hand returning to his mouth to block a short round of coughing. Here she is. Applicant number 291, Ochako Uraraka, another middle-of-the-road score in the written exam. For the physical portion, a final score of 32 combat points, and for the return rescue of Izuku Midoriya, an additional 35 savior points. The boy shifted through perhaps the entire emotional spectrum during All Might's long delivery. Confusion at the mention of another score. Wonder at the name of the girl with the gravity quirk, disappointment and anger at the meager combat score, and joyous relief at the knowledge that the additional savior points had put her over the bar to pass. In spite of his own shortcomings tonight, Midoriya couldn't stop the happiness welling up within him at Uraraka's success. He would never have chosen to do otherwise, but it was lifting to know there had been true merit in his sacrifice. Sacrifice. Do you understand, young Midoriya? Again the boy's gaze was drawn to All Might, the hero's usual shine back in full force. Once again, in some small way, your actions have shaped the future. That girl will be attending one of the most prestigious institutions of heroics in the entire world. All Might drew closer to the screen, pointing straight at the stunned youth on the other side. You are responsible for this, young Midoriya, not just because you saved that girl, but because you inspired her to save another. You're already building up quite the track record here. Izuku laughed, a trail of tears leaking from one eye even as mirth overtook him. In the several months he'd personally spent alongside the pro hero, he still had yet to appreciate just how encouraging All Might could be. That booming voice and endless grin were too infectious for words. I know you're disappointed with the end results, but failure is a part of life whether you're a high school student or the symbol of peace. Don't think of this as an end, Midoriya, just a small detour. Go beyond. The sentence hung and Izuku found himself nodding on reflex, a stern determination settling upon his features. Oh, All Might chirped, smacking the base of his palm against his brow. One last thing. Yes, this will be the last thing. The last, I swear. All Might was hollering off to the side, likely arguing with whoever was overseeing this video. Now then, young Midoriya, if you would be so kind as to turn this disc over once this video concludes. And it did, the recording cutting to black in an instant. Midoriya blinked, slow and singular, staring at the empty space formerly occupied by the video projection. He blinked again, slow and singular, as his gaze lowered, focusing on the circular device resting on his desk. Izuku remained still, silent, almost in anticipation of something. It would have been so much simpler if the small projector could grow limbs of its own and flip itself over. The boy found his own arms lacking in any form of strength at the moment. With tremendous effort did Midoriya will himself into motion. The time it took to reach across for the dormant discus seemed to stretch on forever, reality coming to a grinding halt as his fingers made contact. He gulped, happily able to admit his own fright at what he would see on the other side of that device. The disc clattered back atop the table's surface, a message and marker written along its curved body, meet at Dagaba, 8 p.m. on the 7th. The day after tomorrow. Not nearly enough time to organize his thoughts. The night wasn't as clear as advertised by the weatherman, a good bit of cloud cover obscuring the sky. But the moon was relentless, its waxing crescent casting a brilliant shine. It was in that glow that Midoriya saw him, his gaunt form and baggy clothes framed against the shifting reflection of the ocean waves. The blonde-haired man perked at his approach, head turning just slightly to the side. Izuku froze at the barest glimpse of his idol's dark gaze, the silence broken only by the lapping of sea against shore. All Might turned fully towards his months-long protégé. A moment passed before the skeletal man unleashed a pleasant smile, raising a hand in greeting. The pro-hero was barely given time to blink before Midoriya was upon him, racing across the sand at speeds that would make a Quickster proud. With a harsh grunt he caught the fanboy against his chest, a pair of arms gaining a firm grip around his diminished midsection. His next action was instinctive, placing one hand atop the mess of green curls. All Might didn't need the boy to speak to understand what was being said. The number one hero declaring in soft voice, "It's okay, you have nothing to feel sorry for." Izuku allowed the last of his frustrations to run free. One last pool of tears before he could allow himself to move on. He had done his best and All Might recognized that. There was nothing else to say. The two stayed like that for a short time, letting emotions play out. When Izuku removed himself from his mentor, his eyes were still glazed with tears and a sizable wet spot was visible on All Might's tee. Regardless, a familiar strength had built up in Midoriya's form. All Might offered a broad grin in return. "Young Midoriya," the pro-hero began, "I have some news. There's an offer for you." The boy couldn't help the sudden sense of confusion. So this was the first multi-chapter story I uploaded onto ff.net and the starting point for my current schedule of updating. At the point of this update's posting, it's been near 2.5 years. Time flies. For those unawares of how my updating schedule goes, I have the details on my profile page. So for this story, we have a scenario where Izuku doesn't attend UA High. There will be OCs, but a few familiar faces will also be along for the ride. With the exam having more clearly defined pass-fail parameters, you can be sure it'll affect people beyond Midoriya. We're going to really shatter Cannon's kneecaps with this one, headed off the rails right out the gate. I'm gonna place this as its own paragraph because it came up quite a few times from reviewers in the first run of this work on the topic of pairings. For anyone who cares overly about this, I'm sorry to say that I have pretty boring tastes in this regard, so you can expect the most vanilla pairings pretty much all around. If that's a sticking point for anyone, here's your first and final warning to jump ship. That said, we won't be dealing with anything relationship heavy for quite a long time. Alright then, next time, a conversation about Midoriya's secondary options, a blasty confrontation, and the first steps on a new path. Chapter 2, Another Opportunity. Chapter text. Let's go. Something a little lengthier than last entry. Well done, Bakugo. It does our school proud not only to have one of our students pass the UA entrance exam, but to achieve one of the highest scores no less. Katsuki Bakugo could only be described as the picture of smug in that moment. His counselor's high praise did wonders for his already inflated ego. Not that he needed any additional proof of his excellence. Of course he would be at the top of the charts. What else could they expect? What Katsuki didn't expect was the presence of the other student in the counselor's office. This was supposed to be a small meeting congratulating him on being the only student from this second-rate middle school to make the cut for UA, so what the hell was useless Deku doing here? Maybe the teachers had him come so he could get a reality check. A quirkless loser like him was never gonna cut it as a hero. The corner of Bakugo's mouth curved upward at the thought. Even so, for an obvious failure, Deku was standing awfully straight right now. The subtle confidence was a little perplexing to the explosive youth. The lithe lady behind the desk moved to adjust her glasses, sliding the sapphire frame S up along her sharp nose. As far as Bakugo was concerned, Ms. Takami could use some counseling herself, especially in regards to her appreciation of color. That two-tone hair of hers, left side teal, right side fuchsia, said enough on its own. That she'd styled it into a braided tiara, the two colors weaving in and out like coils of rope, said more regardless. Wasn't she in her fort wise? Katsuki was contemplating the mental exercise that was the vaguely flower-esque pattern. There must have been at least 7 shades of gold and auburn rioting about on the woman's blouse when her sights turned on Deku. The excitement on Ms. Takami's face softened a little. Midoriya, I'm sorry you couldn't also have made it. I know you must be disappointed. Izuku said nothing, giving a few short nods in return. His classmate and former friend allowed his growing superiority to swell, but the feeling was rather muted due to Deku's lackluster reaction. Where were those pathetic tears the nerd always shed whenever reality caught up to him? Bearing that setback, I'm happy to see you haven't given up on the hero program, even if not at UA, and to get an invitation to the second most decorated school in the nation. Ms. Takami's building energy was cut short by a tiny, rage-fueled burst ripping free over Bakugo's left brow. His once smug expression had slipped steadily throughout the counselor's speech until a look of teeth-clenched fury had overtaken his features. What did you just say? An offer. Izuku couldn't help the surprise that leaked into his words. His mentor launched into a raucous round of laughter at the boy's confusion, cut short when his cackles came accompanied by sprays of blood. The pro-hero warded off his fretting pupil as he collected himself. Yes, All Might confirmed. Another school is inviting you personally to enroll in their program. Midoriya stood back, stance slumped and eyes wide. What? But I never put in for any other schools. How? All Might raised one hand, flicking the boy's brow. Even in his deflated form, Izuku bent back nearly 90 degrees at the waist, utterly unprepared for the show of force. Use your head, my boy. UA is the top institute in the country and arguably one of the best in the world. There are plenty of other programs and such who keep a close eye on the goings-on there. More than a few outside representatives like to watch over the entrance exams alongside the school's staff. Rising to a more proper position, ignoring a few errant pops from his joints, Izuku began to nod in understanding. I get it. The boy grasped his chin between his fingers. UA has basically the toughest entry requirements in the nation. The pass rate, last I heard, is only about 1 in every 100. But just because someone can't get into the top school doesn't mean they're without any kind of merit. Furthermore, with the way UA's test is set up, people with certain abilities would be at a natural disadvantage. I'll bet there were plenty of applicants who, while not the best in case of a robot invasion, would be a great asset in countless other scenarios. And then there's... Izuku flinched back on instinct, narrowly avoiding another of All Might's finger flicks. The symbol of peace grinned, applauding Midoriya's reflexes but mostly looking pleased that his little interruption had been successful. Don't get ahead of yourself, young man. You pretty much summed it up in that first bit. There are plenty of promising applicants that get left behind due to the nature of the entrance exam. But watchful eyes will always take notice of those with the right kind of talent, the right attitude. Midoriya's mentor laid both palms upon his student's shoulders, pride emanating in his gaze. I don't think there exists a world where a commitment like yours could go unnoticed, young Midoriya. The boy couldn't help the smile spreading across his features, though he did well to keep his deeper emotions in check. The happiness was short-lived as a sudden thought soured Izuku's mood. The skeletal All Might balked at his pupil's abrupt shift, the boy's eyes dulling as his sight dropped to the sands. He didn't need to be asked. Izuku venting his thoughts immediately, it's just, you won't be able to teach me anymore. When the boy's eyes met his again, All Might could see that, while not completely crushed, there was a deep disappointment building in them. Disappointment in the system, at the world, in himself. In that moment, All Might pressed the idea he had been hoping to sell this night. Moving one hand to rest on Midoriya's scalp, he replied, that is true, but I want to assure you that if you accept this offer you will be in capable hands. I'm pretty sure I know exactly who'd be in charge of your class. We're associates of a sort. Izuku turned his head in question. Another hero. Not sure if even you'll have heard of him. All Might stared off to the side a bit, tiny smile in place. He gets a lot less recognition than he deserves. But I can tell you that he's one of the reasons that school's program has grown to match leagues with UA. All Might drove a most serious expression towards his pupil before putting in his final point. And he was also the one who pushed for your invitation. Aozora, one of 2 schools vying for a position beneath UA as the second most distinguished hero program in the nation. While some would find the notion of a contest for runner-up to be quite silly, the volume of failed UA hopefuls still seeking a quality institution made a battlefield of the educational landscape. As such, competing programs like Aozora were always on the lookout for diamonds in the rough, the sort of excellence that would put them on top of the rankings, ever striving towards that illusory dream of surpassing UA high. And to think, a place like that wanted him, that useless fucking Deku. Katsuki was seething. Sure, UA had rightfully rejected the quirkless loser, but the idea that another institute of high renown was diving on Deku like he was worth something. It was an outright insult. This is what led to our current scene. 2 soon-to-be high schoolers alone in a dead-end alley around the side of their middle school. Bakugo had his former friend thrust against the wall of the alley, the front of Deku's shirt bunched up in the raging teen's fist. The look on Bakugo's face would have befit that of a rabid animal, actual foam collecting at the corners of his mouth. Deku, he growled through clenched teeth, don't think for even a second that this changes things. You're still weak, you're never gonna change that. Defenseless little Izuku is all you'll ever be. Izuku, for his part, ignored the spray of spittle from Kaken's manic tirade. He was far more focused on the words flying from the boy's mouth, the sheer fury that rose with every syllable. On any other day Midoriya would turn numb to this, more out of necessity in the past. Years of bullying had made him rather resistant to this sort of thing. But a different Izuku was in charge today. Bakugo flinched when useless Deku took the arm restraining him by the wrist. The nerd's grip was strong, more so than it had any right to be. And Midoriya's face, not returning his old friend's anger, was a stern mask of absolution. Kaken, I'm not gonna let you put me down anymore. Plain shock lit up the other boy's features, but Izuku pressed on before he lost his nerve. Someone that I look up to told me that I can be a hero, so I'm not gonna sit here and listen to you call me useless anymore. Then Deku did the unthinkable. Just as Katsuki's ire was building back to a roaring flame, Midoriya threw another curveball at him when his other hand shot up, wrapping around Bakugo's arm. With both hands gripping it, Izuku tore the invasive limb away from himself, still keeping a firm hold as he shouted, I will go to Aozora and I will become a hero. And you have no place standing in my way, Kaken. That did it. That abso-fucking-lutely did it. He knew this whole thing was irrational, that reasonably, with them going to different schools now, any interest in Izuku Midoriya was pretty much wasted effort on his part. Bakugo knew all these things, but he couldn't let it go. Deku and useless were synonymous terms. He couldn't. Bakugo punched into the side of the wall just left of Deku's face. The bright burst he sent was more flair than force, a little trick he'd been working on. But the nerd wasn't squirming. It felt like the double vice grip on his arm was actually getting tighter. And that stupid face of his still had too much steel behind it. Fucking little. Zip. The furious one heard the voice the same instant he noticed the palm upon his extended fist, a foreign set of fingers sliding over his maw. The sensation was strange, far less painful than he'd imagined, as the flesh of his knuckles fused with the weathered concrete of the wall. Having your lips sewn together, on the other hand, was about as panic-inducing as he expected. If not for an obvious inability to vocalize, Bakugo would have unleashed the unholiest of shrieks. Really need to watch that language of yours, future hero. Ms. Takami leered forward, her chin perched atop Katsuki's left shoulder. Though the young man had long since grown numb to any sense of threat from the members of school staff, Bakugo had always harbored a hint of trepidation when it came to the guidance counselor. Belying that winning smile she often presented, Katsuki could sense a darkness in her, deep and crushing as the sea. He'd taken special care not to test those waters, and now he'd gone and thrown himself in, petrified and helpless. Ms. Takami leaned her weight forward, reaching over Bakugo's shoulder to take hold where Midoriya clutched his arm. It would be an unfortunate hassle if the situation escalated, wouldn't you agree, Izuku? The boy with the algae-colored hair hadn't broken eye contact since the moment the woman had appeared over Kaken's shoulder. His quiet shock matched her whimsical glee, and only a short moment later, Midoriya released his hold on Bakugo's arm. Ms. Takami was far more lethargic in her own release of Katsuki, waiting until the other student had edged back a good distance, out of his would-be attacker's range. When she was satisfied, Ms. Takami took her hands away and hopped back, arms spread wide and palms open. At first it was shock that held Bakugo in place, the experience of being so powerless a shattering blow to his considerable ego. Izuku skirted the perimeter of the exchange, coming to rest just beside the guidance counselor. Katsuki eyed his not-so-familiar punching bag, internally seething at the boy's stance, like he was actually ready to take him on, like he actually stood a fucking chance. What made everything worse for him was that Bakugo was scared. Even with the object of his daily ire standing right in front of him, the hot-headed teen kept his sight on Ms. Takami. This oddly dressed woman who stood maybe a pebble shorter than the useless nerd next to her wasn't watching him. Bitch actually had her eyes closed, the widest grin stretching across her face. But she didn't fool him. She'd never fool him again. He ignored the bead of sweat racing down his right temple. Head on home now, Katsuki. I'm afraid I can't spare time to entertain guests today. The silence stretched on for a moment or two, no one moving a muscle. Bakugo turned on a dime, scoffing at the whole scenario before striding away at as easy a pace as he could manage. He pointedly ignored the trembling in his arms. As the oppressive party walked out of earshot, Ms. Takami rounded on her remaining student. Having gotten a small taste of her quirk, Midoriya couldn't help but flinch back. Calm down, Izuku. I've got the safety on. Ms. Takami formed a finger gun, her thumb hammer notably twitching as though struggling to press down. Her grin grew so wide it caused her eyes to squint, the display dragging a smile out of the hero hopeful. A sudden chop to the noggin was the boy's reward. There, Ms. Takami sang, I have given appropriate punishment for your actions. As Izuku rubbed the bruised spot on his forehead, his counselor brought her hand to her chin, perching it between her thumb and pointer. Suppose I should also give some verbal advice. Try and dissuade such encounters in the future. Midoriya could only watch as the tie-dye woman dropped both arms to her sides, chest puffing out as she took an exaggerated breath. Next thing he knew, this woman who stood as tall as his brow started some dramatic spectacle, her arms sweeping out in wide arcs as she turned in place as though addressing a sea of onlookers. Variously toned utterances of blah were delivered with passionate fervor, the cacophony easily filling the walled-in space. Izuku finally let loose a snort of laughter as Ms. Takami abruptly turned her nonsensical dialogue into a nonsensical song and dance routine. After about 10 seconds of the Michigan J. Frog maneuver, a somewhat calmer student noted a rare sight upon his counselor's face, a true, sober expression. Her words, underlying with warmth, began, I'm glad for you, Midoriya. The hero hopeful arched his brow. Glad for what? I almost got into a fight just now. He left unsaid the likely outcome of Bakugo beating him to a pulp. Yes, I'm glad for that. Ms. Takami made to crouch down, realized her student was in fact taller than she was, and awkwardly aborted the action. Sorry about that. Still hanging on to old habits? Back on track. I'm glad that you stood up for yourself. Sometimes the person who needs the most saving is ourselves. It would have to be said that his guidance counselor was Izuku's favorite faculty member. When others mocked, denied, or tried to steer him away from his dreams, Ms. Takami was the adult who did the one thing the young man needed most in his life. She listened, and beyond that, she supported his ambitions. Somewhere in their infrequent exchanges throughout middle school, Ms. Takami saw something in Midoriya worth believing in. Just like All Might had. Just like Aozora. Hey, buck up. The indecisively colored woman sent a quick slap to the top of the boy's head, perhaps not so accidentally striking the side of her disciplinary chop. It's a compliment, I swear. I think that was a good bit of growth you just showed me. Breaking eye contact, a blush flooding his cheeks, Midoriya returned, I just don't understand. Don't understand how an entire hero program, can have all this faith in me. I've never done. Ms. Takami clapped her hands together, a thunderous boom shattering the midday atmosphere. None of that, she snapped. What was that whole exchange with Mr. Bakugo just now? Was it all just for show? Izuku balked as the color-challenged woman thrust an accusing finger towards his nose. You're on course to being a hero now. There's no more room for doubts. Midoriya flinched back as Ms. Takami flicked her invasive digit against his forehead. The counselor's arms raised, stretching skyward before folding down, hands clasped together behind the back of her head. People are gonna judge you, she said, eyes trained on the bit of sky peeking over the edge of the school's roof. People will hunt down your faults, barrage you with critiques. They'll do everything in their power to put you down. Adversity is a fact of life we all have to deal with sooner or later. Even the strongest person in the world has their detractors. Ms. Takami paused, her head turning to Izuku in a sidelong view. But I don't have to tell you that. You've been going more than half your life crushed under the world's lack of expectations. The boy's gaze fell downwards. He hardly stirred when his counselor's palms fell upon his shoulders, but he hung on every word she said. And not once did I ever see you stop living. You never wavered from your dream. And now people are starting to take notice. Even little Bakugo, if that display of his was anything to go by. Izuku loosed a breath of laughter, straightening his stance as the chromatic woman stepped away from him. You're gonna be fine, kid. Life hasn't stopped you yet. Don't let it get to you just when opportunity comes knocking. Not lifting his gaze, Midoriya listened as Ms. Takami marched back towards the mouth of the alley. His lips pulled back in a soft smile. Alrighty then, your turn to get lost now. I've got papers to sort and a date with my takeout guy that I just can't afford to miss. This was the day. This was, once again, the day. The start of a new school year. The alarm clock didn't stand a chance against the powerful fist that smashed its body into a heap. The glow of sunrise through parted blinds illuminated the tan limb, riddled with scars, connecting the murderous fist to the body hiding beneath the covers. The waking one's groan came out as more of a roar, startling a white pup sleeping at the foot of the bed. Heavy sheets were tossed forward as a broad, muscled frame lurched upwards. A frock of messy, dark hair spilled over the man's brow, obscuring his eyes. He smacked his lips, doing nothing to clear his vision. With a slithering motion to relieve his feet of the covers, the awakened man curled into a ball and rolled out of bed. He landed in complete silence upon a circular floor rug, form low and set upon all fours. A breath passed before the much smaller pup bounded in front of its owner, rear raised high and tail wagging up a storm. Fuck off, Osmond, it's early. The puppy responded by yipping forward, mouth snatching up a thick strand of blonde hair draping over its master's nose. The man made no move to stop this, even when the tiny beast began tugging on the off-color locks. You started this, he sighed, rising to stand at his somewhat mediocre height. Osmond, dedicated as he was, did not relinquish his grip on his master's mane, tiny body now hanging over the man's face. With ease the man reached around, hand wrapping fully around the dog's midsection, holding the young hound before his face. He growled, I win. Again, Osmond gave a merry yip and 3 swift licks to his owner's face. A smile finally, slowly worked its way across the man's features. He shook his head a few times as he turned to the bedroom window, the city sky turning a warm orange. Taking up his role as primary caregiver, Osmond pawed his way up his master's cheek, parting the man's hair with his nose, blonde streak on the right. The man stood before the second-story window, his own topaz orbs gazing back at him through the faded reflection. Brushing a hand across his chin, he could only sigh at the absolute smoothness of his skin. Still can't seem to grow one, Hokuto. Catching his own eye, Hokuto and his mirror self laughed off the exchange. A calendar to the right of the window sat open to the current month. The days crossed with a series of X's until a single weekday marked with a sticker depicting an exploding cake. Yeah, here we go again. Eyes moving from the festive date down to the white pup on his arm. Hokuto mused, should I shower then eat, or is breakfast more important? Osmond bit into his master's bare chest, just missing the left nipple. Hokuto called his dog a pig, doing nothing to stop Osmond's assault. Midoriya took the steps 3 at a time, his energy at an all-time high. His mother had prepared an excellent breakfast, and even the hour train ride wasn't enough to dampen Izuku's spirit. This was it. He was really enrolled in a hero program. As soon as he rose out of this station, into the blinding sun, Izuku would be taking his first step on the path to becoming a pro, a successor to the greatest hero of all time. His world flared white as Midoriya exited the staircase, taking 2 blind steps forward. As his eyes adjusted to the light, Izuku noted where the line of concrete beneath him gave way to a manicured stretch of grass. Walking onto the green, the hero hopeful raised his gaze across the expansive field, catching sight of a far-off tree line, and Izuku froze, his very being coming to a standstill. The edifice that stood before him was insane, beyond meaningless words. From this angle, Midoriya could hazard that the plateau resting at the heart of the field covered enough space to contain at least 6 city blocks. Its surface seemed to twist, lines and grooves running the height of the structure laying out in a rising spiral. The black material that made up the massive landmark was some sort of rock, very coal-like in the way it devoured sunlight. But what really caught the young man's eye were the patches and swaths of territory all along the plateau's surface which jutted and bulged out of the structure. What made these spots unique were the presence of windows, railings, and open pathways, the marks of human habitation. Izuku thought he could actually see a good amount of people gathered along an overlook a few stories up, though it was difficult to tell at this distance. It appeared that the boy had found his new school. Something small bumped into Midoriya's thigh, the disturbance not enough to distract the boy from his gawking. The weight stayed against his leg, as though using Izuku's taller frame to support itself as the mind attached stared at the mighty tower, mirroring Midoriya's state of awe. The voice which broke the tension came from somewhere around Midoriya's waist, its quality feeble and astonished. That's so tall. And yeah, it was pretty frickin' tall. Let's go from the top. Bakugo makes his entrance here, present in all his glory. You'll be seeing a good amount of him throughout these early parts, but with him and Izuku going to different schools and this tale being focused on our favorite green bean, he'll be less prominent than he was in canon. I am a pretty big fan of his character arc in the main series, so I'll probably have him follow a similar path here, more or less. We got a small glimpse of this particular encounter between Izuku and Katsuki in canon, with them meeting in a location I assume to be some nook outside their school. Midoriya shows a bit more backbone here, a small but conscious contrast I made to the original scene. This may just be the last time these two expect to see each other, so both are attempting to get their point across to the other in as final a manner as possible. Kakin that Deku is worthless, Midoriya that Bakugo does not control him. As such, there's a bit more heat to this interaction. Takami was a fun character to think up. Because I'm an idiot, I thought up her power before her personality. Just to clarify, I wrote her before reading the joint training arc in the main series, so the fact that Class 1B has a student with a similar power is just coincidence. I'd actually based her quirk off of one of the characters from the Steel Ball Run chapters of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. The idea of weaponized onomatopoeia stuck in my mind from the moment I first heard about it. She's mostly meant to establish one adult in Izuku's school life who gives some kind of a shit about the boy. Making her a bit of a loon was just me playing around a bit. The name Takami comes from Takami Sahashi, main character Minato's mother from the series Sekaiori. I suppose both characters share an inner fierceness, though Ms. Takami's hidden depths are a bit more in line with a certain landlady. Expect to see more of her in the future. She's a bit of a favorite of mine. We'll get a good idea of Hokuto in the near future, as he's going to be a big character in this story. Osmond too, for whatever a dog can contribute. Hokuto is named after one of major antagonists from the series Rosario Vampire, and Osmond kind of gets his name from Ozpin, Ozma of RWBY fame. Probably won't be a major influence on aspect of their characters. Probably. The name Azor, as far as my pathetic translations go, means blue sky. Of course it was vaguely inspired by that old Disney movie Sky High, but beyond the name and the fact that heroes train in both, there's little connection. A lot about this place remains to be said. It's a mystery that'll unravel as the story progresses. I will say that I love Midoriya's relationship with All Might. I hope I managed to portray well enough the bond they've built over months of training. Though they'll be in different school setting, I hope to keep mentor and protege interacting regularly enough. Deku is the future, after all. And next time, on Approach to the Future, Izuku makes some new friends and the first bit of initiation falls into their midst. Chapter 3, On Approach. Chapter Text. Part the 3rd, Begin. Short grass gave way to a gravel path leading up to the base of building. Izuku could just make out the massive row of doors laid into the front of the structure, their polished steel surface standing in stark contrast to the blackened rock around them. The team continued onward, each footfall accompanied by the satisfying crackle of gravel. A black stone archway loomed over the young man, one of several set along the main path. They seemed to share the same material makeup and spiral pattern of the building proper. As the hero hopeful passed through the first beam of shadow, he set his gaze to the short figure walking at his side. Hey, Midoriya began. I never got around to introducing myself. I'm Izuku Midoriya. The childlike person turned his gaze from Izuku's face to his outstretched hand, his mohawk of purple bulbs bobbing and jiggling at the sudden motions. A minute passed as Bulbhead scrutinized the greenette's offered palm. Minoru Mineta, the kid introduced, taking hold of Izuku's hand. A quiet smile played across the small boy's features. Midoriya easily matched his grin, glad he had waited that awkward second before aborting the handshake. So, are you a first year too, Midoriya? Yeah, I'm a first year, Izuku replied, turning his gaze back towards the cyclonic structure that was Aozora High. Even now he had a hard time believing his good fortune to be scouted by this rising power in the world of pro-heroics. His school to be had made no secret after their success last year in their intent to rival UA in the near future. The thought that his year might just be the one to achieve that status filled his head with fanciful thoughts. Distracted, he airily added, "Picked me up after I failed UAS entrance exam." Say what? The hero hopeful threw his hands up in an attempt to ward off Minoru's explosion of shock. Even now the diminutive teen stood staring up at his taller counterpart, mouth gaping and pointer swapping between Midoriya and himself in a slow, repeating pattern. Izuku was just starting to uncurl from his startled stance when Mineta again found his voice. Why, you too?" Midoriya's confusion faded quickly, the near relief in the other boy's words spelling out their shared circumstances plain as day. Mineta continued on, I wasn't sure if I was the only one or not. You don't exactly want to brag about being UAS leftovers. Empathy was always something Izuku had in spades. The way he felt for people, be they close relations or complete strangers, had been a driving force behind his dream of herodom from the very beginning. Minoru, someone Izuku's own age and living a similar experience to his own, was that much easier to relate to. Dropping to a kneel, eye level with Mineta's row of orb hair, Midoriya took hold of the smaller boy's left shoulder. Their gazes locked as moments passed, quite awkwardly as Midoriya realized he had acted with no real idea of how to proceed. A swift glance away, towards the blackened tower standing tall behind Minoru, gave the young hero to be some much-needed inspiration. That's our school now. Mineta turned his head to follow his classmate's gaze towards Aozora. It isn't what we planned on, and I know being here feels like winning the consolation prize, but think of it like another chance. Izuku stood, stepping to his schoolmate's side as they stared up at the heroic edifice. We're not hopeless, Midoriya affirmed. Even if the path I have to walk isn't quite the one I hoped for, I'll keep going forward with everything I have. Minoru was rather used to having to look up to people in the most literal sense. Being such a squirt was a real hassle. But in that moment, even if he could trade sizes with All Might himself, Midoriya would still look like the tallest man on Earth, even if his speech was a little cliché. Wow, yelled a voice accompanied by eager applause. You've sure got some drive. I'm hyped just listening. The two boys whirled about to face the newcomer. Izuku found himself once more in his palms forward defensive stance, Minoru losing his balance and falling on his ass as the sudden turn proved too much for him. Oops, cried the voice, clearly that of a cute girl. Baffled looks adorned the pair of boys as they stared not at the form of a bubbly teen but rather a floating female uniform. The dark navy hue and silver highlights mirrored that of their own clothing, the obvious contrast being the dark, mid-length skirt and cobalt stockings. Midoriya, are ghosts real? The boy turned to Mineta, face draining of color as he registered the mini-teen's words. I don't know, was his blurted response. Is our new school haunted? I don't know, the greenette shouted back, hands clenched over the short student's shoulders. Hey, came the voice from the disembodied girl's uniform. The long-sleeved arms were spread wide in a disarming manner, the blue blazer cocked at an inquisitive angle from the black skirt. I'm actually just a girl, not a ghost, if that helps. The two boys stared at the not ghost, the drawing stillness of the moment bringing them out of their panic modes. The pair turned back to each other, noting Izuku's double-handed grasp around Mineta's throat and the severe angle the smaller boy was being held at. Midoriya released his grip and Mineta fell backwards. It was the instant before impact, a bare breath of time in which the vertically challenged boy was gifted a moment of clarity. It began with a set of steady palms pressing upwards into his falling back, slowing the boy's collapse from free fall to easy tilt. The unseen hand slid around to grasp Minoru's upper arms, his back coming to rest against a solid frame and a pretty nice set of cushions. And then it hit him. The scent, a pleasant, mesmerizing aroma that could belong only to a budding young lady. His sharp inhalation was a bit too long and too audible to be anything less than disquieting. Whoa, this awesome smell really must belong to a girl. A breeze whistled by in the stillness following Mineta's blurb. The girl kneeling behind him, the one whose fleshy orbs were currently pressed against the back of his head, began in a cautious tone, well, thanks, I guess. Never gotten that as a compliment before. Her sudden rise in energy snapped Mineta out of his reverie. A dawning look of horror bled across his features at the realization of the particular thoughts he had just given voice to. Midoriya could only stare, eyes wide and lips pursed as he beheld the scene with the sort of sick reverence normally reserved for the sight of a train crash or a collapsing structure. In a way, the circumstances were similar. Minoru's school and social life certainly seemed to be on the verge of disaster. A part of All Might's studious protege told him that, as a future hero, saving those in need was a massive part of the job. But the floating uniform, more realistically the unseeable girl in normal clothes, beat him to action. Wow, I am some kind of blockhead. Izuku watched as one sleeve bent inwards, cuff rushing towards the brow area, accompanied by the smack of flesh on flesh. Mineta maintained his look of broken soul, eyes rolled back and mouth locked into a silent wail. I haven't even introduced myself. I'm Toru Hagakure, nice to meet you. Hagakure capped off her intro with a long bow of the head. Mineta froze up further, a strangled cry clawing from his throat. Izuku could only assume the boy's mind was in overload at the reality of a girl's face being so close to his own, even if he couldn't actually see it. Not that he had any room to talk, should he have found himself in a similar situation. Whether or not Hagakure herself had any clue what her actions were doing to the tiny teen remained unknown. Hey, we're coming in good numbers now. From his spot on the forward balcony overlooking the entrance, Hokuto surveyed the advancing crowd of first years flowing out of the distant station. It seemed they had a good crop this year. He couldn't wait to start putting them through their paces. And as fortune would have it, it looked like he was about to get a chance to welcome a few newbies. He recognized the group of three. They were prospects for the hero course after all. They held a considerable lead on the advancing throngs of students, the trio utterly absorbed in idle conversation. Hokuto doubted they were even aware of the crowd behind them, let alone his own observation. This would not do, to be so lacking in such an essential skill of day-to-day heroism. By the time Hokuto organized his thoughts, the three had walked more or less into optimal range. And, no surprise, none of them had bothered looking up. A 3-story fall was probably fine. Let's see how this little gaggle handles the classic ambush. Light refraction. Toru spun around, walking backwards to keep Midoriya in sight. Yep, that's the way the doctors described it. In theory, my skin can do all kinds of funny things with light. The cuffs of Hagakure's long sleeve came close together, giving the boys the impression that she was cupping her hands together. But something happened when I was little, back when my quirk first appeared, and now it's kinda stuck at 100%. Izuku's typical enthusiasm to study quirks fell swiftly to the wayside. The implications of those words. How long had it been since she had seen her own reflection? For once, the boy questioned if his formerly powerless status was really the worst of fate's hands. Mineta, ever the social expert, dove into the conversation. I can do this. The group paused as Mineta, a bit ahead of the others, plucked one of the plum orbs off the top of his head. The sight of the tiny teen presenting the sphere had Midoriya and Hagakure curious. See, these balls of mine. Watch out. In time with her cry, Toru shot forwards, shoving Minoru away. A heavy net fell over the invisible girl, the weighted ends driving her to the ground. Midoriya surged in, his body once again reacting without thinking, sliding into place beside his captured classmate. Izuku grasped Hagakure by the shoulder, his free hand snatching up a portion of the net. The invisible girl's sleeve shot up, pointing towards the towering school. Following Toru's gesture alongside her desperate shout of, "He's coming," Izuku caught the barest glimpse of their assailant. He fell from the sky heedless of the inevitable impact, landing in a deep crouch on the pebbled path with hardly a sound. The whine of slicing air followed instantly as the man shot towards them, a blur of crimson on top of black. If he hazarded a guess, Izuku would say he'd reach them in the span of 2 bounds. The familiar rush of power filled the boy, every muscle in his body charged by one for all. The weighted orbs around the edge of the net had enough mass to hold down a full-grown tiger, tested and proven. To a determined Izuku Midoriya, such a detail was utterly meaningless. With a swift twist, the boy had lifted both Toru and her bindings, shifting them to rest behind him. Acting as a human barrier, Izuku turned fully to face their attacker, arms raised and stance rising. His body quaked under the sudden impact, the graveled earth giving way beneath his feet. With gritted teeth, the young hero to be locked eyes with his opponent, pushing back against the considerable strength of the man before him. Kan eyes gazed hard into his own, attempting to pierce his resolve. Izuku could do little more than hold, fixing his assailant with his most resolute glare. The one thing Midoriya did not expect from his no doubt sad excuse for intimidation was the smile that split the strange man's features. Sure, a cocky smirk or an amused grin would be par the course, but the sheer approval in that expression was disarming. Yeah, you've got some good eyes there. Izuku almost fell forward as his opponent pulled back. On all fours, the greenette looked up to take in the man's appearance, noting the red long-sleeve shirt and neatly done bow tie. More accurately, he noted how this guy's toned shoulders shone clearly through the massive tears he'd ripped in his upper sleeves and how very appropriate his tie's glistening cherries on sheer black background was. The dark slacks were ruined, too many breaks and shears in the fabric to count. The price one paid for such speedy movement in day-to-day clothing, Izuku guessed. Making to step aside, Hokuto could not hold back his surprise as his frame locked with a sudden jolt. His expression slipped back towards approval, his smile even wider than before, as he turned at the waist to regard the diminutive presence laying prone behind him. Mineta lay flat on his belly, chin digging into the loose rocks. His arms were extended fully, palms clasped around the adult's ankle. To be precise, the boy had a death grip on a small bundle of his sticky orbs which currently had Hokuto's left leg cemented to the earth. Guess we really do have some good prospects this year, the older male announced, giving a firm nod towards Mineta. His gaze swept back over Izuku, sliding past him to rest on the disembodied girl's uniform currently shifting free of her net prison. Real good prospects. Hokuto gave his leg a few more flexes, the action shooing away the ball-headed gnome, ending the escape attempt with a harsh click of his tongue. The man stilled, eyes closed in concentration. Minoru held up a hand, about to tell his former assailant not to attempt forcing his foot free when the locked appendage came free of its laced prison with a moist squelch. Mineta's raised palm shot back to cover his gag reflex as the pea-green, slime-drenched sock came into view. A long sigh escaped Hokuto as he stood over his doomed footwear. The three students visibly recoiled as his shoeless limb pressed against the ground with a happy little squish. Mineta seemed to actually be turning green. Third lesson of being a hero: be prepared to lose things in spite of your efforts. With that, Hokuto spun on his heel, of course the one garbed in that filthy sock, and began his soggy march towards the building. With careless air he threw over his shoulder, "I expect you on time for class, first day or not." Midoriya wasn't sure he could put proper words to that little revelation, but a good portion of his thinking was occupied by the words uttered by Hagakure as their teacher gained a good lead on them. You think he's gonna be like that all the time? So, Minoru Mineta and Toru Hagakure. Since the setting is different, I figured it would be a good chance to set up a different trio as the main cast. Mineta was actually always high on my list of choices for this. One of my favorite things to do is take characters who are given little screen time or outright loathsome in canon and kind of ply around with their personality and dynamics. Old Grapehead is prime fodder for this, and I plan to really tool around with him. Expect some personality differences. Having Midoriya as a more direct influence is just the start. Hagakure was kind of my natural second choice. As Minoru stated, Aozora has scooped up some of UAS leftovers. When I was thinking about which characters to port over, one of my first thoughts was who else would be least likely to pass given the raised standards of the entrance exam. Not hard to fathom that the harsher requirements coupled with the obvious chaos meant Toru's solution of finding the off switch on the bots just doesn't quite cut it in this timeline. Same for Mineta. You can just assume he panicked once the match started rampaging, again working out poorly for him in comparison to canon. My second reason for choosing our favorite invisible girl was mostly just for the niche. Not a lot of people focused on her at the time I was writing this, so I figured I would fill in a gap there. I also thought she'd have a very interesting dynamic alongside Mineta. A desperate pervert interacting with a girl who can't be seen as just rife with material. I do, and will continue to, take a lot of liberties with her personality, one of the major perks of working with a minor character that the main story doesn't flesh out fully. Hokuto's ambush is what I consider the centerpiece scene of this chapter. Here we get an outright display of exactly why these three were scouted for Aozora. Between Izuku's supreme physicality and protective instincts, Toru's situational awareness and quick reactions, and Minoru's last-second recovery support, they have some potential. There's a little taste of Hokuto's own power set in this sequence. Enhanced strength, speed, and what to make of that unfortunate finish with the slime secretion. All in time, friends. All in time. Izuku does manage to utilize one for all without destroying himself in this scene. I don't think it's that unprecedented if Midoriya is only trying to take a blow rather than dish one out. But it is part of how I want to reimagine the way the quirk works in this setting. Izuku, very early on, is going to be steered towards, well, not being the next All Might. Again, all in time. And on that note, for our next entry, our newly formed group of misfits make their way into the supposed Hall of Learning. The place is just weird, but they bond a little more. There's that to look forward to. See you next time. Chapter 4, First Obstacles. Chapter Text, 4th Round, coming up. The main entrance was a long row of heavy steel doors, at least 8 from Izuku's count. Upon their approach, 3 slid open as though reacting to their presence, each threshold large enough to drive a car through. The first-day students hesitated for only a moment, still wary from earlier events. The passage they entered was a short one. Even so, the outside light faded off quickly, the space falling to darkness a few meters in. The trio's pace slowed to a crawl as they stepped into the shadows. Almost instantly the group was overcome by a veil of small, glittering lights, the sight not so dissimilar to stars twinkling against the night sky. Izuku could make out the rough outline of large, circular room as he studied the space. His musings were broken by a sudden gasp from Mineta, drawing Midoriya's sight downward. A violet glow encircled their feet, like a spotlight radiating from the floor. As Minoru jumped in shock at the sight, the glow followed beneath him. "Well, this certainly makes me feel special," Hagakure joked as she paced across the floor, her own circle of light following dutifully. Before Izuku could start to theorize, the room bloomed in warm hues of amethyst. As the once dark walls were overtaken in purple radiance, Midoriya confirmed the massive, domed structure of the space. Following the curved walls upwards, Izuku beheld a wide, hanging walkway on the far side of the room, a winding staircase at either end of the overhang hugging the walls as they descended. Beneath that lay a dark alcove, a chest-high counter formed seamlessly from the polished stone of the structure separating the main floor from the space beyond. Maybe a front desk of some sort was the best purpose the boy could assign to such an area. That's pretty. Midoriya had not paid much mind to the silence that persisted. Hearing Hagakure's voice again seemed to sharply emphasize both her and Mineta's lack of input for the past few moments. But rather than look to his new classmates, the boy turned a swift gaze upward, as though urged by silent demand. From the peak of the dome, plunging down through the hall's violet glow, was a near-pearlescent stalactite. The formation was like that of a spearhead, its size comparable to that of a steel shipping container. The blade-like growth appeared comprised of thousands of smaller crystals, running parallel towards the ground. Coupled with their pure form, it evoked the image of a meteor shower, frozen midway in its trail across the sky. The hero hopeful had to agree with Toru. It was pretty. Hello there. Izuku jolted at the sudden greeting, Mineta's form colliding with his leg as the smaller boy jumped into him. Behind the counter beneath the raised walkway was a person. At least the students believed it to be a person. All they could make out through the shadows of the alcove was a set of eyes and a toothy grin, all of which were glowing a harsh yellow. It did sound like a woman speaking. Hello, Hagakure returned, shaking her blue sleeve in a happy wave. Minoru muttered something about girls who recover too fast as he descended from his companion's leg. Midoriya did his best to relax, but something kept him on edge. He supposed suspicions would run high when dealing with some nondescript shadow person. You kids might want to get a move on. The first day charge can be a little hectic. The speaker slid her eyes and mouth shut, her telltale glow outlining the slits. The features rotated with a short jerk, indicating a quick cocking of the head. Was she trying to be cute? The sound of several steel bulkheads sliding open behind them drew the group's attention. Barely a moment passed before the first dozen freshmen eagerly skipped into the large entrance. Some of the more energetic ones began gawking at the immense space, spinning in circles and hopping about as they took in the high ceiling and the crystal centerpiece. A few noticed the purple spotlights beneath their feet and started dashing to and fro to see if they could lose them. Izuku hardly had a moment to process the ongoing horseplay before again he felt Mineta's small frame latch onto his body, the boy quickly scampering up the greenette's torso before clutching onto his shoulders. This was Midoriya's only warning before the main body of the student horde crashed against him like a syrupy tidal wave. In spite of its relatively slow motion, the mass of young humanity quickly overcame the two boys, carrying them several meters across the room. The nervous fanboy did his best to navigate the flow, one arm working to keep his balance as the other clasped onto Minoru's wrist, keeping the miniature teen from being torn away in the sluggish chaos. The heavy flow of foot traffic took a sudden turn towards the alcove beneath the overhang, the uninformed likely noticing the help desk receptionist. Midoriya was spun and jerked as people began to push past at an increasing pace. He just barely avoided elbowing a girl whose curly blonde locks completely concealed her face. She somehow seemed to be having a much easier time navigating the throngs than they were. A strong grip took hold of the greenette's free arm, the one not holding on to Mineta. Found you, Hagakure's voice called. Come on. Izuku only got a glimpse of the girl's blue sleeve before he and his passenger were whisked through the crowd. Toru's headless blouse ducked and weaved through the thinning masses, working in the opposite direction of the horde. Her pair of friends were close behind, Midoriya doing his best to match the invisible girl's sharp cuts and swift movement. It was all he could do not to be dragged across the floor. Hagakure's grip was damn near unbreakable. The girl clearly boasted a lot more strength than expected. In a scant few seconds, the trio broke through the storm. Now on the edge of the room just beside the row of entrance doors, Midoriya braced himself against the curved wall, miniature violet spotlights blooming under his palms. Mineta quickly adopted a similar pose, having climbed up to stand astride Izuku's shoulders. Toru's disembodied uniform slid into frame from the left, leaning against the wall just beside the two boys. You guys okay? Things got pretty out of control back there. Izuku could feel Minoru's vigorous nods of affirmation, the small teen's entire form quaking under his harsh movements. The green-haired youth turned a shaky look over his shoulder, towards the still surging sea of first years. The familiar purple glow which emanated from the floor was now a bulbous, shifting blob of light, every bit the churning mass that the crowd of teens above had become. Please tell me we don't have to go back into that, Mineta pleaded with a single breath. Izuku gulped at the notion. Toru responded with a dismissive snort. Nah, we're all in the same class, so all we gotta do is make our way upstairs. You just wanna wander off in this dark tower with no kind of guidance other than we need to go up. The invisible girl reached up to pet Minoru's orbs, the boy confused as to whether he should feel enthused or insulted by the display. "Aw, don't worry about it, Munchkin, I already know the way." Midoriya perked up at this. "You've been here before, Hagakure?" "Well duh, had to scope things out before committing myself. They let fresh prospects stir the place on weekends before semester starts. I figured I'd take advantage of that." Coming to himself, the fanboy continued, "When you say it like that, it makes me feel like I've been pretty thoughtless about all this. It's great that you thought ahead to scout out our classroom." Mineta nodded along, gaze cast down in a show of humility. Hagakure continued to pat his orbs. "Oh, this was before I'd even agreed to study here. I didn't even know what floor I'd be on, let alone which class. I just memorized a chunk of the layout and some room numbers. Best I could do on short notice." Izuku felt his jaw ready to drop, settling for staring wide-eyed at their transparent classmate. His purple-headed ride-along fixed her with an incredulous look, left eyelid twitching. The boys were quickly coming to the conclusion that Toru might just be a rather scary person. The girl in question ignored the boy's distress, tugging on Midoriya's sleeve. "Come on, let's skirt the room and get up the stairs before the mob starts to disperse. Be easier to get around without the halls getting clogged up." Too stricken to resist, Izuku followed along as Hagakure began humming some kind of stealth theme. Mineta had reached a hand up to pet his own spheres, somewhat missing the attention. "That was really impressive back there." The invisible girl turned to her green-haired friend, cocking her upper body in a show of curiosity. Mineta, who had scampered a few steps in front of the two, started walking backwards to join the conversation. Midoriya elaborated. "The way you got us through the crowd, it looked effortless for you. If you weren't there, Mineta and I'd still be getting crushed and trampled right now." Minoru got excited and continued the praise. "Yeah, you cut through that horde so fast, like a poop on a good day." There was a brief instance the boy was afforded to realize what he'd just spat out, his face paling considerably. Izuku slapped a palm over his own mouth, staring very much in the opposite direction of his friends, the embarrassment he felt on Minoru's behalf reaching critical levels. The whole time Toru was fucking howling with laughter. All attempts to collect herself met with spectacular failure. A near minute passed before the visibly challenged girl regained some level of control, snatching up Midoriya's sleeve before she started towards their miniature classmate. "Woo, hee, that was pretty great, thanks for that one." Mineta stirred slightly from his position down on all fours, face almost pressed against the ground. The boy reanimated in an instant when Hagakure swept a hand through his orbs, shooting to his feet with sunshine in his soul and hope in his eyes. Izuku, following behind the invisible girl, shook his head in passing. The trio fell in step as they strode deeper into the corridor, Hagakure between the two boys as she was directing the group. At a four-way intersection, the girl's arm shot across Midoriya's front, diverting them down the right hall. That familiar violet glow followed beneath them, the intensity enough to light the entire passage for a few paces to the front and back. "It really isn't that special." Izuku and Mineta blinked, turning to their female friend with puzzled expressions. As far as they could tell, she continued facing forward. "What you guys were talking about earlier, it's really nothing big. Just comes with the territory of." Toru's arms sprang up, bending inwards and gesturing towards the space occupied by her head with swirling motions. "This. People don't always notice someone who isn't all there, so I pick up the slack by staying super aware of everything else. Only so many times you can get knocked into walls and downstairs before you start to adapt. Nothing special." The boys could only stare, Hagakure now striding forward with her arms clasped behind her lower back. Neither could bring themselves to comment, so the group proceeded in silence, trekking through the gently curving passage. Izuku found himself lost in thought, staring towards the top right corner of the hallway. He watched as the advancing purple light overtook the gem-spotted ebony of the structure's walls. It was a somewhat mesmerizing sight. All stopped as a sudden, deep chime echoed through the halls. The familiar four tones, a brief pause between the two pairs, were a mainstay of any student's day. The awkward tension among the group turned numb as the teens faced each other in silent question. Then the second set of four notes began and Minoru slammed his palms into both sides of his head. "That's the warning chime." Izuku froze for only a second, pausing for reality to set itself in. It was all the time needed for Minoru and Toru to get a substantial head start, the invisible girl keeping the lead despite the smaller boy's considerable legwork. A swift bark of "come on" from Hagakure dragged Midoriya into a dead sprint, eating up the distance between his classmates and himself in scant moment. The corridor ahead continued curving to the left as they proceeded. In fact, the bend seemed to be getting more severe, an added incline further impeding their progress. At this point, Mineta and Izuku began overtaking their transparent guide, the miniature teen leaping up the slope with the deft skill of a mountain goat. "Just keep going," Hagakure called as Izuku passed. "There'll be a gap on the right soon. That passage leads to our classroom." Eyes ahead, the boy gave a sharp nod, continuing his forward charge. A heavy smack and a cry of pain from Mineta some distance ahead broke Midoriya's pace slightly. It was enough for Toru to dart forward, one hand snatching the hero hopeful by the back of his shirt. The greenette slid to a stop just in time, his forward foot thumping against a sudden obstacle. The space before Izuku's eyes was engulfed in shining fuchsia. He took a second to realize he was bare centimeters from a wall. As his eyes trailed upwards and the bright glow faded to glitter-specked ebony, the boy saw that it was not a wall standing before him, but a slope, one with a remarkably severe angle. Gazing upwards into the darkness, Midoriya could just make out the lip of the incline well over a dozen meters above. Mineta was laid out to the side, rolling back and forth on the ground with both palms pressed against his face. What the hell is this? Who designs a school like this? Pulling back a few steps with Midoriya in tow, Toru turned to the struggling boy. Sorry about that, really. That caught me by surprise too. This shouldn't be here. Izuku hummed in confusion, the invisible girl turning back to the sharp slope in front of them. He imagined her gaze to be scrutinizing. When I came through here before, there was a staircase. Not even a big one, 4 jumps and I cleared the top. I know we didn't get turned around. A look to the left and right reveled no alternatives. They were effectively at a dead end. Izuku turned back the way they came. Maybe we should try to backtrack. Hagakure crossed her arms in an X pattern. It looks like this hallway is pretty remote. We might end up having to go around half the building and we only have a few minutes now. Izuku was starting to sweat. It wouldn't look good to be late on their first day in a new school. Hagakure's cuff sat poised before her shirt collar, likely holding her chin in the standard thinker's pose. Minoru, for whatever reason, was crouched at the base of the slope, scanning up and down as though trying to gauge something. It's a test. Did you really think Hero School would be normal? Midoriya jumped at the sudden voice, even with the speaker being so monotone. The hero hopeful hadn't noticed this girl's approach at all, a sentiment Mineta shared as the boy shot forward in shock, smacking his head into the gradient again. Toru merely tilted her stance, not at all surprised. The girl approaching from behind was dressed in Azora blue, her black hair cut in precise angles around her face and reaching down to the small of her back. Her discerning eyes were dark, deep as the blackest void. Her overall demeanor could be summed up in a single word: unamused. Without further comment, she strode forward, shrugging to adjust the violet straps of her backpack. Stepping past Izuku and Toru, the group of friends were drawn to a rummaging movement beneath the serious girl's shirt. The bottom buttons flicked free as a quarto of massive spider legs spread free of their confines, earning a high-pitched whine from Mineta, who slammed back first against the bottom of the incline, right in the girl's path. The 4 arachnid limbs shot into the floor all around the prone boy with several sharp THMPs, effectively pinning Mineta in place. Midoriya felt the urge to intervene, but the spider girl was already in motion, her unnatural appendages launching her up the angled passage. The purple glow followed her rapid ascent of the slope, lighting the entire hallway in passing. Izuku readjusted his estimated length of the passage to around 20 meters as the girl disappeared over the top of the ramp, clearing the obstacle in seconds. Arachnoid appendages. Seems simple, but I'll bet they're really versatile. Between the sheer speed displayed and the average weight of your typical high school girl, those extra limbs must have a lot of strength behind them for her to travel so fast. And she seemed so confident in just charging straight up. She must have a good amount of practice scaling tall structures, buildings, maybe. Even if public quirk use is technically illegal, maybe there's another aspect of her quirk related to her senses, heightened touch or something. And why only 4 spider legs? I guess combined with her normal limbs. Midoriya locked up in shock, too surprised to react beyond freezing as a ghostly digit pressed over his lips like the latch of a suitcase. Hagakure began in a playful whisper. Sweetie, I think we're going to have to work on your ability to stay present in times like these. Izuku did his best to level a flat look at the empty space over the girl's collar. The effect was sadly lost with the crimson blush burning across his features. Toru responded with an audible grin, literally making the sheen sound, as she stepped back and turned to the rising hallway. Anyways, any thoughts on how we get past this? The greenette grasped his chin. Well, I suppose we could. Toru's sleeve darted towards his face, stopping just before his eyes. Midoriya could almost feel the single finger she was no doubt holding up as she said, "One thought at a time now, okay." This time, the boy's lack of humor was far more apparent, Hagakure turning away with an innocent round of whistling. A sudden pop drew the pair's attention. Mineta, silent up until now, stood with his arm outstretched, pressing one of his detached orbs onto the rising length of hallway. The taller duo watched in half fascination, half disgust as a fresh grape bulged into formation atop the smaller boy's scalp. I can just climb it. If either of you has a rope or something, maybe I can tie it to something and lower it down. If not for the fact that no sane person brought climbing rope to their first day of high school, it would have been an acceptable plan. Izuku sunk his hands into his pockets as he continued to analyze the situation. At once he found his solution. Withdrawing his right hand, the hero hopeful retrieved an entire box's worth of tissues. His mother had been very excitable that morning. He'd never imagined how beneficial her tendencies would turn out to be. The looks he was receiving from Mineta and Hagakure, at least Izuku assumed she was giving him one, were less than assuring. Already a short ways up the slope, clinging to a few of his sticky balls, Minoru flatly stated that, "An awful lot of tissues there, Midoriya." Izuku responded by digging his free hand into his other pocket, the venture returning a second stack of napkins which doubled his original haul. Mineta's pupils drained deeper into the whites of his ever-bulging eyes. An action further accelerated when the taller boy began rummaging through his back pocket for a presumable third batch of tissue. "Okay," Hagakure popped, invisible palms snatching up the greenette's thankfully tissue-less appendage. "What exactly is the point of all these? My mom was very worried this morning." The frank, casual delivery, as though all were explained in that one statement, smashed Toru's mental power switch with reckless zeal, prompting a full conscious reboot. Minoru fared a bit better, cutting off a howl of laughter into a drawn-out, humming rush of air which sounded a bit like a tiny elephant, throwing in a few chuckles of his own. Mostly to get over the awkward displays of his new classmates, Izuku voiced his plan. "Anyway, if Mineta climbs up, I can follow behind him and use these tissues to cover up his balls." Minoru snorted at the word balls. Midoriya ignored the lack of maturity and finished, "That way I won't get stuck to them." The tiny teen flashed his fellow high schoolers a thumbs up, not trusting his ability to keep a straight face if he turned around. "Sounds like a plan, Midoriya," he said, beginning his sticky climb. For someone with Minoru's physique, he scaled that slope with practiced ease. Where he got said practice was perhaps best left unanswered. Izuku placed the first batch of napkins atop the lower orbs, making sure to layer and completely cover the adhesive surface. Heavens forbid they experience some sort of mishap and either Hagakure or himself end up glued to the floor for the next few hours. Speaking of the hard-to-see young woman. "All right, Hagakure, I'll head up first and secure the handholds. If you just follow up behind me." A shrill yelp tore free of the boy's throat as a sudden weight pressed against his back, a single blue sleeve wrapping around his neck. A see-through palm closed around the collection of tissues, relieving Izuku of his precious supplies. "It'll be easier if we do it like this, Midori." Toru's voice was right over his ear. "You do the climbing and I'll make sure to cover the handholds. Symbiology, you know." Midori could barely wheeze out a response, his observant mind far too concerned with the feel of his new friend's bust squished against the solid mass of his back. Izuku concluded with stark certainty that, transparent or not, Hagakure was a young lady well into her development. Mineta could only stare, his sticky ascent coming to a sudden halt. The tiny teen's mood wasn't helped by the invisible girl's follow-up comment of, "And as a bonus, there's a nice, soft girl clinging to you." Mineta could almost feel Toru's gaze shift onto him in spite of his inability to see her. The brief pause in dialogue concluded with, "A girl with a nice smell, right Mindy?" Mindy turned, resuming his climb. There was an obvious sense of jealousy, annoyance that Midoriya was going to be pressed up against one of the female persuasion for any amount of time whilst he was left out. But for some curious reason, he couldn't help but feel relieved at the turn of events. And further beneath that, a bubbling fear began to ebb away, as though knowing he had just dodged the hungry gaze of a predator. He may have gotten up that corridor a fair bit faster than expected. Building chapter here, figuratively and literally. Aozora is a unique structure. It's already quite irregular with its strange geography, material makeup, the sentient underlighting. It doesn't seem designed to be a place of learning, at least not for normal students. The origins of this place lay firmly within the realm of hero society, just not necessarily as a school to start. All in time, some more banter and character building between our main trio. Toru is the standout here. I wanted to point out the obvious inconvenience of invisibility. When people hardly perceive you and you're living in a major urban center, constantly jockeying for space amongst the hordes, you're bound to be tossed around a bit. Her hyper-awareness and expertise in navigating crowds are pretty much required talents to accommodate her quirk, furthering on Midoriya's musings from last entry about how quirks aren't necessarily a universal plus. I wanted to play up a bit of a naughty streak in Hagakure. I did this mostly so she could play a bit more off of Mineta. In this universe, our purple bald boy really doesn't take as well as he gets. He's never been exposed to a more forward interaction with a girl. Or any interaction with a girl, really. Spider-Girl is pretty much a direct rip of the character Kato, a minor villain from the early chapters of Rosario Vampire. In terms of overall design at least, mostly in regards to the whole growing spider legs from her belly thing. The first of quite a few OC characters we obligated to see. I do have to populate an entirely made-up location after all. I will say right now that we won't be dealing with a full class of 20. It's just too many personalities for me to differentiate or even care about, let alone direct screen time to. Hopefully the moderate number I do include are convincing and entertaining enough. WL then, next time on Dragon Ball. Next time, a short introduction to our class and a more proper entrance for our instructor. Chapter 5, Warm Welcome. Chapter text, shorter chapter this time. Enjoy a bite-sized entry. The journey beyond the top of the slope wasn't exactly a grand affair. The way forward rounded inwards, curving towards a tall slit leading further into the dark rock structure. The walls of the crevice stood straight and sturdy, perfectly parallel. The width of the passage on the other side just enough for two people walking shoulder to shoulder. The usual violet glow that accompanied the students, though more intense due to the confined space, didn't seem to travel as far here. There was no way of telling how tall or deep the corridor went. The distances swallowed by a cold void. Hagakure lead the way, a good degree of care in every step. Midoriya marched behind her, peering through the clear space occupied by Toru's head, his eyes flicking between the luminous walls and the far shadows. They'd been thrown enough curved balls today, they wouldn't be caught off guard again. At the rear of the group, Mineta was still working through conflicting emotions and wondering about the feel of Toru's boobs. The darkness ahead gave way to light far too suddenly, overpowering the surrounding purple glow and capturing the three students. It was a moment so shocking that the trio took a few seconds to properly respond, shuffling forward almost mindlessly. It was as though the flash beckoned them, drawing the group further in. By the time Izuku had the presence of mind to halt the progression, the veil of white gave way to warm amethyst. Hagakure had already come to a stop, her green-haired friend marching into her back before he could follow suit. Mineta joined them an instant later, bouncing off of Midoriya's solid calf. The three stood in a large, cylindrical room, maybe 2/3 the floor space of the entrance hall. Like the passage they had just traversed, the walls stretched up into the darkness. Another collection of hanging crystals draped down from the abyss, the majority of their structure colorless and dull. The lowest tip of the stalactite pulsed with a pale glow, hardly discernible amongst the violet ambience. Somewhat off-center, leaning towards the back of the presumed classroom, there sat a slightly raised, circular platform. A wooden desk sat in the center of this dais, its dark mahogany surface coated in gleaming lacquer. The top was bare save for an adjustable lamp, an open notebook, and a small dog. Izuku could feel the exact moment Toru noticed the white puppy. The sudden surge of her shoulders and hushed intake of breath, all the evidence needed. This seemed to rouse the resting pup, its eyes lifting from the note-heavy page to regard the three newcomers. Hagakure bit back a squeal as she realized this adorable little guy had a dark gray patch of fur surrounding its right eye. Students and dog began a silent battle of wills, one in which the unseeable girl was rapidly floundering. Mineta shuffled his way around to the front of the party. There was a short pause as the boy with the purple orb hawk organized his thoughts. What's with this dog? The tiny teen's inquiry shattered the proverbial floodgates as Hagakure flew into motion, gushing at the living embodiment of hand-holdable cuteness resting right in front of her. Izuku only just managed to catch her before she took off, her sudden rush nearly breaking his grip. He was unwilling to set the girl free on her object of affection, his emerald greens still locked with the pup's sky blues. There was something underneath that stare. The young hound glanced down, running a short scan over the notebook's scribble-heavy pages. A moment passed before the pup reached out, swiping its paw across the right side of the book, slapping the tome shut. Again it fixed the three in front with a hard look, lingering with particular focus on the still fussing Hagakure. At once the pup perked, flicking its snout upwards over the trio. "Awa," Hagakure cooed, "he's just so adorable." The girl relaxed slightly, shoulders slumping as she deflated at the display of cuteness. Midoriya kept his grip on his invisible classmate, again meeting the odd dog's steely gaze. Minoru chimed in, "We all saw him reading just now, right?" Yes, Izuku was very conscious of that observation. It was why the boy was doing his best to keep Toru from bounding over, his right leg pitched protectively in front of Mineta. A sharp yip tore through the stagnant air, the white puppy again tossing its head towards the space over the three. Toru gave a happy chirp in response as Midoriya screwed his face deeper into confusion. "What are you trying to tell us?" the hero hopeful questioned the small animal. "Turn around, you morons." The trio complied, feeling an immediate rush of embarrassment. Stretching across the curved wall of the room, their length split in half by the vertical slit serving as the main entrance, were three long balconies. The spider-limbed girl from before sat with her head perched atop her knuckles, the remainder of her form hidden behind the smooth, obsidian surface of the banister. Her bored expression sat steady on the trio, a focus shared by the dozen-plus other students in various spots across the three levels. Toru stood as straight and still as she could manage, projecting an air of calm. The whole not able to be seen thing did wonders for the girl, her nearly searing blush expertly hidden. A glance on either side revealed her new friends. By comparison, in less than optimal circumstances, Izuku was in the midst of a damn good impression of a ripe tomato, his eyes bugging out as a mumble hurricane attempted to rip free of the hand he had clamped over his mouth. Mineta had gone for the more reserved response of folding himself into a ball and laying on his side. unresponsive save the occasional full-body shiver. Hagakure took up Midoriya's free hand whilst leaning down to haul up Minoru by the back of his jacket, mumbling hero and human suitcase in tow. The invisible girl strode around to the left of the entrance cleft. The class of students eyed them the whole way, only the white pup's gaze drawn elsewhere. A few columns of rungs ran up 4 points of the walls, a set carved at each end of the platforms. Arriving at the rungs to the left of the entry corridor, Toru pushed Midoriya forward before depositing Mineta's fetal form upon the freckled boy's shoulder. A swift slap to the backside snapped Izuku out of his nervous breakdown, instantly sending him scrambling up the stone ladder. For obvious reasons, Hagakure didn't bother to hide a smile. The boys reached the first level, Mineta still on pause mode. The platform was railed in from the front by a wide, flat plane serving as a counter. Opposite this sat a slightly lower shelf meant to be a bench. The walkway between them may be wide enough for 2 people to sidestep through in passing. Izuku fixed his calming sight on one of his fellow students, denoted by the cobalt blazer he wore across his shoulders like a cape. The young man sat as reclined as he could, his long legs easily crossing the walkway to prop his polished black shoes on the counter ahead. If they wanted a spot, they'd have to get past him. Before Midoriya could even open his mouth, the boy's sharp, amber gaze fixed upon the hero Taku. The greenette froze, ignoring Hagakure poking at his thighs. There was a very familiar intensity in the boy's glare, one that Izuku was ill-prepared to face again in this place. Move on. The order was given with absolution. Izuku heeded the words without pause, climbing with a quick, steady pace to the second level. Toru followed, slowing just enough to spare a glance at the yellow-eyed jerk. The boy spared a moment to run a hand over his slicked, silver hair, continuing to flick some dust off his left shoulder. One should, after all, take care to preen following an encounter with the rabble. The 3 climbed onto the second level, sliding down to sit in the middle of the bench. Midoriya deposited his human cargo on a spot to his right, Hagakure sliding in on his left. Mineta had gotten over his social shock and sat silently, his gaze locked upon Izuku. The greenette just stared down at the counter, collecting himself after the short encounter. Toru rested a palm on his shoulder, unable to say anything. The room dimmed, the warm glow of the crystalline walls fading to a murky plum. The white light of the stalactite tip above cast a ghostly ambience over the startled student. Their collective murmurs barely had time to build before a pillar of pink light beamed up from behind the desk. The silhouette of the small dog, stark against the shining ray, began to slowly wag its tail. Silence filled the room as a dim veil of shadows flickered from the base of the light shaft. A low, grinding noise of stone against stone sounded from beneath the beam. The little dog bounded over to the far end of the oak desk, rear end up and tail a wagon as it gazed down at the source of the shadows, the grinding increasing in volume. Any minute now, a new voice echoed upwards as the fuchsia glow was steadily overtaken by the rising shade. A humming jingle rose out of the hole, prompting the puppy to jump into the gap. Izuku's hand caught Toru's wrist, pulling the girl back before she could enact a rescue attempt. Not once did his eyes leave the space beyond the teacher's desk. The warm glow of the classroom gradually returned. The invisible girl released a soft sigh as the panting form of her precious pup rose back into view. That air of calm was short-lived as all 3 teens went still, the black-eyed pup slapping its tail upon his dark-haired perch. A single, familiar strand of yellow stood out against the man's dark mane, dangling over the center of his brow. Tan-hued eyes shined with focus as his gaze drifted across the room and those gathered in it, the rising platform coming to a halt as it came in line with the floor. When he caught sight of the trio from earlier, altogether and frankly unamused, he allowed a small grin to form. "Good day, students," he boomed, striding around his desk as his voice filled the lecture hall. "I am Hokuto Senki, instructor for the intro course of heroics and the finer details intrinsic to life as the world's most popular form of civil service." At this point, the dog seated atop his head started pawing at his master's forehead, bunching up and stretching the skin over his eyes. "And this," Mr. Senki pointed to his white-pelted passenger, "is Osmond. He is 1 and 4 months and will be assisting me throughout the year. He is paid in love, by commission, not by the hour." Osmond helpfully yipped before taking hold of his master's finger in his mouth, all the while persisting in massaging the man's brow. Mr. Senki did nothing to deter these actions. A howling wind tore through the entry trench. The students huddled down, arms folded over their heads as powerful gales spun chaotically about the auditorium. Izuku hovered protectively over Hagakure who, in turn, snatched up Minoru and drew the small boy into her lap. The torrent lasted 3 seconds before cutting off in an instant, leaving near total silence. All were quickly made aware of the haggard, heavy breathing coming from the prone figure down below. Hokuto stood before the young man in Aozora blue, staring at the haphazardly laid-out student. Osmond still had hold of the man's finger. He also continued to knead his brow flesh. The pair had barely reacted to the gust at all. The student, huffing all the way, trailed his gaze up the body of his professor. Midoriya held a note of humor as he watched the newcomer's crimson, bullet-shaped pompadour trace its way up the teacher's frame. The display could honestly be considered mildly threatening, in a funny way. Red eyes met light brown, staring over a set of thin shades fallen too far down his nose. "So, can we just pretend I was on time today?" Mr. Senki blinked. Twice. Again, short chapter, mostly just serves as an in-between. The idea of having the classroom set up as multiple levels is one I stole from Made in Abyss. I really want to sell the odd geometry of this place, impossible ceilings, shifting layout, moving platforms. It's more like the lair of some fantasy overlord than any sort of school. A few more students are introduced. The Spider Girl makes a reappearance, as do Hokuto and Osmond. We'll be fleshing them out more in the upcoming entries. And next chapter in particular should be a good deal meatier. Coming up, Mr. Senki sets the tone for the class with an impromptu lesson. Well, a series of lessons, as things will turn. Chapter 6, A Learning Experience. Chapter text. Here you go, boys and girls. Meat. Content-filled meat. Eat, eat, eat. Their instructor slowly tapped his foot, eyes pointedly locked upon the ascending figure of his most tardy student. The kid at first looked about ready to jet his way up the rows of seats, but a piercing yip from Osmond put a swift stop to that. The boy sheepishly reached the end of his climb, taking a seat just beside the ladder in the same row as Izuku's group. Okay, Mr. Senki hopped back, perching his black panted rear on the edge of his desk. Let's start with a simple welcome. As I hope all of you already know, you are now enrolled in the Starter Heroics course of Aozora High, a program that is, if I may be so bold, swiftly cementing itself as the second most prestigious in the country. The professor pushed off his rest, striding towards the edge of the room's central platform. Osmond planted his rump atop his master's head, sitting up straight as he cast a cool gaze over the gathered pupils. Of course, we have no intention of stopping at second best. Striving to be greater is a value everyone should hold, pro heroes even more so. Hokuto paced the wide rim of the dais, gaze sweeping over the wall of students. Osmond's tail slapped against his skull every couple of seconds. Our job, my job, here is to push you. Physically, mentally, emotionally, if I really have to. Limits are not a concept you'll have the luxury of holding should you manage to go pro. To that end, we'll endeavor to drop that baggage as swiftly as possible. Izuku sat forward, his waist pressed against the lip of the counter. The hero hopeful hung on his teacher's every word, eyes all but twinkling in growing wonder. At his side, Mineta had climbed onto the tabletop, his expression matching Izuku's, albeit with a hint of apprehension showing. Hagakure, for her part, sat with chin in hand, taking in the ensuing speech with a degree of thought. Not that any could place her expression for obvious reasons. To that end, Mr. Senki hustled around the far side of his desk, slamming down on the thick notebook his pup had been pawing through earlier. Grab your shit and get down here. The perimeter of the platform radiated that familiar pink light. Hokuto looked back to his class with an easy grin in place. We'll be taking a little trip today. The students of Aozora were still puzzling over the fact that their class private elevator had a direct connection to the subway, or at least it seemed that way. It was hard to gauge the depth of the shaft with how fast the platform was going. There were a few times Izuku swore they were rising back up or even going sideways. When they had finally stopped, it was a short walk through a narrow corridor and suddenly they were in the station. Looking back, the way they came revealed a tiled wall, one which was ironically stamped with graffiti stating "Do not pass." The collective impression was to chalk it up to their school being weird again. With the passing of the morning rush, the train cars had emptied out some. This being Japan, that mostly meant people weren't quite standing on top of each other. Mineta had swiftly reserved space on Izuku's back, for efficiency as the boy had claimed. Having spent the better part of a year hauling washing machines over sand dunes, Midoriya barely felt the added weight. Hagakure sat. She was one of the only 3 students who had managed the incredible feat, in a seat right in front of the 2 boys. Our new crew, mostly Izuku, was running interference, blocking overeager riders who thought they'd snag a free spot on the bench. It shocked the 2 boys to no end how easily people overlooked Toru's presence. The invisible girl seemed quite used to it. Mr. Senki stood nearby, pitched up against a pole in the middle of the aisle. Osmond sat nestled against his master's chest, the pup's top half poking over the second highest button of his scarlet button-up. He was currently in the midst of a power nap. Joining Osmond in his dreamland escapades was the class resident tardy, one Kisukizuma. The unlikely pair slept close together, the boy dead on his feet, his full weight pressed against Mr. Senki's chest. A line of drool ran down the teacher's dress shirt, his student's impressive hair spike aggressively invading the space beneath his chin. Mr. Senki, his face an impassive mask, continued to scan over the screen of his smartphone, tapping away every few moments. A digitized explosion drew Izuku's sight overhead to one of his similarly phone-focused classmates. The girl with the spider limbs, Ikaruga Kirigane if he recalled, rested lazily against the top of the train car. Her arachnid legs were splayed out, holding her body to the ceiling and drawing a few curious stares from the regular passengers. Ikaruga gave no notice to the added attention, her full focus on the wide screen of her cell as her thumbs blazed away. Judging by the rapid eye movement and the furious barrage of battle noise, Midoriya assumed whatever game she was playing was putting her through the crucible. This little excursion will ultimately have a purpose, right Teach? Izuku suppressed the urge to flinch, despite the speaker's even tone. Their earlier, brief encounter painted a certain expectation in Midoriya's mind. The amber-eyed boy fixed a mild glare towards their teacher, one of his earbuds pinched between two fingers. He paid the Hirotaku zero attention. Mr. Senki did not respond verbally. Mr. Senki began swiping and tapping away at his smartphone, flipping the screen over to face his questioning student. Midoriya was at an odd angle, but he could just make out the word wait in all capital letters. The boy wearing his jacket like a cloak, Naota Kimi, brushed some of his steel-hued locks aside, replacing his earbud. A curious hum from Hagakure caught Midoriya's attention. The girl's posture implied her gaze was towards the window, watching the late morning cityscape sweep by. A slight shift of her shoulders said she'd noticed the boy's interest. I think I recognize the area. It looks like we're headed towards Surkesh. Wait, what? Mineta blurted, reminding the others of his presence. What could there be to see out there? Izuku had fallen into one of his mutter streams, picking apart the district name and why it sounded familiar. The small mumble fit came to an abrupt end as the boy found his answer, support gear. Toru flinched back at the outburst, Mineta ducking below the greenette's shoulders, away from his mouth. Ikaruga barely caught her handheld after fumbling it, fixing the top of Midoriya's head with an even glare as she continued her furious gaming. Osmond yawned, Kisuke moaning softly as fresh drool flowed down the front of his teacher's shirt. Mr. Senki quirked a brow, eyes fixed on his phone. Sorry, Izuku yelped, hand nervously scratching the back of his head as Minoru climbed over his opposite shoulder. Attempting to recover, Izuku continued, but yeah, Surkesh is a heavy industrial district. It specializes in manufacturing, and there are at least 3 fairly well-established support companies in the area. Mineta nodded along. That makes sense. With all the materials going in and out, the factories probably collaborate to move larger shipments all at the same time. Get a bulk discount from the shippers and whoever provides raw goods. Midoriya blinked at his shoulder-mounted companion. It was rare for him not to be the expositor of the group. The boy fixed a soft smile, humming along to Mineta's observation. How do you recognize the area? The two boys looked up, Ikaruga still engrossed in her game even as she made her inquiry. Hagakure didn't miss a beat. My father has some connections to one of the companies out here. They've been working out a hero costume for me for a little over a year now. They've been collecting my hair as the base material. Izuku's fist pressed over his mouth, his default thinking pose. Minoru just stared down his female classmate, irises shrinking into his pupils as his mind grappled with the concept of a girl going into battle wearing only her hair. Considering the fact that her invisibility persists across every surface of her body, it does make sense that they would use hair as a base material in a uniform's construction. At least it would be easier to gather than having Hagakure go in for skin grafts or some similar procedure. But how would they induce the same light-bending effects in a synthesized cloth? Perhaps running some kind of energy current through the garment to stimulate the reaction. Midoriya, once again, had fallen deep into one of his trances. Most of his assembled classmates, mulling about the train car, fixed the possessed youth with looks of growing unease. Naota rolled his eyes before returning to his music, Ikaruga never even taking focus away from her flashing phone screen. Toru did her best to smile encouragingly throughout the display, her efforts only slightly ruined by the whole unable-to-be-seen thing. Mineta still hadn't moved past the thought of a girl wearing only her hair. Osmond let loose a bark that absolutely did not match his size, the sound ripping through the enclosed space with the subtlety of a gunshot. Kisuke shot away from the pup and his owner, yelping himself awake as he collapsed to the floor in an undignified heap. His thin, rectangular shades somehow managed to stay perfectly in place. Mr. Senki, not missing a beat, vaulted off the steel bar and towards the nearest train door. Look alive, class. Next stop is us. Surkesh was a viable maze of office parks and industrial complexes. Izuku had to marvel at the sheer size of the district. The area large enough to house a small city. Even with that vast space, Surkesh was densely packed. Expansive warehouses and manufacturing centers pushing the more administrative buildings into tight, upward-reaching structures. Wider streets, a necessity for all the trucking and public transport, exacerbated the issue further. Izuku's class had come down from the station into the shadow of a massive factory, its structure a haphazard mess of walkways and pipeworks. Their path ran adjacent to the complex, the edge of the facility coming right up to the sidewalk, separated only by a barbed wire fence. Another student spoke up, asking Mr. Senki exactly where they were going. Their instructor responded by quickening his stride, veering left as the sidewalk bent in at a slight angle. The students perked as they noted another structure ahead, a rather underwhelming structure. As if to mock their preconceptions, Hokuto beelined his way across the street towards the 6-story parking garage. A few of the students skipped a step in blatant shock, others simply halting in place as their teacher blatantly jaywalked into mild traffic, wondering just how this man had blundered his way into the field of education. Izuku, and by default Mineta, were leaning towards the latter group when Toru offered a guiding shove, ushering the greenette and his human backpack towards a nearby crosswalk. The trio were approaching the gaping entrance just a step behind Ikaruga, who had found safe crossing despite being transfixed on her gaming, when an explosion shook the ground. A quick glance up revealed a cloud of smoke rising from the top level of the parking structure. Mineta was 2 words through a shocked exclamation when Midoriya gave his warning. Hold on. The 2 boys, mainly the one acting as the mount, shot across the road and into the first level of the garage. Harsh wind whipped past Izuku's head as he dashed forward, his dead sprint unimpeded by the strangely bare lot. In record time, the hero hopeful reached the center of the building, making for a wide pillar inside which he could spy the beginnings of a staircase. Midoriya shot up the steps 5 at a time, hitting the first landing in 3 bounds. Rather than attempting to turn to continue up the next set of steps, Izuku went airborne, twisting mid-leap before planting his feet against the wall. The boy kicked off in an instant, propelling himself up to the lip of the next landing. Minoru could do little more than grapple to the back of his classmate's head, too keyed up on adrenaline to even scream. Izuku continued his pattern of ascent, hungrily devouring the distance to the top floor as his skin radiated a hot crimson. Rushed footfalls clattered out from below, at least 2 individuals, maybe a few seconds behind. Midoriya raced onward. The top of the stairway was covered, a heavy blast door separating it from the rooftop. Izuku didn't slow in the slightest, his entire body charged with white-hot energy. Mad confidence saw the boy lunging, turning over as he aimed both feet at the top of the door. A powerful shout accompanied the deafening crack of the sturdy barrier being blasted off its hinges. Izuku crouched low, riding the down door a grinding meter across the asphalt. Mineta, having lost all color in his complexion, began to issue a weak, high-pitched whine as the door ground itself to a halt. Ikaruga had, as a surprise to herself, reached the rooftop at the same time as the 2 boys. Considering that she'd simply scaled straight up the side of the structure, this spoke volumes of the sheer amount of hustle shown by Midoriya. Mr. Senki appeared through the open portal 3 seconds after, looking as though he'd just gone for a brief jog. The scarlet-shirted instructor made a swift cut to the side, clear of the open doorway. At that moment, a howling whirlwind tore through the opening, a trail of spiraling dust following in its wake. Kisuke flew forth, both arms extended back as forceful twisters traveling down his limbs thrust him forward. Unfortunately, Midoriya had come to rest directly in the spike-haired boy's path. Good fortune reached the greenette as the physical tax of his recent charge took hold of his body, Izuku slumping face down onto the blacktop. Mineta, however, was still perched atop Midoriya's head, just within the impact zone. The 2 students were sent into a wild tumble, Kisuke just managing to stop his propulsion and snatch up the much smaller boy. He had not quite drawn Minoru to his chest when the duo slammed into a thick wall of steel with an echoing thud. A notable pause followed, the silence stretching a moment longer as the dust began to settle. A sudden call of "Wait, what?" shattered the atmosphere. Izuku inclined his head, locking on the toppled forms of his classmates. Kisuke looked a little roughed up, his uniform sporting some new tears and his shades slightly off-center. His crimson cone of hair remained remarkably solid. Minoru was in a similarly scuffed state, though with the added aesthetic of having the left side of his face planted into the side of a metal blast shield, Kisuke's body weight pressing the kid harder against the steel surface. A pair of new individuals stood nearby, the shorter figure apparently backed into the taller one to dodge the projectile team. The surprise call from earlier no doubt came from the man, his bushy eyebrows screwed into something resembling confusion. All Midoriya could focus on was the fact that the gaudy, multicolored diamond pattern on his sweater vest was repeated on his legging. The material looked to be the same as well. "Why are you poking my face?" was mumbled by Kisuke, his tone more curious than vexed. The girl half of the new duo sat crouched over the 2 boys, her hands busy prodding both their faces with a pair of screwdrivers. Her yellow eyes were intently focused on her task, the effect amplified by their strange, crosshair patterns. "Just checking your vitals," said the girl. The older man shifted his steel gaze towards the girl, the midday sun glancing off his shaved scalp. "Hatsum, that is not the proper method of diagnosing a human being." Good thing I'm not looking to be a doctor." Hatsum rose to her feet, twirling her tools like an old-school pistolero before sheathing them in the thick band of her tool belt. Again the sun glinted, this time off the rounded lenses of the brass goggles perched atop her head. A mane of pink hair sat beneath, the chest-length strands styled into thick braids. By this point, Ikaruga had walked around to stand near Midoriya, her eyes focused on the two strangers, though her handheld was making a reappearance. Izuku made an effort to stand but found he lacked the energy. Hagakure appeared at his side, swiftly throwing one of his arms over her shoulders. The invisible girl hauled her classmate to his feet with surprising ease. "Tomo," Mr. Senki called, walking past his students with a flat palm raised in greeting. "Still haven't managed to singe off the bushy brows?" Tomo, the bald and poorly dressed man, offered their instructor a superb eyebrow waggle. "Dare to dream." Hokuto continued forward, exchanging a handshake with Tomo and a brief nod at Hatsune. The girl paid him no mind as she strode around to the other side of the blast shield. Midoriya stood a bit straighter, Hagakure keeping a hand on his back but letting him stand on his own. Kisuke edged in from the side, taking a spot next to Ikaruga. Mineta sat grasped beneath the boy's arm, halfway to consciousness with an obvious black eye blooming. The remainder of the class filed out from the staircase a few moments later. Mr. Senki clapped his hands together, forming a triangle over his head. Osmond, poking out from his shirt collar, followed that up with a sharp bark. "Welcome to our first stop class, Cirkesh Industrial Park. More specifically, the offices of Maltech's Japan branch, S antiquated Western parking complex." The man stood with feet together, head tossed back, and arms spread wide as though presenting some wondrous vista. Silence reigned as the few observers still taking Hokuto seriously cast curious glances about the area. Ikaruga's game spat out a few digitized explosions as she advanced on the enemy fortress, Kisuke pumping his fist whenever the girl smashed through her opponent. Already tired of his friend's antics, Tomo slipped under one of Mr. Senki's arms, shoving the teacher aside with a palm to the face. "Okay, let's just move this along now." Tomo ran his thumb and pointer towards opposite ends of his upper lip, smoothing out his mustache as he loudly cleared his throat. "Why don't we start with the obvious question? What are you doing here?" In the ensuing pause, Hokuto plopped himself on the ground, sitting cross-legged like a little kid. Osmond hopped out of his master's shirt and into his lap. "Support gear," shot Naota, all present turning their attention to the stoic boy. Naota remained silent, his piece said. "Succinct," Tomo said, "and not entirely inaccurate." Hatsune came marching out from behind the blast shield, pressing some sort of soldering tool into a softball-sized discus. Tomo quickly snatched the device away. "Hatsune, rule number 1. The girl groaned as she pulled off her goggles. "No unsupervised endeavors." Hatsune crossed her arms, and Izuku made a special effort to avoid looking as her limbs lifted her bust. That black tank top did nothing to conserve modesty. "This structure is one that no longer serves its intended purpose." Tomo began tossing the mechanical disc from one hand to the other, some worrying sparks issuing from various points. A newer, larger, more modern construction was built in a superior location, able to service our factory, warehouse, development, and corporate employees all at once. The bald technician began spinning the disc atop his finger, balancing the device along its curved edge. Hatsune was thoroughly unimpressed. "I have taken personal initiative to utilize this space as an outside testing ground. Part of that, a fairly substantial part, is due to the tendencies of my young ward here." At this, Tomo made to ruffle Hatsune's already wild dreads. The girl instead slipped his reach, swiping the discus in one quick motion. She skipped away to join Midoriya and his classmates as she pulled some sort of multi-tool from her belt. Tomo rolled his eyes at her antics. "But a portion of my reasoning comes from my own engineering philosophy, one that I feel all of mankind should strive towards. Tell me, students, in one word, what have I effectively done with this old parking platform?" The class cast inquisitive glances at their seated teacher. Mr. Senki pointedly ignored them, eyes on Tomo's back as he busily pet a napping Osmond, waving his hand to garner attention. Mineta offered a dazed, recycling. Tomo crouched down, presenting dual finger pistols in a quick draw maneuver. The man gave it to Mineta with both barrels, his arms snapping back at the intense recoil. Shooting to his feet, the man's limbs spread wide as he mouthed out the sound of an explosion. Boom! Tomo waggled an approving finger in the small boy's direction. "That's what I'm talking about." Mineta would have hid behind something if he wasn't still being lugged like a sack of flour. He settled for adopting the face of one being forced to suck a sour lemon. The titles best and brightest are often given to those who innovate, create. We are a people fundamentally obsessed with the idea of the new. Hatsune continued to tinker with the pilfered disc throughout her instructor's speech, not bothering to look up from her task. Nevertheless, a pleased smile brightened her features. The achievements of yesterday are often forgotten, their benefits taken for granted by our sedentary society. This is even more so for our failures and the antiquated, remembered not for the sake of learning from the past but in order to ridicule it. In this place, Tomo stamped his foot a few times to accentuate this point. Itself a structure which has lasted beyond its intended purpose, we strive to salvage some degree of success from the otherwise abandoned. To rough out this, Hatsum began to pace away from the group of teens, moving to stand beside the blast shield. With superb timing, the pink-haired girl seemed to finish her tinkering, pumping her fist in joy. Just as she came to a stop, Tomo threw a prompt nod in her direction and, not missing a beat, his protege picked up the dialogue. "Hello fellow teens, my name is Mei Hatsum. Allow me to present today's project." Hatsum held up the high-tech discus. The glass housing at its center now pulsed with a pale glow, the light fading and returning in a slow rhythm. Izuku's inquisitive mind was already going over possibilities at a mile a second. This basic piece is actually the third prototype of a project known as Citadel. Its function, Mei paused, just long enough for her smug to fully manifest. "Well, how about a demonstration?" Holding the device in her upturned palm, Hatsum brought her free hand down in a wide arc, slapping down on the glass housing. The lazy glow surged with sudden radiance, turning a bright yellow. A small hum issued from the disc, building to a high pitch before stabilizing. No sooner did the sound steady than a sunken sphere appeared, encasing the device as well as Mei's clasped hands and about half of her lower arms. Anyone who wasn't paying attention before directed their full focus on the display, a few quick gasps pulling free of some student. Tomo tossed a swift smirk at the only other adult in attendance. Hokuto and Osmond rolled their eyes. Hatsum pressed on. As may or may not be evident, Project Citadel seeks to generate a defensive field using a distinct energy conversion process. The high point of our research is versatility. By altering the intensity of the energy involved, we can change the very nature of the barrier itself. Imagine a shelter which can alternate between being an impenetrable wall to one which allows people to pass through but will catch objects traveling at high speed or block flames and explosions. Wow, that's just like the French hero Bastien. All eyes focused on Mei swung in Izuku's direction. Hagakure had since left the boy to stand on his own, remaining near just in case. Now she was readying to knock her friend out of another of his potential tirades. But Hatsum seemed to jump at the observation, her enthusiasm clear as day. Ooh, good eye. He was actually one of the driving forces behind the project, both in inspiration and involvement. Not only has his agency supplied a significant amount of funds, but our European branch was allowed extended periods of testing and observation of his defensive aura and its capabilities. Bastien always was one of my favorite heroes, even if he is stationed halfway around the world. Number 15 in ranking for all of Europe is nothing to sneeze at, but I still feel like he doesn't get enough recognition. Tomo and Mei nodded at Midoriya's words, the pinkette with far more zest. Mr. Senki appeared torn between feeling proud of, embarrassed by his student. Hagakure had rolled up her sleeves, hoping to hide her raised arm, poised for a wake-up slap. Never hurts to be prepared for the worst. "Oh, definitely," barked Hatsum. He's always been a big proponent for advancing technology. His uncle actually heads the entire European division of Maltech. Silas DuPont, said Ikaruga, stunning even Izuku and Mei. He brought virtual intelligence forward by at least 20 years in the span of 2. That man is the reason medical robotics has become so streamlined and commonplace in society. Mei came back to her earlier mirth. Heck yeah, Mr. DuPont is a personal inspiration of mine. He's basically the gold standard of what it means to be an inventor. I'm hoping to surpass him before the year is out. Hagakure could only marvel at the brilliant technique as Tomo seemed to phase in behind the eager gadgeteer. His presence noticed only when the bald man delivered a precise bop to the top of Mei's noggin. The blow looked both soft enough to avoid a pained reaction, but sharp enough that the pinkette immediately snapped to attention. A simply superb showing of skill. As the senior engineer gave his apprentice a light scolding, Izuku couldn't help but be impressed with the girl. Hatsum was a little odd and she clearly possessed an obnoxious amount of confidence, but you couldn't deny the girl had drive. Her goals were lofty to say the least, something Midoriya could more than empathize with. Mei warded off her mentor. But back to the point, please observe the following. The dreadlocked inventor turned and began marching the short distance to the blast shield. Tomo gestured for the gathered students to bunch up behind the barrier, Mr. Senki hugging his legs and rolling into position as Osmond bounced atop his tumbling form. Without pause, Hatsum gave a deft slap to the disc's bright plate, tossing the shield prototype over the blast wall. The pulsing light shot up in tempo, a shrill whine peeling free of the wheeling device. It was just before the disc hit the ground that the demonstration really began. Those who managed to spot looking through the barrier's glass panel bodily recoiled as the device activated. There was no blinding flash to the explosion. There was barely even any sound. The sudden whoosh of rushing air cut off almost as soon as it started, leaving a void of silence in its wake. What really caught everyone was the ripple. A cloud of debris was kicked up, for sure, as would be the case with any explosive burst. But the distortion, the physical force of the blast shot through space like a swift wave, the period of silence immediately following in its wake. Even with the defensive shield imposed before them, everyone felt the disturbance pass through them. At once the field of kicked-up particles ripped outwards from the epicenter, pelting the barrier and surrounding ground with a storm of crackling cacophony. The observers reeled back, both due to the violent noise and a delayed response to the previous wave streaking through their bodies. Even Hatsum and Tomo couldn't suppress a flinch in spite of, presumably, being used to it. There were a still few moments as the rain of dust tapered off, the assembled taking their time to recover. Perhaps more shakily than she would have liked, May began. As you can attest, the concussive force alone, even through a solid barrier, is more than enough to stun the target. And as the explosion itself has no heat or fragmentation component intrinsic to it, it serves as a viable non-lethal option for capture maneuvers while sporting a bit more kick. The Aozora students were mostly too stunned to heed the explanation. And then Ikaruga spoke up, so its main draw is shock and awe. The dreaded inventor seemed to reclaim her energy at this. How right you are. A huge part of any conflict is reaching a resolution. Demoralizing the enemy is literally half the battle in and of itself. Long strings of exposition seemed to flip a switch in Izuku. Though the boy had a palm half covering his mouth and his face turned toward the floor, his voice rang surprisingly clear and concise. It's interesting that the explosion itself appears to have a sort of piercing effect. Even through the blast shield, a jarring amount of force managed to reach us. The most obvious parallel is Bastion's shield energy and its unique property of selectively choosing what it permits to pass. Hagakure, herself roused by the building word flurry, had nearly brought her arm into position for a second attempt at snapping Midoriya out of his headspace when May, again, intervened. Another great observation. As this stems from Project Citadel, the energy source has been kept the same to further explore the potentials of its use. Does that mean the blast could somehow be said to affect only specific targets? It would be invaluable in situations where friendlies or civilians were mixed in with the enemy. That is one avenue of development we are considering. At present, though, we're working on some method of shaped explosion. The nature of the device makes it capable of multiple use. So having it be deployable from close range may prove even more optimal than as an indirect fire method. A handheld repulsion device does have a certain wealth of appeal. Watching Izuku and May converse as such was some sort of spectacle. The former refused to look up from his thinker's stance, and the junior inventor held her head so high she was basically staring off into the clouds. Hagakure and Tomo met eyes for a brief moment, an instantaneous understanding passing between them as both parties raised their arms in unison. Minetta's fist struck Midoriya in the ribs, snapping him out of the presentation. The small boy was still being lugged around by Kisuke, the spike-haired teen giving Izuku a happy wave in greeting. At the same time, a rogue Osmond bopped his head against Hatsum's legs, yipping to be picked up. The girl swiftly complied. Toru and Tomo stood dejected, their moments of purpose denied. Hokuto seized the opportunity, announcing himself with a hand clap. Allow me to summarize the importance of our first visit. Support gear is pretty dope. Tomo showcased the swiftest of mood swings, turning from utterly downtrodden to hands up in a joyous raise-the-roof display. They stepped away from him. A good 90% of licensed pros use some form of supplemental gadget in their day-to-day patrols. To say that quality gear is vital in the field is the greatest understatement imaginable. Pausing, Mr. Senki reached out towards the dancing engineer. May, and by extension Osmond, skittered quickly to the far side of the blast shield as their red-clad professor snaked an arm around Tomo's head, his free hand catching one of the man's wrists. The people who craft and maintain these devices. At this, Mr. Senki presented his captive friend the way a child does a favorite toy, are your everyday heroes. Their efforts are what will keep you and the innocence you protect alive through the worst of it. Appreciate them. Damn it, Hokuto. You're gonna wring my skull in two. As is customary among good friends, Mr. Senki added some extra torque to his crushing hold before finally releasing Tomo. The bald engineer flapped away, hands hastily patting about his head as though making sure it was still properly attached. He seemed quite concerned with his eyebrows in particular. Osmond scampered back around from the far side of the blast shield. The pup had a familiar disc-shaped gadget held within his mouth. They followed a moment after, not a hint of worry to be had. Osmond gave a cutesy little twirl before rearing up on his hind legs, presenting the device to Hatsum. The young inventor plucked the discus from Osmond's mouth, giving him a few appreciative head pats. Being a dog, Osmond immediately started yipping and pouncing about, expecting the game to continue. May, with little defense to puppy tactics, gave the device a quick lob. Tomo snatched the disc out of the air, using the hand not preoccupied brushing over his thick brows. Hokuto caught the dog, lugging the young pup over his shoulders like a sack of rice. Turning back to his class, Mr. Senki threw out a grand thumbs up. See, just like that, maximum teamwork. His tone could not have been flatter. Kisuke offered an applause, his movements jostling Mineta something fierce. Fighting back a smile, Mr. Senki announced, "All right, we've been here long enough. Got more spots to visit and daylight's burning." Their teacher walked through their ranks, spinning his finger in a group-up gesture. Osmond happily slipped free of his master's grasp and reclaimed his post atop the man's scalp. Tomo glanced over the mechanical dish, wiping clean the occasional bit of slobber. He turned to May. I think that'll be enough field testing for today. Time to log data and run diagnostics. If anything, the prospect of office work seemed to instantly recharge the pinkette. Oh man, I've got so many new ideas and theories to catalog tonight. Not to mention I've got my own babies I need to final proof the designs for. There really aren't enough hours in the day. I'll have to cut back on sleep and forego eating again. Tomo slipped the discus into his back pocket and turned towards his friend and his retreating students. How cute-o. The instructor stopped and turned. Yeah, take this one with you. Catching Hatsune by the shoulder, he shoved her towards the crowd of teens. Osmond gave an excited bark and vacated his throne. May rounded on her mentor, the pup rushing around her feet. What? But, Mr. Namada. Tomo Namada held up his hand. You've been here 2 full weeks and you've barely had a day's worth of downtime. I understand you don't want to waste time with this opportunity, but you're going to burn yourself out. May visibly scoffed at the notion. PFFT. Don't underestimate my dedication. I've got fuel to burn if it's for the sake of my babies. Her mentor plucked the goggles strapped to her skull, letting them snap back over her eyes. That's your problem. You're too single-minded. Take the rest of the afternoon and consider things other than your gadgets. For example, at this Tomo pinched her scalp between his fingers, rotating her sights onto the gathering of teens nearby, the same group that was closely watching their exchange. The senior engineer pointed to the students. This lot right here are your future clientele. Might be smart to start forming connections while you have the chance, before some other hungry gearhead gets their claws into them. The thought of future business prospects brought a sudden, eager light to Hatsune's strangely shaped eyes. And if you happen to get some friends out of it, Tomo crossed his arms, looking rather pleased with himself. We'll call that a fringe benefit. Nobody could be sure if May even heard that last bit, the eccentric girl having already made personal introductions to 4 people, including the dog. Hokuto ground out a tired breath, though the annoyance didn't quite reach his eyes. Tomo strode up and through the group, reaching his apprentice in the midst of her 7th introduction. Unfazed by her vibrancy, the bald man clapped a palm over her shoulder. And while you're out, bring some food back for us. That barbecue place has some good deals on bulk orders. Well, now that most of them have proper names, let's go over some of our OC class. Spider Girl gets a proper intro as Ikaruga Kirigane. Her first name comes from one of the original Hanzo girls from the Senran Kagura series, and her last name is shared with Iki, the main protagonist from Chivalry of a Failed Knight. Though she maintains a dry and stoic personality, she's an avid fan of fast, furious gaming, particularly bullet hells. Kisuke Yuzuma comes from a more novel inspiration. His first name is just kind of a Japanese name I like, nothing more to it. Yuzuma is a cut-off Uzumaki, less referencing Naruto and more the concept of spirals in general, to tie into Kisuke's rotating energy powers. I know his power is very similar to Nejire, but the original intent was to base it off of Bari's powers from the series Gash Bell. Also, you may recognize Kisuke's description if you, like me, spent a lot of time lurking through the early episodes of Season 1 of Hero Academia. It'll come up later. Naota's name, all of it, is just something I made up. No clue if it's in any way a proper name, but it sounds right enough and I like it, so there. In the long run I want Naota to have a bit more prominence than the other OC classmates, at least in terms of his overall purpose. I'll say that he fulfills a role somewhere between Todoroki and Bakugo, acting as our most antagonistic force so far within the classroom. The next stretch of chapters are gonna be pretty talky, just as some advanced warning. Gotta set up themes, relationships, and do a little world building, the usual. The entire elevator and secret door sequence was one of the last things I added. Originally had it so Hokuto just declares they're going on a trip and then bam, we're on a train. It was odd to read. Remember, aspiring writers, try reading over your work to see if it sounds coherent or not. I took it as another chance to mark Azora as the weird place. Circash's sort of sideways take on Hero Academia's tendency to use Star Wars names for their location. Never was a very avid fan of the series, so I elected an adjacent media for my name scheme. Circash is named after the Solarian homeworld from Mass Effect, lending to the district's nature as a hotspot for developing technologies. A lot of the details surrounding Project Citadel were things that I just threw in for flavor. There being a French hero named Bastien, his powers being the basis for the project, his uncle being a leading researcher in Maltech as well as the driving force behind this universe's robotic advances is pretty much just added details to prop up the idea of little disc thing that generates energy fields, just an example of how little thought of mine leads down a sudden rabbit hole of potential lore. Also a bit of an Iron Man reference with the comment on handheld repulsors. Couldn't resist. Can't forget about Tomo. I'm not sure why I used this name since the only character I know who shares it is A. certain individual who plays a rather pivotal, but brief, role in the flashbacks on Elfin Lied. His personality leans much more in the vein of someone like Might Guy, though I can't help but feel like he reminds me of a Bleach character or two. But my absolute lack of interest in that series makes it hard to remember. Let's finish off this commentary with Mei. I like using Mei. I feel like she represents a corner of the canon universe that we see a glimpse of, but never really get a satisfying peek at. I want her more in the forefront of this series. As you may have noticed, Mei is apprenticing under an established engineer at a big support tech company as opposed to studying at UA. More than just the hero course students were affected by the higher standards present in this timeline. Here, her penchant for explosions just makes her a tad too volatile for a school not intently focused on engineering and technology. Though I doubt Mei minds being fast-tracked into a professional internship. Well then, readers, next time, we reach the second stop of Mr. Senki's educational adventure, which leads to a few reunions and some insightful discussion. Chapter 7, Joint Education. Chapter Text. Okay, we're going to be going to a more familiar setting this chapter, and we'll have ourselves an extensive collection of guest appearances. Want to know more? Read on. The coach bus was privately owned, part of a small batch used exclusively for educational purposes. Izuku couldn't say how vital this trip was to their learning experience, but his teacher seemed confident enough. And at the end of the day, any mishandling of school resources was Mr. Senki's problem. And those blaster boots Star Child uses are top-notch equipment. Did you know the pair she's wearing now are actually their 7th iteration? Designed to compact her boost quirk and funnel the flow through tighter channels, giving an increase in performance whilst nearly having the required energy of the initial design. Midoriya had his own problems to deal with. Yeah, Star's rebranded herself a lot over the years, but her blast boots have been a mainstay, even if they've gone through plenty of styles. I'm honestly surprised each new look wasn't also an updated model. We'd probably be on version 28 if that were the case. Talking with Hatsume was an intense affair. The girl had a blatant tendency to babble on and on, her excitement for favored topics seemingly infinite. For anyone but Midoriya, this may have been a task. But possessing his own unique talents and overly verbose conversation, and with Mei's interests so closely intertwined with his own, Izuku proved himself a capable opponent. For the most part, Midoriya's main problem now stemmed from Hatsume's own obsessive focus. The young inventor had vacated her seat across the aisle as soon as the dialogue got underway. A laptop wrenched open and set upon the boy's lap. Mei ended up crouched between Izuku's knees and the back of the seat in front of him, displaying a remarkable tolerance for being squeezed into tight quarters. The unfortunate detail for Izuku was that Mei was still only wearing that tank top, the one with a very generous neckline. Being down on her knees right in front of him, Hatsume was giving the hero hopeful a rather choice view of her cleavage. Midoriya was doing his best to stay focused on her face, which itself was too close for comfort, but that most stimulating of sight stayed teasingly on the bottom of his periphery. From the seat next to him, Mineta was doing the opposite, outright straining for a shot down the front of Mei's top. The girl seemed utterly oblivious to the small boy's efforts, even with how blatant he was being. Toru, though, the person actually occupying the seat and who had Minoru on her lap, took notice enough for the both of them. The invisible girl made no comment, one of her rolled-up sleeves rising behind the tiny teen's back. Of course, Mineta paid no attention to the shifting of fabric behind him. Of course, he couldn't see Hagakura's palm place itself just before his eyes. Boy sure did notice the stunning flash of light that blared into his sight. That sudden, blinding second was enough to send Mineta scrambling backwards with a shrill cry. Toru bounced out of her seat, dodging the boy who slammed into the firm cushion. When his pain rolling left Minoru on his front, the girl sat back down, right on top of the grape head, wedging him into the back corner of the seat. The boy was caught, face down, his arms trapped against his chest, just enough space between his nose and the cushion to breathe. The part of Minoru that wanted to protest was harshly silenced by the part endlessly chanting in his mind. There's a girl's butt, it's so close, there's a girl's butt, it's so close, there's a girl's butt, it's so close. Midoriya sent a slightly concerned look towards the scene. Toru pressed a palm against the boy's cheek and pushed his sight back towards Mei, more specifically, towards her boob window. Izuku went bright red once again, Mei continuing to exposit information, none the wiser to the goings-on around her. Ikaruga mimicked her position from the train ride earlier, her arachnid limbs stretched across the overhang racks, suspending her over the aisle. The game she was playing seemed to be much slower paced, allowing the girl a few glances down at Hatsume's constantly shifting laptop. Kisuke was making up for his snooze session on the last transport by being extra lively. This translated to the spike-haired boy bouncing up and down the aisle, jumping into unoccupied rows to gaze in awe at the passing cityscape. Osmond, taking up his new throne atop Kisuke's conical pompadour, only served to encourage this behavior, his wagging tail smacking the back of the boy's scalp with eager vitality. Their teacher sat up at the front, largely ignoring their antics as he chatted up the bus driver. The heavily bearded man might have been happy to converse if Mr. Senki wasn't making such a sizable dent in the cookie stash he kept beside his seat. At least the instructor's presence seemed to ward off the jumpy kid and the dog. All Might's really the hardest person to work with in the industry. Izuku's focus shot onto Hatsume's face, the girl scanning over some diagrams on her monitor. With a slight tremble in his voice, the boy said, "What makes you say that?" Not looking up, May clarified, "I mean, for us gadget makers, people like that are a nightmare. They're generally competent and have gotten by for a while on a strong quirk, so they tend to snub the idea of support equipment in general. On top of that, most of the time you do get them invested in some piece of tech. They have to be made to demanding specifications or the client's power itself will break it in the thick of things, further tarnishing their view of my field." Ikaruga glanced under her screen. "Well, All Might's already ultra-powerful. He really doesn't have much use for anything extra." At that, May tuned her literal crosshairs towards the spider girl. Her fingers were still sniping keys as she began. "But that's kind of the problem too. Everybody compares themselves to All Might. They do so much to try to emulate him." "Is that really a problem?" Izuku interjected, a hint of heat behind his words. "Why shouldn't people be inspired by the #1 hero?" The reply came from an unexpected source, a frosty chill settling over the space as Naota turned away from the window, past Hatsume's vacated seat and across the aisle to Izuku and company. "The problem is everyone else isn't All Might. Just because the world's strongest man can solve 90% of his worries by throwing a punch, jumping a building, or striking a pose doesn't make it viable for everybody. Hopeless folks are so preoccupied with what All Might does they never find their own way, figure out what they can do." Midoriya felt every word, every syllable, like a knife stabbing into his body. Naota's cold gaze was spread evenly over their entire group, but Izuku couldn't help but feel targeted. The other boy had no way of knowing that one of the people he was talking to was All Might's successor, the newest holder of One for All. Someday, Midoriya would take up the mantle of the symbol of peace. It was only a matter of time. "Is that my path? Is support gear really that big a deal?" Mineta, having squirmed enough to get his mouth free, posed the question. Again, with near mechanical precision, Hatsume snapped her sights on Toru's tiny captive. The boy flinched, but May's passive expression kept him mostly calm. If his tone hadn't been so inquisitive, the junior inventor might have thrown a little fire into her response. She continued to type throughout. "What do you think support equipment is?" Minoru looked perplexed, like he couldn't believe what he was being asked. "Well, stuff that helps a hero utilize their quirk." "Wrong." Everyone turned to Naota, the boy still holding his chin on his fist as he leaned against the window. When the yellow-eyed teen offered nothing else, Hatsume snapped her laptop shut. "Wallflower has a point." Naota groaned at the nickname. Hatsume continued, "While gadgets that enhance one's quirk are typical support gear, pretty much anything a hero incorporates into his daily equipment falls under that same umbrella. Something as simple as a Kevlar vest is considered support gear." Hagakure started clapping rapidly, chirping out, "Uo, uo," like an excited kindergartner. She was also bouncing in her seat, trapping Mineta in a mini hellscape of pain and pleasure. "That's why our costumes are labeled as support items." "Correct," Hatsume barked, riposting Toru's eager student with her own energized educator, thrusting her finger at the invisible girl. A certain sedentarily challenged young man flew into the seat behind May, leaning over the back of it. "That disc thing you showed us earlier," Kisuke said, "that counts too, right?" Seemed pretty all-purpose. Izuku had to pull back to avoid that ridiculous spine of hair. Indeed, both our side project as well as the main intention of Citadel could be defined as such, though they're both being developed with concerns of law enforcement and the military in mind as well. Kisuke threw up a full smile at his accurate answer, Osmond yipping at his mount's triumph. And then boy and dog were off again, darting from window to window, seeking points of interest. "That restaurant over there is authentic Italian. I've only been there 3 times in my life and I swear they only get better." Bark. At this point Naota slid into the aisle, standing smoothly to his full height. Midoriya couldn't help but flinch at the boy's proximity, a detail Hatsume noted curiously. Naota, catching the greenette's reaction, rolled his eyes before stepping forward. Kisuke watched his classmate walk towards the front of the bus. "Where are you going?" "The front door," Naota replied without looking. "We're almost at our destination. You know our next stop." Naota posted up behind Mr. Senki's seat, leaning on the back of it. Their instructor regarded his silver-haired ward with a small, thoughtful smile. The boy turned back to Kisuke, "Surprised you didn't figure it out, with you recognizing the area and all." There was a near minute of pause as the spike-haired teen squinted his eyes and thought. They slowly peeled open to comedic size as some degree of understanding lit up his being. At the same time Hagakure was gazing out the window at the passing neighborhood, her body seizing up with a sudden inhalation. Hatsume, being the most technical, pulled up navigation on her laptop. What she found brought the slightest hint of deflation to her demeanor. We're stopping at UA. Midoriya didn't know how to feel being back here. The glass building before them still glistened like a polished gem, every bit the monument it was when he first saw it. The #1 hero school in the nation lay ahead, almost challenging them to approach. As they came to the wide archway parting the school's perimeter wall, Mr. Senki slowed his pace at the front of the group. Gather around and stay close. I have special permission to enter these grounds, but if any of you stray too far, the defense gate will activate. We don't want to deal with that. Osmond barked to punctuate his master's words. The white puppy was still perched on Kisuke's scalp, the pair positioned towards the back of the progression. Acting on the pup's behalf, Kisuke reached out to press a palm against the back of a nearby student, pushing them forward. Ikaruga, not amused by the physical contact, sent an elbow into the boy's ribs, displaying his sense of loyalty. Osmond quickly hopped from Kisuke's head to Ikaruga's shoulder. The spike-haired teen pitched forward, the belly blow more shocking than painful. His classmate snatched him by the ear, proceeding to escort the boy closer to their instructor. She was still playing on her phone, now inputting commands with one hand. Osmond yipped at the display. The group strode under the massive steel arc clad in royal blue. Izuku continued forward, eyes locked on the main building as though it would lunge at him. Mineta, again riding on his shoulders, panned his sights across the gate and archway as they passed, clearly concerned with UA's famous defense measures. Hagakure was close behind, May keeping in step next to her. Aside from the inventor tinkering with a multi-tool and some sort of scrap metal cube, they were both quite subdued from their normal selves. Hatsune in particular refused to lift her eyes from the ramshackle device in her grasp. The only person who seemed generally carefree in being here was Naota, who marched forth with both hands in his pockets and an overall cool demeanor. Though, curiously enough, the boy had shrugged his blazer properly on himself. The band of teens in blue garnered some degree of interest from the UA students. The sheer volume of those departing the hallowed institution so early in the afternoon pointed to this being a half-day for the school. Having a bunch of kids in foreign uniforms show up at this time must have been a little suspect. Midoriya wondered just who they were going to see this time. Mr. Senki was authorized to just walk past the main gate, so it stood to reason that someone important was expecting him. One of the pro-hero teachers, maybe the principal himself. I'm pretty sure I know exactly who'd be in charge of your class. We're associates of a sort. All Might's words from before came back to him, Izuku's chest tightening with excitement. Hokuto came to a halt right in front of the wide staircase leading into the main building. More specifically, he stopped before a gold-plated podium a few meters in front of the steps. An intricate statue stood on top of this, depicting a dynamic sequence of UA's most renowned alumni. Front and center, of course, were the smiling visage of All Might and fiery glare of endeavor. Boys and girls, gather up, their instructor called, standing beside the statue. Ikaruga led her hostage to the front of the group, sending him forward with a quick flick of the ear. Hokuto reached over, taping his fingers against the rectangular base of the statue. Yuzuma, thank you for volunteering. If you would please. Hey, falling boy, you're here. The class of Aozora teens turned to the voice in swift order. Osmond jumped from his spider-girl perch, hopping off of Kisuke's spike and into his master's waiting arms. Hokuto himself released a puff of air before leaning his back against the pedestal, busying himself by pampering his pooch. As soon as Izuku turned, he felt his heart leap into his throat. The girl who saved him during the entrance exam was here. Falling boy must have been a reference to himself. That meant she was talking to him. Midoriya could feel his cheeks flare up, a rush of clipped breaths spilling from his lips. His ensuing panic was prematurely cut as an invisible hand chopped the top of his head. Mineta hopped off the boy's frame just in time to avoid Hagakure's precision strike. Izuku twisting to the headless uniform in utter surprise. Don't start mumbling now, a girl wants to talk to you. Though excited, Toru spoke to her friend in a conspiring whisper. Then she turned him back to the brown-haired girl, the one who was now skipping to a stop in front of him. Hagakure nabbed Minoru and drew him back into her chest, effectively neutralizing his ability to interrupt. Ignoring his tiny classmate's steady, dog-like whine, Midoriya faced the bright smile and perma-blushed cheeks of Ochako Uraraka. The name snapped to the front of his mind. He remembered it from All Might's test result video. He should probably say something, show some enthusiasm. Uraraka, though, had energy to spare. It's great to see you here. I thought maybe you didn't make it. Izuku's nervous thoughts turned perplexed. Wait, wah. Uraraka. Once again, the Aozora students shot their sights towards the voice of a newcomer. Unlike with the girl, the tall boy in glasses marching towards them actually noticed their oddly synced, unnaturally fast movements. The full body flinch dispelled the young man's notion of lecturing his classmate, instead settling for a half-hearted, you really shouldn't run like that. Midoriya perked at the glasses-wearing teen, recognizing him as the stern speedster from the exam. He picked up the name Ida when Ochako waved off his concerns. Anyway, remember the guy who took down the zero-pointer in the entrance exam? the girl asked, gesturing at Midoriya with both hands. Ida's eyes widened at the sight of him, an expression mirrored by Toru and Minoru. Curiously, Kisuke gave the most extreme reaction as he jumped back, his jaw hanging open. Uraraka continued, I was worried when he wasn't in our class, but here he is. The perky girl turned her focus to the greenette. Are you in Class B then? I haven't talked to anyone over there. Who's your homeroom teacher? Izuku held up 2 fingers, the pointer on each hand, in an effort to get a word in. Naota scoffed off to the side and Hatsum stepped up beside Toru and Mineta, the inventor looking somewhat invested now. But Ida was the one to calm his classmate, his heavy palm falling on her shoulder. She turned to the taller boy, Tenya. Uraraka, their uniforms. The girl blinked before turning to Midoriya and the group behind him. Their tops were royal blue, trimmed in silver, the boys in black slacks whilst the girls donned dark skirts. It was a far cry from her own gray blazer and green skirt. The boy and his classmates were certainly students, just not ones from UA. Those watching could visibly observe the girl's heart twisting, a veil of sorrow slowly overtaking Achako's features. The brief oath she breathed was on the edge of being a sob. Kisuke, started Mr. Senki, capturing everyone's attention, read the inscription. He again tapped the base of the statue. The cone-haired boy gaped at his teacher for a moment, then began scratching the back of his scalp. Ah, Mr. Senki, is this really? You're here to learn something and we don't have infinite time, so let's get this underway. Hokuto turned his gaze away from his students and onto the 2 UA teens. You two, if you're not busy, fall in with the rest. Free lesson. The interruption piqued Uraraka out of her mounting guilt. Ada recovered faster and drew the girl into the blue-clad crowd, standing her right beside Izuku. Hokuto nodded. All right, let's. Deku, what the hell are you doing here? Midoriya jumped at call out. He was far from the only one with a violent reaction. The shouter was simply that loud. Osmond was whimpering. Katsuki Bakugo leaped down the last 3 steps of the front entrance, marching across the modest quad with fierce haste. Ida had started calling out a rambling reprimand towards his approaching classmate. Achako shifting her sight rapidly between the wildly gesturing boy and the impending time bomb on legs. She cast a long glance at the green-haired boy beside her. She noted the sheer anxiety playing out on Midoriya's features. But then the boy with the line of giant grapes for hair issued this tiny, nervous squeak. The floating girl's uniform holding the small teen shifted her stance, drawing the childlike figure closer to her core as she turned to a more sidelong profile. Izuku watched his new friends. He took a deep, shaky breath, holding it in with eyes slid shut. They opened with measured speed as the greenette emptied his lungs. Izuku stared Bakugo down, his air neutral but resolute. That just pissed the explosive teen off even more, only just holding back from breaking into a charge as he passed the gold statue. Mr. Senki's palms crashed together. The sound at this range was momentarily deafening, stunning the assembled youths but especially the passing Bakugo. As the volatile boy made to shout down this newest interruption, he met eyes with the instructor from Aozora. A scarlet fog settled over the man's shoulders. It appeared and vanished with such haste that those who saw were openly questioning it. At least they would have if not for the choking pressure rolling off of Hokuto. A lot of the gathered students had stepped back at the sudden surge of terror they felt towards the man. Bakugo did not move. Bakugo could not move. The force holding him in place was not unlike that of standing before a large predator. Hokuto's now vertically slit pupils added onto that, his topaz orbs radiating a hot glow. Be quiet, Mr. Senki growled, his arm extended, pointing towards a slightly trembling Kisuke. Stand over there and pay attention. To the shock of those who knew him, Katsuki complied. It took a moment, but the explosive blonde made his way into the throng of outside students. Hokuto lowered his arm. The suffocating atmosphere receded in tandem, all present taking a collective breath. When the teacher next spoke, his words were calm. Yuzuma, if you would. The boy was still waving off his nervousness, and the mock salute he sent in reply was a bit too fast and jerky. Why yeah, Kisuke leaned forward, scanning the blurb of inscribed text. An institution of origins. Every great story has a beginning. What do you think of that? The sudden question after his reading jolted Kisuke. What? That declaration you just read? Hokuto once again tapped the pedestal, his white pup now eyeing the statue of UA graduates. How does that make you feel? A dumbfounded silence permeated the group, Kisuke most of all since he was the one being asked. After a brief period of consulting his thoughts, the redhead decided to just say it straight. It's UA, so I guess it's accurate. I mean, they're the best school in the country, so why wouldn't they boast? Katsuki grunted at the same time that Naoto loosed a long, whispering tisk. Both sounded rather dismissive though they were aimed at different targets. Mr. Senki picked up the conversation quickly. So you think they're being boastful? Arrogant, maybe. The bullet-haired teen actually raised his hands in jittery surrender. It may have had something to do with the scandalized spectacle playing across Ida's face, The boy looked very much like he was ready to read someone the riot act. Ikaruga stepped forward. Midoriya blinked when he realized the girl was Sans phone. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's arrogant. No more so than hero society in general. And you can't say that UA hasn't earned the right to brag. Yeah, the right to toss people out too. Though he'd spoken quietly, Mineta's offhand comment drew several eyes. The boy's face went flush as he made a valiant attempt to hide his embarrassment in Hagakura's bust. Toru tightened her abnormally strong grasp, her hoisted classmate turning red to blue in short order. Slanderous, the bespectacled Tenya burst, no longer able to contain himself. Such scathing remarks against this institution is a step too far. Uraraka was doing her best to halt the incoming rant, Ida utterly ignoring the almost violent way she was shaking his arm. When Hokuto stepped forward with a hand raised, that seemed to diffuse things. The notion of speaking out directly to an authority figure appeared to give the tall boy pause. With Ida sufficiently pacified, Mr. Senki turned to a gasping Minoru, Hagakure having loosened her hold. Mineta, the teacher began in a soft voice, let's talk about your frustration. You originally applied for this school, right? The miniature teen's face was truly running the width of the spectrum, his features going deathly pale. Toru clenched his form more tightly, this time in a show of reassurance. Uraraka's stare cut across Midoriya and onto the grape-head and invisible girl, her expression darkly pensive. Izuku levied narrowed eyes at their instructor. Not just him, the hero hopeful stated. Dakugo watched his childhood friend, unable to decide whether he should laugh at how pathetic he was or rage at his silent determination. The indecision was infuriating. Hokuto settled stoic eyes on his green-haired student. No, he agreed, his gaze sliding to the boy's left. Onto his pair of friends, I suppose you three aren't. The trio in question were perplexed as Mr. Senki's stare continued to the left of Hagakure and Mineta. Osmond took his chance and launched from his human throne. The pup landed amongst the numerous figures depicted in the statue, his every effort relegated to scaling up Endeavor's front. A passing UA student with hair parted red on the left and white on the right stopped to observe. Tenya was visibly quaking. At the same time, Hatsune came forward, hands on her hips and chest thrust out. She also had her goggles down over her eyes. Taking a deep breath before she spoke, I took the support course exam for UA. It's not quite as big a deal as the hero class, but it's up there with the top programs in the country. More so, UA's just plain out a big name. Being a graduate here in any capacity is enough to garner attention. I wanted to make real good use of that when companies started scouting. Their teacher hummed at the inventor's returning enthusiasm, a smile on his lips. Heard from Tomo you brought the test dummy to life. May waved off the disclosure, her grin oddly pleased. Nothing that sophisticated. It was just wearing an armor suit. I didn't install an AI into the mannequin or anything. That said, the defense parameters of the exoskeleton may have gone into overdrive when they asked Cementos to test the suit. Fairly certain he's out of the hospital by now. He teaches here, right? Have you guys seen him around? Both Tenya and Ochako seemed put out by May's rambling as well as being put on the spot. Uraraka choked out a short, yeah, he's around. The pink-haired inventor grinned, giving a thumbs up with one hand and a peace sign with the other. Without changing her stance, she turned back to Mr. Senki. See, no harm, no foul. But, apparently, collateral is a factor in the exam, and between sending a teacher to the emergency room and collapsing the west annex of the school, I apparently set a new record. Everyone was regarding Hatsune with a fair degree of awe, the spectrum of specific feelings ranging from horrified to begrudging respect. Ada was by far the most extreme display, his glasses shining with reflected light and his slackened jaw open to a cartoonish extent, a frosty haze billowing from his gaping maw. Are you, Mr. Senki began, his tone shooting up an octave after the pause, proud of that? Osmond, having conquered Mount Endeavor, rested happily atop the flame hero's shoulders. Then the puppy began glancing at the other figures in the sculpture, pondering his next destination. The half-red, half-white-haired boy, though having filed in with the assembled group, kept an eye on the dog's next move. May shrugged. If you spin it well, bad publicity can be good publicity. Hokuto nodded, not content to allow either the students or himself a chance to respond. Do you have any hard feelings towards this school? Hatsune opened her mouth. She left it like that, not a sound escaping her. The girl had paused mid-thought, best as those watching could say, her frozen state persisting for a bit. Nah, Mr. Senki turned sharply to Kisuk. The cone-haired teen wore a quiet grin. I did what I could, it wasn't enough. Now I can work on being better. Hokuto quirked a brow, speaking after a short pause. You know, I actually forgot that you were also a UA hopeful. Yuzuma slapped a palm over his heart, feigning grievous injury. You cut me, you're cutting me real deep there, boss. Bakugo rolled his eyes at the display. A UA student with similarly spiky hair, though a shade of red that matched Kisuk's own, placed a hand on the blue-clad boy's left shoulder. Hokuto perked at the sight, just realizing that his audience had grown some. Nearby, an unshaven man with a scraggly dark mane, dressed mostly in black, watched the proceedings with tired scrutiny. Higher on UAS main building, sitting on the sill of his office window with a cup of tea in hand, the school's non-human principal observed from afar, easily able to hear from this distance. Osmond had abandoned Mount Endeavor and now sat nestled atop All Might's head, perched between his antennae like hair fronds. Naota, who had been staring at Kisuk for a while now, cocked a smile and gave a little hum of approval. "I think I might actually respect you now, just a bit." As P said, the silver-haired boy turned back to his teacher, clearly done with pleasantries. "What the hell is this?" Hugo had reached the end of his limited tolerance. "Are you rejects and second-rates here to throw some pity party because you couldn't hack it with the best of the best?" Between his classmates' outburst, the puppy defacing school property, and the general subject matter of the discussion, Ada looked ready to combust. Somewhat of a surprise was Naota, who had pulled his hands out of his pockets, the barest trace of aggression in his stance. Hokuto interjected calmly, "The lesson, I suppose, isn't too obvious, so how about this?" Midoriya, the hero hopeful, tightened his features, still rather miffed by the man calling out Minoru. Mr. Senki went on, "Would you help a UA student?" The question was an odd one, enough that Izuku could offer only a puzzled look in return. The remainder of the crowd stayed silent. Their instructor scratched his head. Above, Osmond supplied the canine equivalent of a sigh, prompting his master, yeah, still too broad a question. "All right, let's say you all make it to being pros and you end up called to the same conflict. Would you help the UA graduates?" More teens in gray blazers had arrived. A very mature girl stood beside half-red, half-white, her dark mane drawn into an explosive high ponytail. Another girl with pink skin, hair, and little yellow horns draped herself over the spiky-haired redhead, accompanied by a blonde with shoulder-length locks, a black lightning bolt marking both sides of his mane. One final addition was the young lady with the blank expression and that veritable river of forest green hair, the thigh-length end tied into a large bow. Midoriya's expression snapped into focus, an almost insulted look painting his features. "Of course I would." "Why?" Izuku stopped, honestly a little shaken by his instructor's question. "Wall" was all he could manage before Mr. Senki went again. "The pro track lives and dies on competition. Your popularity is a huge factor in the opportunities you're presented. Showing up your contemporaries is obvious enough, but it's not unheard of for people to allow their coworkers to make mistakes." This was probably the fastest way to flare some genuine anger in Izuku. But he wasn't the one already boiling over, aching for an outlet. Ada actually stomped forward a single step, the back of his calf bursting with a swift jet of heat which shredded his pants. "Disgraceful," thundered from the bespectacled teen. "The very notion that our illustrious protectors could be so consumed with pain." "It's far from unheard of," interjected Naota, his tone blasé. "If you bother to pay any kind of attention, those attitudes are pretty blatant. Watch any hero footage from the last year. I'll bet at least half the time you'll find something suspect." The boy with the half and half hair who'd been so drawn in by Osmond's excursion now seemed to be studying the floor. His voice came out low and gravely, more commenting to himself than addressing the group. "I could believe that. Heroes are just people at the end of the day. And people have faults, some more than others." Close by, the dark-haired girl with the high ponytail gave the boy a worried look. "Todoroki," she said, barely more than a whisper. Ikaruga had her phone in hand once more, though she was casually scrolling rather than mashing the touchscreen. "Pros are civil servants," she stated, "but they're also celebrities. You can't expect people in the business of fame not to do what they can to gain more." Todoroki's vision snapped to the spider girl, his stoic demeanor attaining a dark chill. "So that's their excuse for walking over others. Because it's part of the business. You just accept that." The dark-haired girl looked as nonchalant as ever, not looking up from her scrolling. "Don't get personal. I never said I agree with these things. I'm just saying how it is." She took a breath, lowering her phone and turning to the irate Todoroki. "People have gotten used to symbols. Their presence is the surest form of security. They need their pillars to be flawless, so much so they'll blind themselves to controversy." Osmond whimpered. Hokuto stepped off the pedestal, moving to stand in front of the statue, the shining likeness of All Might towering above him. "What I say next," the teacher intoned, "is for all of you, though you UA kids will probably have it tougher. The public is gonna hold you to the highest standards. If you're competent, flashy, and have some personality, you'll get nothing but praise. Until you fuck up." Izuku thought he saw Mr. Senki flinch as he said that last bit. There was a small pause, but the man continued. "If you're not in the spotlight, you'll have some support. But most people will look at you like some layabout, only useful when there's some immediate danger. If you're a serious pro hero, why have I never heard of you, they'll say." Shouta Aizawa, teacher for Class 1A, grumbled at Hokuto's assessment. While he tried not to concern himself with the system, he'd lived the accuracy of the man's words. There's problems on both ends. But there's one common theme across the entire profession. You're a problem solver. When you're on the scene, People expect you to be the solution. They stand back and know you have things under control. If you're really up in the rankings, even the parties meant to back you up, law enforcement and other heroes, will step back and leave it to you. Hokuto pivoted, raising an arm to slap his hand on the calf of All Might's statue. Just look at the man himself, our resident symbol of peace. Can you even fathom a scenario where All Might needs help? The crowd of students could only stare. Heroes are meant to be saviors. Rarely do they get saviors of their own. I'd help. Mr. Senki was oddly quick in staring Izuku down again. But then, Midoriya was oddly quick to interrupt the man. Help what? You asked if I'd help any of these UA guys once we graduated and got into the field. This is my answer. The instructor crossed his arms. Even if they don't want your help. If they need it, then they're getting it. Something there hit Bakugo the wrong way. His normally bubbling rage turned to outright loathing as he glared towards his childhood friend. Only Kirishima's solid palm upon his shoulder kept the blonde in check, the redhead quite concerned over his classmates' change in mood. You'd be derided for it. People would call you a glory hog, say that you're stepping in where you're not needed. Midoriya then did something that left the few who knew him instantly stunned. Midoriya snorted. With all due respect to others, sir, I thought meddling where you shouldn't was a big part of being a hero. There was a long beat of silence as the gathered digested that last statement. Mr. Senki couldn't even begin to hold back his grin as it gradually spread across his face. Osmond was panting, his tail wagging rapidly. Uraraka was speechless, seeing this boy, the guy who saved her during the exam, standing so strong and resolute. How do you make the corny stuff you say sound cool? Hagakure glanced down at Mineta, his comment drawing several eyes. The boy hardly noticed the attention. He even seemed to have forgotten how thoroughly smooshed his head was against her bust. Minoru just stared at Izuku, his expression utterly befuddled. Several things happened all at once. Hisuke started applauding, fast and loud right out the gate. Kirishima, Achako, and the pink girl readily joined in. Midoriya, realizing he was the center of attention after Mineta's statement, went red as a tomato. The overt applause had him attempting to hide his face in his hands, which only encouraged his audience to clap harder. Toru contributed with a whistle, her arms still occupied. Mineta happily clapped enough for the both of them after realizing the opportunity to mess with his new friend. Osmond's super bark shattered the air, only Hokuto immune to its effects. The red-clad teacher continued a soft round of clapping, showing some actual teeth in his smile. Not gonna say that's the right answer. He rolled his eyes in an exaggerated fashion, but I do appreciate your attitude. At this point, the girl with the long green hair and the large eyes stepped forward. Are you sure you should be encouraging that kind of thinking? Especially with a bunch of teenagers. Hokuto stared back at the blank-faced girl in bemusement. He hadn't expected such a sharp remark from her. Before Mr. Senki, or Naota, who seemed almost resigned to speak up on this, could respond, a new actor took center stage. Shouta Aizawa clutched Hokuto's shoulder, pulling past the man as he regarded Isui with an equally stoic expression. It's a little advanced for first years, but I suppose it's a lesson you'll have to learn eventually. The scraggly man made a show of rolling his neck, groaning as though readying for some arduous task. Hokuto gave a short huff of laughter, head down and shaking slowly as Osmond descended onto his owner's skull. The short lesson is this: your decisions have weight. There are going to be times where you feel something must be done and people will tell you it's not your place. There are going to be times where certain things are demanded of you that you feel are pointless or even harmful. Aizawa paused as he finished fishing out his eye drops, tilting his head back as he administered them. Blinking rapidly, he concluded, your careers, for those of you who get that far, are going to be full of choices like these. The most important thing is that you own the outcomes, good or bad. That's the standard you'll be held to. Suyu blinked. Only once. Then she stepped back into the throng of students, seemingly satisfied. A chorus of murmurs rose amongst the teens following Aizawa's instruction. Hokuto stepped off his rest and approached his fellow teacher. Throwing an arm over the man's shoulder, Hokuto chided, always the life of the party, eraser. Aizawa shrugged the younger man off in a hurry. Not before Osmond managed to transfer mounts, hopping onto the UA teacher's scalp. Shouter returned a long sigh as Hokuto eyed the two with a winning grin, his pup spinning in circles on top of Aizawa's head. Support each other. The gathered turned to Mr. Senki as he let that linger. The man continued, we've been talking all this time now about how stressful and trying this job will be. It doesn't matter where you graduate, where you're stationed, or what kind of hero you want to be. There are pressures at every level of this career. The essence of being a hero is helping people, help each other. I know that sounds obvious, but there's more division in our ranks than you think. As the next generation, try to keep these thoughts in the front of your mind. Unity is one of our greatest strengths. Ada's mounting frustration over the course of the discussion had evaporated. The young speedster now looked quite pensive, his chin cupped within his hand. Uraraka swapped her sights between her homeroom teacher and the outside instructor. She had never assumed an overly ideal perspective on being a hero. But hearing Mr. Aizawa and someone she figured was another pro speak so frankly at the harsher side of the profession, Todoroki had turned away from everyone, his features schooled into a nearly blank expression. His eyes held a silent intensity as they focused on the nearby statue, mostly on the blazing visage of the flame hero. His old acquaintance, Yaoyorozu, watched him carefully, still unsure how to approach him. Katsuki was mad. Katsuki was not afraid to voice it. What is this garbage? Either you're strong enough to hold your own or you're too weak to fight your own battles. If you're useless by yourself, then you're not a pro, simple as that. The explosive teen's receding volume faded nicely into the pause that followed. Any swift replies were tempered by the calm resolve shown by Bakugo at the end. Most of the students looked oddly contemplative. Can't say I disagree. Naoto spoke, maintaining his habit of sudden interjections. Hands in his pockets, the silver-haired youth glanced up and to the side. But there's something. Naoto's comment fell off with a mockingly musical drone, the barest speck of emotion in his stoic inflection. A visible tick mark popped on Katsuki's brow and Aizawa looked ready to intervene. More, Mr. Senki supplied, diverting the attention back onto him. That's what you were implying, right, Mr. Kimi? The teacher didn't wait for a reply to such an obvious question. Naoto wouldn't dignify him with one anyway. Pinching his single strand of blonde hair, Hokuto ran his digits down its length, smoothing it out to a point. His eyes met Bakugo's. You're young. You're allowed to feel like you're on top of the world. He thumbed between Aizawa and himself, are gonna take whatever time we can to hammer into you lot all the knowledge and experience we can. As far as your temperament, that's something you only learn with time. And I can't promises those lessons will be kind. A little chiptune jingled out. Midoriya, Hagakure, Mineta, and Kisuke instantly locked their sights on Nikaruga. The established gamer turned to meet them head-on, the unspoken readily apparent in her expression. She turned her phone screen towards her classmates, the dense wording of a news article glaring back at them. Mr. Senki drew his own cell, giving the screen a quick swipe to dismiss the alarm. All right, class, that's more than enough time at this stop. Sadly, I can't keep you forever, so we have to be moving on. A collection of nods answered their teacher's declaration. The throng of students parted as the man walked through their ranks. Strangely, Aizawa followed less than a step behind him. What's this? Hokuto grinned at the development, an escort by a veteran hero. How flattering. The UA teacher groaned internally, fixing Hokuto with a flat stare. I happen to be on my way home. Ensuring that one of my problem peers makes his way off school grounds is just a happy coincidence. Hokuto pressed a finger to the tip of his nose as he stuck out his tongue. In defense of his latest mount, Osmond pawed down the bottom of his right, black-patched eyelid before returning the tongue display. His rapidly wagging tail slapped the back of Aizawa's head without mercy. Come on, Midoriya, Mineta called, pausing Hagakure mid-stride. The green-haired boy had his gaze held upon the mural of graduates. His eyes were intensely focused on the shining frame of All Might. The boy didn't move for a good while, prompting Toru to take a step in his direction. Izuku tore himself away, turning on a dime with a contented smile in place. With an encouraging, let's go, the hero hopeful stepped past his new friends. Hagakure watched him with a steady gaze, Mineta comically miffed from all the jostling around. The Aozora students were not the only ones concerned with Midoriya. Ochako stood with her arm outstretched, missing Izuku's shoulder as the boy spun to follow his class. He didn't even seem to notice her as he passed. She pulled her clenched fist back to her chest as the greenette strode away, Hagakure giving the girl an unseen glance. As Ida was making to rouse his friend from her sudden melancholy, a flash of strength appeared in her eyes. Uraraka was off at a brisk pace in pursuit of the boy who had saved her, Ida stumbling into step alongside her. Toru paused a moment longer, in turn stalling Izuku and drawing perplexed looks from him and Minoru. She got the band moving just as the UA pair caught up. Hey, Deku. Midoriya flinched, though it was more subdued. Both Toru and Mineta couldn't help but compare his reaction to Bakugo's arrival. The blonde had referred to him with the same moniker. What did you call me? Uraraka looked completely gobsmacked by Izuku's response. Though he kept a small distance, Ada seemed more receptive to the nature of the boy's dilemma. Ochako clarified, Deku, it's what Bakugo called you. Your teacher said your name was Midoriya too. Izuku's features brightened just a touch, not quite meeting the girl's eyes. Midoriya explained through animated gestures. Why yeah, Midoriya is my surname but my first name is actually Izuku. Deku is something Kaken made up to make fun of me. That caught Ida's attention, the teen taking a long, audible breath that lasted several seconds. Minoru likewise showed displeasure in his painfully squinted expression. He had his own memories of bullies, even if a lot of it had been somewhat deserved. Maybe very deserved. Toru could not have been more grateful for her invisibility in that moment. The look of blank, unblinking fury she wore may have warranted several concerned calls to authority. Uraraka missed only a single beat before saying, "Oh, I'm sorry. I guess I should have figured that, but I thought it was kind of neat. Short, has a bit of punch, and I think it's sort of cute." The blush lighting up Izuku's face was outmatched only by the brilliant shine overtaking his eyes. The hero hopeful needed a second or two to recover himself before making a response. "Why, you can call me Deku." Huh. Hagakure bit down on her bottom lip to avoid laughing. Ochako may have been a little airheaded, but she definitely picked up on the implication in that last statement. The flush on her cheeks was squee-worthy. Izuku's efforts to clarify were oddly composed. He was looking at the floor and twiddling his fingers together, but he didn't stutter even once. I think I like the idea. It's not just the things you said, it's the thought of taking something painful, making it my own, I suppose. Is that weird?" Uraraka's perma blush was fading into the scarlet glow building on her cheeks. Toru could no longer contain herself and instead tilted her face down into Minetta's mane of orbs. Again, against all odds, the tiny teen brushed off having a girl literally burying her face into him. Watching Midoriya unintentionally charm this girl was just that much of a spectacle. The traveling party reached their destination faster than expected. Toru stopped as soon as her feet met the public sidewalk, by extension halting Minetta. This was in spite of the girl not watching where she was going, joining her tiny passenger in the fine art of Midoriya watching. Tenya likewise ceased forward progress, stomping to a ramrod straight halt that would make any drill instructor proud. This left Izuku and Ochako striding onwards, lost in their embarrassment and utterly unawares. The duo stepped across the sidewalk, over the curb, and into the side of the bus with a unified thunk. Hagakure and Minetta shared a snort of laughter. Ada merely shook his head as he mumbled something about the necessity of paying attention. But off to the side, looking on with absolute focus, the pink-haired, skinned girl, Mina Ishido, opened her mouth in a silent gasp. Oh yes, she would definitely commit this scene to memory. For Uraraka's sake, of course. "All right then, children," Mr. Senki announced, his voice unusually deep at first. "One more stop for this field trip. File in, get on the bus." The blue-clad teens began marching up into the coach, Hokuto standing by the open doors and tapping heads as they passed to keep count. Aizawa stood next to him, Osmond still in place atop his skull. It seemed his master's flagrant violation of human headspace was infuriating the pup, his growls growing louder. Ada reached for Izuku and Uraraka, checked to make sure they were all right, and then tapped the girl's shoulder as he walked away. Looking after him, Ochako saw a collection of her classmates, those who'd stayed for the free lesson, standing in a loose group facing the coach bus. Her mood sobered at the realization Deku and his class were leaving. Minetta, still being carried by Hagakure, bopped Midoriya on the head. After a short exchange, Izuku came to the same conclusion, turning to meet eyes with the girl he'd saved. The pair stared at each other in absolute silence, neither attempting to move. "What do I do now?" "Yo, Shouta, we got room if you and your kids want to join us." Aizawa's eyes widened, then became dull as his entire being seemed to slump in on itself. The man looked oddly resigned even as he protested. "The school day's over, what makes you think I don't have my own business to attend to?" "You're Shouta." Hokuto's eyes shifted left and right in the ensuing silence, as though expecting something. No one within earshot offered any rebuttal, though Mina and Kaminari fought to stifle their laughter. His trademark groaning sigh escaped Aizawa's lips. "You really have enough room." Hokuto perked, his features pleasantly surprised. "Yeah, sure, we don't even take up half the seating in this thing." The Aozora instructor knocked his knuckles against the coach's frame. With a quick nod, Shouta turned to his class. "Mr. Senki here is offering to take us on a short educational venture. While it's by no means mandatory, I do recommend that whoever has the time take part in this field trip. It's another important aspect of being a pro, the kind of thing a classroom doesn't properly convey." Mr. Senki's surprise faded. Seemed Shouta had figured out he last stop of the day. No wonder it took so little to convince him. "Splendid. I approve of this." Aizawa's dour resignation, if possible, worsened at the sudden exclamation. Hokuto shifted sight quickly in the direction of the speaker. He caught the entire row of UA students mid-jump, each adorned with various levels of shock, fear, and confusion at the small, mammalian creature standing right in front of them. How he'd gotten into the teens' line of sight without their notice was just another oddity of UA's principle. Nedzu marched ahead with his arm raised high, looking every bit the part of the enthused mascot. The tailored suit added to the image, his pants and vest comprised of fine, dark fabrics, accented by the pale sleeves of his undershirt and his own white pelt. Nedzu's pitch eyes shined like gems, the straight scar through his right orb doing little to diminish the effect. As an added incentive, the rodent, dog, bear continued, "I shall also partake in the venture." Now Shouta turned to the side of the bus and rammed his forehead into it with a solid thunk. Hokuto held back any amusing comments, less an attempt to spare his fellow teacher and more trying not to acquire Nedzu's attention. He did note that all of the UA students had shifted from surprised at their principal's presence to somewhat wary. Mr. Senki mused on how obvious they were as first years. Seasoned students would know to be scared of Nedzu. Tashinori, you come along as well, Nedzu called as he reached the top of the coach's steps. The skeletal figure with a wild mane of blonde hair was startled at the call-out. His form went more rigid still when all assembled turned their gaze in his direction. Todoroki actually cocked his head to the side as he wondered why this malnourished man was wearing a suit over 3 times his size. Get out of the way, extra. Tashinori had no time to collect himself when Bakugo, who had lagged behind the rest of the group, shouldered past him. Despite looking like a kid wearing his father's work clothes, the living skeleton regained his balance quickly. Ada launched into his usual spiel about respecting one's elders, though this time Kirishima punctuated his efforts, reaching out to reprimand his newfound bro for crossing lines. Bakugo shrugged off his friend's grasp. Tenya's ranting tuned out in its entirety, though the former seemed to have some effect on the hothead. As the explosive blonde made to walk around the front of the bus, an oppressive force worked him to a reluctant halt. With a good degree of ire in his gaze, Katsuki turned to the offending parties. Aizawa fixed his student with his flattest glare, betrayed only by the slight, scarlet glow overtaking his eyes. In addition, Nedzu was leaning out from the door, his doll-like expression locked on the walking bomb. With a tired growl, Bakugo adjusted course and marched himself onto the bus. He did particularly well in not exploding the principal as the mouse, dog, bear ruffled his hair as the boy passed by. Mr. Senki tallied that as a win in Nedzu's column. Even he wasn't bold enough to mess with that volatile little shit. Seeing as his friend-turned-tormentor was officially joining their trip, Midoriya couldn't help his apprehension. The majority of the UA students had already climbed aboard by the time he was snapped back to reality. Hey, Deku. Izuku spun around on Uraraka. The sight of her rekindled that awkward air from earlier, his face painted with a luminescent blush. This, in turn, reddened her features. Seeking aid, Midoriya turned to his nearby classmates. Mineta may have had something to say, but the translucent palm slapped over his mouth denied him the chance. Hagakure, still lugging the boy like a carnival prize, was walking to the front door of the bus. Her back was turned on the awkward duo, her steps deliberately small, her pace minuscule. She started whistling out the theme tune to some Sentai show. Decidedly on his own, Izuku returned to Ochako. Yeah, hi. The girl bit off a snort, her face flaring red for an instant. Putting on her biggest smile, she asked, mind if I sit with you? Still taking those tiny steps which basically carried her nowhere. Toru unleashed what would have been a dazzling grin at the promises of this exchange. The crushing grip resulting from the girl's inner squeeing would probably leave Mineta with a lot of bruises come evening. But, being pressed so deeply against the female form, who was he to complain? Okay again. A lot to go over here. There are now a lot of characters I'm juggling for the moment. Let's give some tiny spotlights to our 1A guests from least important upwards. Kaminari gets a mention. Just sort of ended up folding him into the Baka squad. He's associated enough with them in canon that it's feasible. Even more so since Mineta isn't around. Denki's better character traits are probably shining through more. Mina retains her enthusiasm for romance and her general surplus of energy. Kirishima is already acting as Katsuki's handler. I imagine without Izuku to set the blonde off quite so sharply, this is the first time the hardening hero has seen his new bro quite so aggravated. Sue's little commentary is obviously drawn from her perspective during the Bakugo rescue arc. Personal story time. Before I had seen this part of the story in the anime, manga, I had watched Captain America, Civil War. Sharon Carter's speech at Peggy's funeral immediately came to mind as a counterpoint to Asui's thoughts on heroes going outside the law. Aizawa pretty much paraphrases the movie's words in response to Tsu calling Hokuto out on dangerous teaching. Not that I'm unsympathetic or ignorant to the points Tsuyu makes in her dialogue. I just personally fall more on the Sharon side of the argument. Speaking of Aizawa, I felt he was the best one to convey the whole sometimes doing the right thing isn't doing the right thing mentality. As an underground hero, he naturally operates more in shades of gray than a Spotlight pro would, so he has a firmer grasp on unscrupulous heroics. He is a huge part of the Vigilantes prequel. After all, Aizawa also just has a more grounded, even cynical, view on the pro industry in general and is tired. Done with this nature is something I love working with. Nedzu remains a barely entertained dragon, constantly seeking stimulus. Those around him know to walk on eggshells, lest they truly arouse his irritation. Or worse, his interest. I wasn't going to include Tashinori at all originally, but as I thought more about the class next in Final Destination, I realized it would be a golden chance to utilize him and further explore his relationship with Midori. You'll see it next chapter. I've often seen Todoroki and Yaoyorozu paired not just as a couple but as characters who have some sort of backstory together. I'm fairly sure that's not entirely lore accurate, though I don't think there's any point that outright contests the possibility. But it's something so prevalent in the fandom that I just went, why not? Giving characters potential history with each other is always a nice tool to have in the back pocket. Not sure if I'll actually pair them or not, but it's largely irrelevant to the story. The main takeaway with them is that Shoto is still angsty and Momo is worried, doesn't know how to proceed. Ada has a time this chapter. Obviously, the major theme Mr. Senki hopes to get across with this visit to their sister school is the hardship and less glamorous side of hero society. Ada, being as morally rigid as he is and coming from a long line of well-known pros, takes clear offense to the subject matter being discussed, having him teetering on the edge of mental, emotional collapse throughout the chapter as a small exercise in sadism on my end. I more than enjoyed it. Achako. Well, as I said back at the start, my taste in pairings are quite vanilla. I'd have to say my favorite part of this entry was actually her introduction. The joy and relief she feels in seeing her one-time hero make into UA despite Mike's somewhat ominous words. Swiftly tanked when Ida makes an observation about Izuku's uniform that Uraraka should have noted from the start if not for being so excited to see him. Her sad bit at the end of that sequence gave me a second of pause when writing. Hey, look, Bakugo returns. Yeah, that's really all I have to say. The boy does kind of speak for himself whenever the focus draws onto him. He's still torn on his feelings towards Midoriya. The nerd is still below him as far as Katsuki is concerned, but that stubborn refusal to just stay down. Before I forget her, Mei. So we get a short tale of her rejection from UA. Mei being Mei, she takes it in stride, even if the collateral was somewhat extreme. I mean, Cementos did survive the incident. I feel like I really lost her in the shuffle towards the end of the chapter though. She basically just disappears. Part of the joy of working with so many personalities, and she'd pretty much served her purpose in the narrative midway through the entry. On the side of our OCs, Kisuke's origins are revealed. He is actually based on the applicant with the conical spine of hair amongst those deriding Midoriya as a lost cause at the start of the entrance exam in the anime. We never get to see the guy's quirk, but since I wanted someone with Bari's power set, things just seem to mesh well. Naota gets some personality here. Again, he's somewhere between Todoroki and Bakugo in terms of temperament. He's stoic and cold, but he snipes back with these little spikes of attitude and insight when the moment suits him. I'm eager to flesh him out more in the future. But wow, that's an entire additional page plus of author's commentary. Well, the more I write, the more I have to talk about. Thank you for entertaining my errant thoughts. All of you who bothered to peruse through this mess of italics. Coming up, Final Destination. No weapon drops, no smash ball, Mario only. Chapter 8, Final Destination. Chapter text. This will be the last big expository chapter for now. After this we start building up the actual conflict of this story. As Hokuto predicted, the coach had more than enough seats to accommodate everyone. Iezora instructor busied himself this time spectating the exchange between Osmond and Nedzu, whilst his pup continued acting like a puppy. The UA principal conducted himself as though in the midst of a stimulating conversation, being able to follow about a third of their dialogue. Hokuto knew they were jumping around some mostly stupid topics, but it beat trying to antagonize the driver again, who'd taken to keeping one hand on a holstered police baton on his left thigh. Man took his cookies seriously. At least Aizawa, through no desire of his own, served as a ready source of entertainment. Though Osmond had reclaimed his rightful place atop the peak of Mount Senki, Nedzu had swiftly taken the abandoned throne of Shouta's scalp as his own. The stubbly-faced teacher looked truly defeated. The bus driver was almost tempted to offer the man a cookie. Toshinori sat in the same seat as Mr. Senki, looking about as nervous as a spooky, scary skeleton man on a bus full of heroes in training probably should have. He had sent as discreet a nod in Midoriya's direction as he could before sitting down. Of course Hagakure had noticed, just as she had seen Izuku's not-so-subtle return nod. But she could save her questions for later. Midoriya watched as his current teacher started a light-hearted exchange with his incognito mentor. It seemed like he was trying to soothe the older man's nerves, the two talking in subdued tones. This only furthered his thought that Mr. Senki was the associate All Might had mentioned a while back. Not that he had much time at the moment to really think about such things. Uraraka did, in fact, get to sit next to Izuku. That alone was pretty distracting. But when Hatsune insisted on continuing their heated discussion from the previous bus trip, she did so by jumping the seat in front of Midoriya and landing square between his legs. When the girl crouched down and basically presented her cleavage to the boy above, Achako's face went scarlet. She solemnly swore she was not staring. The fact that her normally nervous seatmate seemed so accustomed to this position was starting to upset her. Ikaruga again took up her post above the bus central aisle, albeit this time the spider girl was sitting cross-legged, her rump against the ceiling with her arachnid limbs holding her in place. She was, as expected, tapping furiously at her phone's touchscreen. Yet she was far from alone in her current activities. Standing just beneath her, partially in the aisle and leaning up against the tall back of his seat, was a comically focused Kisuke. The spike-haired teen had adopted the textbook, cartoonish pose of concentration. his eyelids closed to tiny slits, his pupils trembling with strained focus, and his tongue poking out from the corner of his mouth. I predict your upcoming demise in 3, 2, 1. In line with Ikaruga's countdown, Kisuke's avatar became a spray of ash as the veteran player nailed him with some sort of laser weapon as he rounded a corner. He could only groan in frustration, squaring his shoulders and resuming his concentration as his character swiftly respawned. The spider girl allowed a brief smile. She allowed several more as her killing spree persisted, numerous cries of anger and hopeless whines sounding out from all over the bus. Hagakure shook her head, uncaring of others' inability to perceive the action. Mineta, taking up the seat beside her, was leaking as much fluid from his forehead as he was from his eyes. To his credit, he played on regardless, knowing full well by now just how supremely outclassed he was. The invisible girl was just bewildered by the whole scenario. She could understand the UA students, but her fellow classmates should have known better than to challenge Ikaruga in competitive gaming. From a few rows ahead, Toru listened as Midoriya's blonde friend, she'd recognized that yacht from a city block away, damn near snapped his mobile in half, stopped only by the muscular redhead in the seat next to him. She mused that there were some upsides to their virtual skirmish. With most of the transport's occupants otherwise occupied, the majority failed to notice when the lighting outside dimmed considerably. Midoriya perked at the shift, seeing the space they were traveling through to have shifted to a wide tunnel of sorts. Amber light overtook the covered parkway and traffic ahead seemed to have ground to a snail's pace. Then the bus driver, force of forward momentum that he was, started bullying his way towards the side of the road. His chosen strategy was marvelous in its simplicity, merely plowing the vehicle's considerable bulk across the lanes, offering other motorists a telegraphed route to avoid but zero compromise in his own capacity to yield. Those who dared to challenge his authority were summarily barraged by vitriolic shouting and rapid blasting of the bus horn to drive his opponents into submission. The entire display had Toshinori on edge. Hokuto perched himself right by the busmaster's seat, adding his own encouragement to the driver's endeavors. With a short click, the stout man presented a steel baton in the teacher's direction, not having to look as he warned Mr. Senki off of his now guarded cookie stash. Hokuto had the grace to appear dejected, Osmond rotating on his scalp in order to bat his master's face with his wagging tail. As in their previous bus ride, Naoto was out of his seat and headed down the aisle before the bus had even come to a stop. The inverted Ikaruga, still engrossed in her game, leaned back until she was essentially laying across the top of the bus. Still, Naoto had to duck down to avoid getting a face full of her violet locks. But unlike before, plenty of people began to sober up as the vehicle pulled into a parking lane. The gaming session was almost unanimously brought to a close as those involved pocketed their phones and started to collect themselves. Ikaruga, of course, committed herself until the end of the round. Kisuke likewise kept playing, though he cast some curious scans of his fellow teens rousing all around him. Ida was on his feet and down the aisle in record time, filing in second behind Naoto. Ochako made to question him as he passed, but the stern student kept his eyes forward, his already militant form somehow more rigid, a touch of haste in his steps. Her arm fell limp as the boy swept by. At the same time, Izuku roused Mei out of his space, leading her to the aisle and beginning to stand himself. The gadget girl was sniping her laptop's keys at a fast pace, Midoriya turning to offer his hand to a somewhat dazed Uraraka. Her still raised arm made for a swift response. I've seen Ida get caught up in his own momentum, the brunette softly spoke, but this is. Looking Izuku in the eyes, Ochako froze at the rather dour atmosphere that seemed to have manifested. The boy was staring down, his eyes half open and his features slack. His tone came more subdued than hers. He probably knows where we're going. Hatsune pecked one last key with pronounced energy. There was a short pause as the computer's screen loaded, and then the inventor's eyes widened as another student shouldered past her towards the exit. Mei's dense locks swung about with force as she twisted to stare out the side of the bus. What do you? Uraraka was cut off as the transport jolted to a halt. Mei marched down the aisle as Izuku pulled Ochako to her feet. Minoru leapt onto his familiar perch on Midoriya's back as Hagakure stood by at the rear of the formation. Outside the windows was a busy sidewalk, dozens of commuters striding to and fro across the concrete. Many were hailing cabs and pulling outside of public buses, waiting for their turn to board. Many more were flooding in and out of a wide row of glass, automated doors set into the wall of the tunnel. The border of the wide entrance was done up in polished marble, 4 rounded, Grecian-style pillars intersecting each set of doors. The space beyond was brightly lit, white tile flooring stretching out from the entry. Above the doors, written in lustrous gold, was a name and a message. The Shepherd's Station, a place of passing, a rest for heroes. They made their way swiftly through the interior. Aizawa took the lead, his stylish Nedzu hat gaining him a wealth of attention. The UA instructor paid the pointed looks of the masses no heed, marching over pale tiles with fast footfalls. The enormous hall they traversed was a kind of terminal hub, Numerous off-shooting stairs and corridors leading to various connecting rail lines and to street level where several bus routes intersected. Many small shops and eateries sat between the adjacent corridors, a splattering of freestanding chairs and tables positioned in front of the stalls. Most curious of all was the lighting. The Romanesque decor remained present in the towering pillars that held up the room's center and ran in several spaces along the walls, their height done up in the same marble white as the floor. But the air was veiled in gold, brilliant streams of suncus light streaming in from a source on high. Long slots lined the point where the straight walls met the curved ceiling of the terminal, allowing beams of saffron to fill the space. The likeness to natural daylight was stunning, perhaps a bit overdone, if one were being honest. Aizawa cut through the bewildered, staring crowds like a plow through snow. Hokuto and Osmond followed close behind, benefiting from their peers' utter lack of social nicety. The four moved to the right wall of the hall, striding up a staircase with rails topped in polished bronze. The black-clad hero took the steps 3 at a time, practically stomping in his ascent. Hokuto mirrored his pace by skipping up the stairs with the poise of a gazelle and the countenance of a preschooler. The Aozora students closest behind him looked anywhere but at their teacher, doing their best to socially distance themselves. Osmond yipped and bounced in place on his master's head. Izuku's group, plus Ochako, minded themselves towards the rear of the progression. As they mounted the stairs, they came out on a second-level platform that stretched the length of the grand hall. This higher floor comprised of 2 walkways on opposing walls, a view of the first floor resting in the center. Hagakure ran her palm along the lustrous railing, glancing down at the tide of commuters shifting about below. Toshinori stayed close behind the Greenette and his friends. When he could, the hero incognito would toss encouraging glances and grins towards his protege. He really couldn't afford to show outright favoritism. With them going to different schools, it would raise too many questions. Such things were the least of Midoriya's concerns right now, though. He couldn't help but stare at Ochako, who in turn kept her gaze on Ida marching a ways ahead of them. Naoto was mostly keeping pace with the straight-laced boy, Bakugo outpacing them only by the merit of his annoyance with crowds and wanting to get to their destination as quickly as possible. The brown-haired girl turned towards Izuku, sparking an abrupt shock across his features. Her expression stayed concerned, putting aside how funny she found the boy's reaction. "When are you going to tell me where it is we're going?" "You know, right." Midoriya sucked his lips in, looking off to the side a bit. Without making eye contact, he declared, "Just wait, you'll see in a minute." Uraraka was frankly perplexed by the answer. Why couldn't he just say it? What about this place was getting everyone so down? Hero he was. Toshinori came to the rescue. This is kind of Hokuto's style, these sort of presentations. It's more potent if you can experience it without filters. The girl only seemed to get more confused but was mostly accepting of the adult's words. It wasn't like she had no experience with a teacher giving abstract lessons. The wall running to the right of the second-story walkway opened to a wide gap with a steep staircase rising upwards. Aizawa started up with his hands in his pockets, ignoring both the railings on the sides and the one going up the center. The scalp-bound Nedzu made a comment or two, prompting his underling to further dig his palms into his pants to avoid whapping the mouse, dog, bear on the nose. The slits of golden, fabricated sunlight continued to run along the corners of the slanted ceiling, at least for the lower half of the staircase. Cresting over the top of the ascension, the advancing students and teachers could see the natural glow of day. Hints of blue sky peeking down from a towering wall of glass panes. Aizawa staggered. The slip-up was split-second, hardly noticeable. Nedzu lowered a paw to his coworker's shoulder, patting it softly. Mr. Senki approached from behind and swung an elbow into Shouta's arm. Not a word passed between the three, their forward progress staying steady. Bakugo rocked up the steps at speed, Kirishima and Mina hustling to keep pace as they overtook the adults at the front. Their group was just beaten over the top step by Ida, who only just avoided breaking into a full-out run. Naoto had fallen in line with Hokuto and the others. As students passed the crest of the staircase ahead of them, Ochako noted the steadily fading sound of footfalls from those in front. Nearing the top, the sight of a dozen-plus people silhouetted against the midday backdrop of the city skyline was the first thing to greet her. She heard the skeletal Toshinori take in a breath, Izuku observing him with curious eyes. Their little rear guard joined the silent group, shimmying themselves into line. And like most of the others, they too paused in place. At once Uraraka understood the nature of this particular lesson. A wide space was laid out before them, the floor covered in smooth tiles and mixing patterns of dark emerald and pure black. All around the large, square platform was a veritable mode of plant life, moist leaves and a myriad of colorful flowers bordering the space in nature. The walls adjacent to the staircase behind them were styled as rocky cliffs, vines and various flora climbing up a ways. Opposite those, offering a view of the city, were those titanic planes of glass, their height reaching several stories easily and allowing a wealth of sunlight to pass. In several rows, running in neat lines across the dark tiled floor, were many tall, four-sided monuments. The spear-shaped structures were over 3 meters tall, their surfaces made of coarse cobalt. A scattering of other people walked amongst the obelisks, the atmosphere overall one of quiet reflection. This in no way surprised any of the teachers or students, though some of the teens were slow to pick up on their destination in transit. There wasn't a soul in Japan looking to the hero track who wouldn't recognize this place. Mr. Senki breathed out, "Welcome to the orchard." The Memorial Orchard was a famous place. It couldn't be called unique really. Every country had at least one equivalent location. Most cities and even a few towns had smaller-scale versions of their own. The orchard was, however, the most prestigious hall of fallen heroes in Japan. No sooner did Hokuto finish his introduction that the group began to disperse. Aizawa strode off at once amongst the rows, walking with a clear destination in mind. Nedzu hopped off his mount partway, matching speed with the scraggly teacher even with his childlike stride. Ader resumed his military gait and hastily disappeared into the spines. Uraraka made to follow but paused after half a step. A quick tap from Hagakure sent her off like a gunshot, the brunette hurrying off in pursuit. At this point the collection of teens started to disperse. Midoriya stared after Ada and Uraraka for a short moment, questioning whether or not he should follow. His gaze was distracted by a shock of blonde hair, Kaken marching into view before pausing to toss a look towards an approaching Kirishima. The redhead presented both palms in a stance of mock surrender, a good-natured smile in place as he backed up towards Ishido and Kaminari. Izuku couldn't help but notice that Kaken seemed much more restrained than usual. Without a word, the grumpy blonde walked into the row of columns. Mineta stepped in front of the greenette. "So, what should we see first?" "I have an idea, follow me." Midoriya and Hagakure blinked as the skeletal Toshinori stepped past them, the gaunt man resting his palm on the former's shoulder for a brief moment. The notion of a destination seemed enough for Hatsume, who followed swiftly behind. She had her laptop opened and was typing away with one hand as her telescopic eyes darted about the various pillars. The 3 Aozora students started forward. Walking amongst the memorials was a sobering experience. The first few lanes of cobalt monuments were absolutely filled with names, all 4 sides etched in a myriad of cleanly inscribed characters. There were more people here than Izuku could ever hope to remember. There were probably more people here than there were years since the dawn of quirks itself. This made it all the more alarming to the young man when he did recognize names. He was, after all, deep in the hero fandom. Eiko Toyotomi, also known as the Blade Hero, Swordbirth, killed in action cleaving a building in half to save fleeing civilians. Kiba and Kyoko Izumi, the water hose duo, slain by the villain Muscular whilst protecting innocents from the maniac's rampage. Yuta Kaioshin, the barricade hero, Stalwart, fell during the siege of Musutafu's 12th precinct by the Metal Liberation Army. Izuku couldn't place his feelings at the moment. Yes, this was a place to honor the fallen, to remember them for their service, for their selfless final moment. But he had never been good with death, even in the case of heroic sacrifice. Loss was loss, and being surrounded by reminders of how violent and chaotic their world could be. The boy felt strangely numb. "Kiri, right over here. This is who you were looking for, right?" Midoriya glanced towards the speaker, catching sight of Mina as she hopped in place and thrust her pointer towards a high point on one of the columns. Kirishima jogged towards her with a hopeful air, stopping beside the pink girl and hastily scanning over names. A wide grin split his features a second later, lifting his palm for a high five from his horned companion. As the pair slapped palms, Kaminari stepped up and read aloud, "Crimson Riot. Lost in the floodwaters following the Great Urdnot Quake and Tsunami. His efforts helping to save over 500 lives, including dozens of his fellow heroes." He held the line. Ajiro's toothy grin reduced to a quiet smile. "Yeah, no hero in the world's more manly." Ashido gave her own pleased expression, a hint of pride as she regarded her middle school acquaintance. Denki continued staring at the memorial, nodding softly at his classmates' words. Izuku felt his frame jerk. Hagakure had a hold of his right arm, dragging him out of the way of a monument he was about to walk into. The boy looked sufficiently embarrassed, something that wasn't helped when Bakugo strode out from the far side of the angular structure. The boys met eyes for an instant before the blonde dismissed his childhood friend with a harsh scoff. Toru stuck her tongue out at the sourpuss. "You gonna be okay, Shouta?" The Aozora trio halted at their teacher's voice. Toshinori and Mei had already stopped, the former looking on in morbid interest as the dreaded engineer continued sweeping her sight about the tall stones and typing rapidly. Mr. Senki stood a few lanes over, posted up a few steps behind Mr. Aizawa. The UA teacher sat before a particular memorial, Even from this distance, Midoriya could see there were far fewer names on this obelisk. Nezu had descended from his perch and was resting just beside his coworker. The black-clad instructor gave no reply to Hokuto's inquiry. He looked even more tired than usual, his shoulders slumped and head dipped down. His line of sight seemed drawn to a name near the base of the four-sided spear. Nezu placed a hand on the man's leg. "I just need a moment." There was a quiet finality in Shouta's statement that Mr. Senki could read in an instant. The Aozora instructor nodded once before walking away, his hands planted firmly in his pockets. Osmond remained in place atop his head, oddly calm for the moment. The principal stayed with Aizawa. Toshinori watched on for a few seconds more before starting off again, prompting the rest to follow once more. Their little party pressed on down the rows, passing a few of their fellow students as well as some scattered patrons of the orchard. For a split second, Izuku thought he caught a glimpse of a nostalgic mess of colors, but backpedaling revealed only an empty view through the cobalt pyramid. Hagakure, having become an adept wrangler, ushered the boy back on track. They walked for some distance before they reached a clearing of sorts, set beneath the wall of windows to the outside world. On the far end of the memorial plaza, the pattern of inscribed structures gave way to a half-circle of stone benches curved around the border of the tiled space. A polished steel banister, long panes of glass running between, separated the smooth floor from the surrounding beds of flora. The barrier was only about waist-high for the average high schooler, a point Naota took advantage of as he stood on his tiptoes, resting his rear against the polished bar. In the middle of the half-circle formed by the benches and curving border rail sat a blackened boulder. The rock was rounded, ovular really, its surface smooth and running water cascading over it. Mist wafted up from the vegetation below, the area holding an almost ethereal feel. Midoriya could see more names on the watered stone. Even with the sun's light casting the rock in silhouette, he could easily make out the characters. They were glowing. Toshinori halted. It was a momentary thing, barely enough time for a calming breath. The bony blonde was starting forward in seconds, his final preparations made. Hokuto appeared from the right, apparently having moved adjacent to their own group. The two men made steady approaches to the dark stone. The Aozora students, and Hatsume, remained just at the edge of the line of spear-shaped monuments. He couldn't speak for the others, but something was holding Izuku in place. He wondered if this, maybe, was the same sensation that paused his mentor just moments earlier. This inevitability. "You need help finding a name." Hagakure turned to find the speaker, her hand still clamped upon Midoriya's shoulder. Standing to their left, still amongst the spires, was the violet-haired Ikaruga. Though it really shouldn't have been surprising given where they were. The boys couldn't help but blink seeing the spider girl with her smartphone holstered. Kisuke appeared to be maintaining his psychic status, resting a few steps behind the girl and scanning the scant names around the center of a nearby monument. The other girl, the one Ikaruga was talking to, was someone Izuku vaguely recognized. More than half the class was full of people the boy hadn't bothered putting names to. He really only took note of people once he saw their quirks, rude as it sounded. But this girl had a little more intrigue than just being the only blonde in the class, and Midoriya was fairly certain he'd seen her during the freshman crush just this morning. The blonde's curly mane was a veritable cascade of locks that fell across her shoulders and upper back. Though cut a bit shorter in the front, her thick puff of hair utterly obscured the top half of her face. Even so, she made no effort to sweep it clear, merely continuing to stand at the base of the memorial, an outstretched hand running over the glittering surface. "Don't worry about it." The girl's voice was incredibly soft. "It's always in the same spot." As she traced her fingers across the coarse stone, they paused over a column of characters, running her digits slowly over the chiseled name. Her glossy lips curved into a pleasant smile. "There you are." Izuku was pretty positive the girl was blind. Fujiko Nomura, the hero hopeful, and both the girls next to him immediately snapped their sights down to the diminutive Mineta. The tiny teen had a fist slammed atop his palm in the gesture of revelation. They let a moment of silence draw on before Hagakure pressed with an inquisitive, "You know her?" "Nope," the boy responded quickly. Toru cocked her head to the side, the display clearly unappreciated. "Then how did you know her name?" Minoru settled her with a truly bewildered expression, as though she were asking a question that simply explained itself. The pause that followed somehow piqued Mei's intrigue, the budding engineer leaning in like an eager child, his eyes sliding across the two girls, resting on Izuku, then panning back the way it came. Mineta replied, "I always know the names of all the cute girls around me." Midoriya snorted. Having that posed as a question pushed him over the edge. Mei nodded sagely, as though filing away the information. Hagakure took advantage of still having her sleeves rolled up and covertly slapped her palm atop one of the grape-head's orbs, lifting the small boy by his bulbous hair and shaking him like a rag doll. Izuku turned back to his other classmates. Kisuke perked, snapping his fingers at his sudden realization. "Hold up, I don't see a hero alias for this guy." The blind girl's smile widened, some teeth showing. Ikaruga gave her eyes a strong roll as she turned to her spike-haired classmate. Not everyone honored here is a pro. He was, Fujiko supplied, still facing the name etched into the cobalt stone. He was just off duty at the time. His son thought he would have wanted to be remembered as himself. Just a man, doing what he could. Kisuk looked like he was holding back tears. Ikaruga was stood next to him, patting his back as she stared forward with no expression. Fujiko offered no further response. Her curl-covered face staring steadily at the pointed monolith, fingers running slowly across its surface. Hagakure poked Izuku's cheek. "Hawa." The invisible girl pressed her invasive finger a little deeper into the boy's face. Then she turned his gaze towards Tashinori, the wiry blonde waving the hero hopeful over. With a small start, Midoriya hopped forth and hustled towards the man. When Izuku came in reach, Tashinori ushered him towards the rounded stone, laying a strong hand on the boy's back. Hokuto, standing opposite to his emaciated mentor, grunted in greeting. Osmond panted softly, maintaining his reserved air. A thin arm stretched out, pointer extended. Midoriya followed Tashinori's finger towards a glistening name beneath the even flow of water. The boy read aloud, "Nana Shimura." Tashinori's arm snapped back, placing his fist before his mouth. The man contained his coughs as best he could, his young ward throwing up his hands in preparation to support the sickly hero. He was waved off as Tashinori slowly collected himself. Hokuto had stepped in closer, effectively sandwiching Midoriya between the two instructors. Mei and Hagakure rotated around to the far sides of the two men, Mineta opting for his usual method of climbing up Izuku's back. The blonde man wearing a suit 3 sizes too large paused, sorting through his thoughts. "This is the grave of our country's greatest hero." Hokuto donned a soft smile as Minoru turned a quirked brow towards the lanky adult. "What are you talking about?" The boy started, a touch of condescension in his tone. "All Might's the greatest hero there ever was and he's still going strong." His green-haired mount resisted the urge to smack the orb-hawked teen. Tashinori supplied a rough chuckle in return. "And I'm sure the symbol of peace more than appreciates that." He threw a quick wink towards his protege, slapping a small smile on Izuku's face. "But I'll bet even he thinks highly of this person." "Why?" Tashinori turned to his immediate left, staring down at Hatsume. "Why would All Might look up to her? I don't think I've ever even heard of her." The skeletal blonde froze for a bit. It looked like actual cogs were spinning in his brain, attempting to form his musings into acceptable sentences. Mr. Senki stepped forward, clearing his throat as he moved. Nana Shimura wasn't really a hero, per se. Not the kind you see running around in capes and cowls nowadays. The Aozora instructor fell into silence, giving his chin a few taps, though I do suppose she also wore one of the former, bit of a thing for the theatrical, eh? Tashinori barked out a quick laugh. That's one way to describe it. The assembled students looked back and forth between the two teachers. Midoriya gave voice to their curiosity. "You knew her?" Hokuto shook his head, throwing a short nod towards his baggy-suited counterpart. Tashinori stepped out towards the smooth stone and turned to face the students. "She was an incredible person, always saw the potential in everyone and did her best to draw it out of them. By force, when she had to. I wouldn't be half the man I am today if I'd never met her." Hagakure took 2 long steps out of line with her classmates and Tashinori, rotating to face her entire body towards the blonde skeleton. Mineta added to the effect by leaning into view. His eyes squinted in scrutiny and a single brow arced. Boy had the nerve to give the emaciated man a full body once over. The hero in hiding had enough awareness to cough lightly into his fist, sheepishly avoiding the pair's eyes. Hokuto couldn't hold back his laughter. As the two adults made efforts to rebuild their dignity, return to their senses, Mei started tapping rapidly at her laptop's keys. Her eyes scanned the monitor with inhuman speed as words scrolled and pages popped open and closed at a breakneck pace. "I'm only really seeing some passing mentions of that name. Mostly a lot of community activism and some small-scale incidents. And yeah, no alias that I can see. Says her quirk had something to do with levitation." Mei's comments droned off into a gap of silence, broken only by the much more sedate speed of her typing and some calming breaths from a recovering Mr. Senki. In that momentary pause, Izuku's mind began going over Hatsume's report. It was interesting. You're wondering why someone who comes off so low-key has such an extravagant memorial. Midoriya jumped. The statement had logically been addressed at Mei, but Mr. Senki had delivered it whilst leaning into the boy's personal space, enough so that Minoru had abandoned his perch. The smile on the man's lips had lost none of its mirth. Hatsume remained quiet, as though the teacher's words had never been spoken. Her typing did slow a little. Hagakure locked her gaze on the approaching Naoya, his features torn between interest and annoyance. The invisible girl did nothing to hide her disapproval of the boy. Not that anyone would notice. She barely caught sight of Todoroki joining the group. A sitting rock made more noise than he did. Most eyes present trailed towards Hokuto, expecting him to elaborate further. The instructor hummed in thought, staring out through the windows to the upper reaches of the cityscape beyond. The students held a collective breath, maze typing crawling to a snail's pace, as the man with the off-color lock of hair took a deep, dramatic inhalation. And then he shrugged his shoulders. What? I don't know anything about it. Toshinori barked with laughter as the observing teens fell over, dumbfounded. Well, except for Todoroki and Naoto, the latter clearly intending to set his teacher on fire with his eyes. Midoriya recovered the fastest when his mentor started coughing blood. But as the hero hopeful reached for him, Toshinori waved the young man off, swiping an arm across his mouth. Brushing away any spilled blood, the emaciated blonde looked over the collection of youths gathered. Hokuto sent his colleague a quick wink before settling in himself. Toshinori rolled his eyes, then returned his gaze to the waterfall stone. Miss Shimura. Toshinori trailed off, as though considering his words. Nana had a very specific objective in mind when she fell into the field of heroics. It wasn't the kind of work considered appropriate for public broadcast. The wording there caused Toru and Izuku to suck in their breath. Naota's brow raised and Hatsune stopped typing altogether. Lynetta just looked confused, eyes darting between people helplessly and drawing an amused smile from Mr. Senki. Shoto, lacking reservations in general, bluntly gave voice to everyone's thoughts. Operations. Izuku released the air in his lungs. His secret mentor clapped a hand onto his shoulder, steadying the boy. As a hero fan and someone hoping to get into the profession himself, Midoriya had some working knowledge of operations. It wasn't a proper term. There was no official designation for such things as there was never meant to be any public record. It may have been more accurate to think of them as black ops, missions and tasks that, if discovered, were actively disavowed by the entities who ordered them. Pro-heroes are considered civil servants. They represent the hope and security of modern society. Even underground heroes, who operate more on the sly and tend to be most active at night, exist for the purpose of safeguarding the citizens and their way of life. Operations was the dark side of those efforts. To keep the innocent in the light, maneuvers had to be made in the shadows. After the utter chaos following the dawn of quirks, the Public Safety Commission had taken to ensuring the peace with particular zeal. Their near-authoritarian doctrine during the times of society's reconstruction garnered them a lot of opposition. Opposition that often came to dubious ends. Rumors of the PSC and their head squad heroes were spoken in hushed whispers. The demise of their opponents further served to cow rebellious and criminal elements back into the shadows, giving the common people foundation on which to build. The practice of simply looking the other way when strange affairs began to surround the commission became the norm. The leadership of Hero Society didn't have to do much to cover up. They just had to keep showing results. Toshinori made a big show of clearing his throat. There were 7 of them altogether, Nana and 6 comrades all working the same case. The man was far from graceful in his efforts to gloss over Todoroki's inquiry. No one so much as batted an eyelash at that. It was to be expected. The perpetrator they were pursuing was resourceful. It took many long years before they finally tracked him down. A small coughing fit racked Toshinori's form. This time everyone stepped forward to help, the skeletal man having to physically halt Midoriya from taking hold of him. He shrugged himself back into proper posture and continued. All of them died, one by one. Nana was the last one standing. Izuku still had a grasp on his mentor's arm and could feel the spike of tension in his frail limb. A glance at his face revealed the blonde's gaze steadily looking forward. Not at Miss Shimura's memorial. Through Miss Shimura's memorial, all eyes were on Toshinori now. Even Mr. Senki looked rather invested. But thanks to her, All Might got involved. Wait, what? Mineta couldn't hold back the outburst. This lady knew All Might. Toshinori hummed. I did say she had an eye for potential. Midoriya's interest turned to revelation, his eyes going wide. Miss Shimura was. All Might's wouldn't be half the man he is now without her. Came out of Hokuto, a wry smile in place. She brought a wraith out of the darkness. The symbol of peace put it to an end. An almost stereotypical student surpasses the master story. The Aozora instructor turned and jabbed his thumb towards the memorial stone. That's why Nana Shimura's name is here. Izuku was floored. All of the teens appeared taken aback by the story, but only he knew that they were hearing it straight from All Might himself. Miss Shimura was his mentor, a low-key pro-hero who embarked on a years-long venture against some nebulous force. The boy remembered, during those 10 months of hell on Dagaba Beach, asking All Might more about One for All. The idea of a quirk that could be passed from person to person still boggled the mind even weeks after first hearing it. Toshinori had made some mention about being the 8th holder of the power, with Izuku being the prospective 9. Nana was one of 7 comrades. Nana Shimura was the 7th holder, and whoever she was pursuing killed her. Her and every holder before her. Only All Might, the greatest hero the nation had ever known, had been a match. Midoriya now had a good idea of where his idol got that scar. Mineta was dumbfounded. From hearing about some sort of clandestine task force under the PSC, to learning about some no-name pro who just so happened to train the symbol of peace, his mind was reeling. His natural defense was to latch onto something familiar. Toru, seeing the spectrum of emotions playing out on the adjacent boy's face, would have cracked a smile at the overblown display, at least up until his eyes focused ahead, his expression sobering with concern. The invisible girl followed his gaze to Midoriya and Toshinori. The emaciated man seemed wrapped up in old sorrows, an expected reaction when visiting the grave of an old friend. But Izuku shouldn't have looked so hollow. For whatever reason, the tale of Nana Shimura had truly shaken him. Taking initiative, Hagakure made to walk over. Hokuto blocked her path. "Give them a minute, they'll be okay." The girl stared up at her instructor, Mr. Senki, feeling the weight of her eyes. He stood solidly in place, meeting her gaze, at least he hoped, whilst keeping a somewhat fretting Minoru in his periphery. He could hear Hatsum a bit behind him, her weight shifting as she seemed indecisive about what to do next. Hagakure took the first step, heading in the direction of the stairs leading back down into the terminal. Her hand snatched Mineta's sleeve, the stimulus like a green light that propelled him in her wake. As Hokuto turned to follow their retreat, he settled his sights on a still Todoroki. The boy with the bi-colored hair held his gaze for an instant before moving back into the rows of spires, not a hint of his true emotions on display. Mei was moving slowly in step behind Toru and Mineta. The rhythmic clack-clack of her fingers sniping keys had increased in speed, but her focus was clearly off the laptop's screen, her mind preoccupied. Naoto was a ways ahead of the pack, striding forth with his usual detachment. With the distractions dismissed, Hokuto himself began stepping away. He pointedly ignored the shock of sandy blonde hair atop a permanent scowl pitched behind one of the spires closest to the waterfall stone. Mr. Senki paused mid-stride, just enough to let the boy know he was aware of him, before continuing onward. Bakugo would never admit to holding his breath in that moment. Izuku's head stayed downcast, his brow scrunched in frustrated thought. He had questions. Oh boy, did he have questions. But one look at his predecessor all but smacked the notion of talking into the back of his throat. The boy was at an impasse. He wanted to know the history, not just of All Might, but whatever he could about his new quirk and its origins. Hell, this sounded like stuff Izuku needed to know, considering every past holder appeared to have played some part in whatever this was. But his respect for Toshinori, for All Might, for his mentor stayed his tongue. This simply wasn't the time. But if not now, when? All Might, Midoriya chanced in a breathless whisper. Their close proximity gave him confidence the man would hear it. When the teen got no response, even waiting a few seconds to be sure, he again opened his mouth to speak. Toshinori's thin, grasping fingers fell atop his ward's scalp, flattening his unruly curls. Izuku's mouth snapped shut like the jaws of a bear trap, the boy sucking in his lips to prevent any errant leaks of sound. His trainer held his gaze on the shimmering name beneath the flowing waters. Not right now. We'll talk about it later. It was more than good enough for the greenette. The hero hopeful turned his own sights on the inscribed name, pondering the life of the person who once held it. After a good moment of no further activity, Katsuki popped himself off the towering stone behind him and made his own way through the forest of spires. Hokuto greeted them with a smile, waving Midoriya and Toshinori over towards the open space between the first row of monuments and the descending staircase. A few students from both schools were already gathered, sharing muted conversations in tight groups. Aizawa and Nedzu were also back, the bestial principal standing rather close to the silent man. One of the first things Izuku took note of was the absence of his two most important classmates. He made sure to do a thorough scan of the crowd in case he missed the floating female uniform or the diminutive, ball-headed boy. Midoriya did notice Naoto standing a ways off from the gathering, pretty much idling on the boundary between the monument grove and the open floor leading to the descent. He swept his gaze away quickly, not wanting to gain the other boy's attention. This landed his sights on Kaken, who was openly staring at Izuku. When their eyes met, Midoriya felt himself freeze in place. Bakugo's usual heat was present, but there was something deeper in that shared gaze of theirs. It seemed like his old friend was searching for something, willing it out with his eyes alone. As time went on and he apparently wasn't getting the answer he wanted, an air of loathing began clearly setting in. Izuku tore himself away with an awkward show of scratching the back of his head, his demeanor equal parts sheepish and nervous. He didn't see the distant Naoto briefly observing the exchange. He also definitely didn't see the hand reaching towards him, not until he swung around and stepped face first into the falling limb. The bundle of nerves he had been wound into snapped all at once, the greenette hopping back with a dog-like yelp. Osmond, coming out of his sedate state, perked up instantly at the sound. Achako gave a little cry of her own, coiling back before her more heroic instincts urged her to reach in with her opposite hand. As Izuku tilted backwards, destined for a fall, the UA first year blasted his front with all 5 fingers. Expertly, her hand closed into a tight fist, clutching up the fabric of his blazer, as Midoriya's gravity was cancelled. Uraraka kept a firm hold of him. Izuku floated upward. I'm so sorry. Are you okay, Deku? I didn't want you to fall. The teen balloon shook the daze away, his entire body shifting at the motion. Uraraka's hold stayed firm. When Izuku focused on the person anchoring him to the ground, his face immediately went scarlet. He looked from the gravity-erasing girl to the glasses-wearing boy behind her. Ada looked to be in better spirits than he had been since coming to the orchard, but it appeared he had less of a grasp on the current situation than even Izuku himself. Midoriya then elected the tried-and-true solution of simply answering the girl's question. Fine. Perfectly fine. Couldn't be more fine. Osmond had arrived, now running in tight circles around Ochako's legs. From the amount of jumping going on, he desperately wanted a turn with the Midoriya balloon. Uraraka blinked, stared into the boy's twitching eyes for a moment, then let loose a pleased smile. Okay, that's good to hear. The girl relaxed her arm and Izuku swiftly started to rise. He bounced back down when her arm reached its full extension, her grip still tight as a vice. She turned back to Ada. What about you? Are you gonna be okay, Ada? The bespectacled teen just stared at her, shifting his sights up to Midoriya, then back to Uraraka in a repeating pattern. She did realize he was still floating, right? Did this essentially constitute unlawful detention of some kind? You wouldn't think it looking at Midoriya. Most of the young man's limbs were limp and dangling about, but he kept his left hand clutched over his jaw. Ada could just hear the boy going on a mumbling ramble concerning Uraraka's quirk. He seemed to be running through numerous applications of her ability, his eyes half-lidded as he appeared utterly consumed in his train of thought. Beyond the two, mingling in with the gathered students and teachers, Ada spotted his classmate Mina in a stable stance, one eye squinted and camera phone at the ready as she rapidly snapped pictures of Ochako and her boy float. The girl kept twirling her device, apparently quite indecisive about the angle she wanted. Ada looked back to Uraraka. Yes, I am fine now. The sound of his voice drew Izuku out of his ruminations. Oh yeah, you have been pretty stiff since we got here. His words drew a little, distressed sound of agreement out of Ochako. Osmond had ceased his physical efforts, sitting on his rump amongst the teens, his tail wagging in joy. Ada sobered, reclaiming a bit of that distance he'd held since their arrival at Shepherd's Station. But then he seemed to halt himself, freezing in place as he was readying a response. The boy took a short moment to, apparently, think over how to proceed. The quiet teen shut his eyes, released a breath, and then relaxed his posture. The look he returned to Izuku after was far more casual, if a little tired. Just family matters. Tenya trailed off after that, not sharing further. Midoriya offered a nod, bringing the conversation to an end. He could connect the dots well enough to understand. Beside, and slightly below him, Uraraka shed the tension off of her shoulders. This brought Ida's focus back onto his classmate, where it remained for a silent period. So, the bespectacled teen began, Are you going to let Midoriya down now? Ochako cocked her head, allowed her thought wheel to start spinning again, and then let her cheeks run scarlet. Yes. Oh my god, yes. I am so sorry. Between the girl's reaction and his own clarification of their current circumstance, Midoriya went into similar verbal meltdown. It's fine. It's fine. I wasn't even paying attention. Uraraka reached up with her free hand and took hold of Izuku's slacks. With two handholds, she brought the boy down and properly righted him. Releasing his shirt, she then walked both hands down his leggings, couching down as he marched her grip towards his shins. She was so preoccupied with this task that Uraraka failed to realize the image she was presenting. Izuku, upon gazing down at the top of her head, worked things out pretty quickly. But, being Izuku, the awkward boy instantly froze up, unable to voice his distress beyond a weak, high-pitched squeal. A similar problem plagued Tenya, though the boy's inability to reproach was due to how unbelievably blatant the display was. Mina was probably the slowest observer to show a reaction. This was out of sheer disbelief that such prime material was all but falling into her lap at the moment. From her perspective, she was looking at Midoriya's back. Ochako crouched in front of him, her face at waist level and hidden on the other side of his body, with her hands fisted in the fabric of his pants. It couldn't get more golden if there were sound effects. Release. Ashido was snapping photos at near triple the rate of before, simply ignoring the physical impossibility of such a feat. This finally tipped off Uraraka, whose eyes snapped open as she launched herself back, bouncing off of Ida's rigid frame. Osmond stared up at the stunned Midoriya, patiently panting. This lasted about 2 seconds before the vibrant pup belted out a sharp bark, shocking Izuku back into reality. Osmond pawed at the teen's legs, prompting the automated response of him reaching down and scooping the little dog into his arms. Just as planned, Izuku wasn't sure when Mineta had arrived. He only noticed the boy when he sailed a tiny shoe into the greenette's heel. The shot wasn't exactly painful, just enough to get Midoriya to do a double take. Minoru turned away from him, babbling on in some incomprehensible whisper about how unfair life was. Hagakure was beside Ida, helping him support Uraraka. Everybody back. Bring it in, people. Quite eager for an escape, Midoriya swiftly departed towards their beckoning instructor. Seeing as Izuku most certainly owed him for having all the luck, Minoru sprang up the taller boys back in rapid order, reclaiming his old throne atop the hero hopeful's left shoulder. Osmond sent a threatening growl towards the miniature teen, clearly upset at the thought of any seat standing higher than his own. Mineta almost felt cowed enough to vacate his position. The two supporting Uraraka carted her over to the masses, ignoring her protests right up until they were in amongst the crowd. As Ada immediately launched into lecture mode about situational awareness and how a young lady should take greater care in presenting herself, Toru's unseen arm snaked around a certain pink girl's trembling shoulders. The surprise ripped Mina out of her silent laughter. Having a headless girl's uniform seize you was unnerving. Having such done whilst you were cycling through the now thousands of shots you'd taken of a close friend being awkward around a boy, culminating in images that could easily be construed as her working him over, was pretty damn terrifying. That all came to a head when the space where ahead would be issued a stern command. You will give me your contact information, and then you share those pictures with me. All of them. The grin Mina adopted was downright ruthless. The classes gathered around, Mr. Senki standing front and center at the top of the staircase with Aizawa and Nedzu idling a bit to the side. Toshinori stood amongst the teens, like a tree in a field of grass. Naota had made his way to the front of the audience, looking on with a fair degree of attention. Bakugo and Kirishima stood next to him, the latter trying to engage both boys as both proceeded to dismiss him in their own ways, which boiled down to Naota stonewalling the interactions whilst Katsuki ground his teeth and called the redhead an idiot numerous times. Kisuk proudly marched through the loose grouping of students like he was on parade. From the way his arms were swinging, he was sorely missing the presence of a baton to twirl. Ikaruga followed behind, her hand held absent as one arm was occupied escorting the bouncing curls of Fujiko to the front of the audience. The spider girl looked incredibly unamused, possibly because her shorter charge was mimicking Kisuk's exaggerated motions, hers more akin to those of a small child doing a poor imitation of a parade man's march. Ikaruga had happened herself into the midst of two fools. Izuku stopped his approach right next to Hatsume, who had closed her notebook and had the device tucked under one arm. That meant she had one free hand, which Osmond was happy to take advantage of, his single excite yip signaling the dreaded inventor to turn towards him. He leapt from a startled Midoriya's grasp with utmost confidence, his bravery rewarded as Mei quickly snatched the pup out of the air and drew him into her chest, pressed into her generous bust and showered in cutesy praise. Osmond managed the puppy equivalent of a cocky smirk towards the diminutive grape head perched on Midoriya's back. Mineta looked like he was ready to burst a blood vessel at the sheer audacity. Hokuto cast a lingering gaze over the crowd of hero course students assembled before him. Toshinori offered a wave when his eyes settled on the older man, prompting a snort from the Aozora instructor. All right, people, I trust this lesson kind of speaks for itself. The absolute silence that followed said more than any words. Heroics is a profession where you regularly walk the tightrope between order and catastrophe. As this place demonstrates, even our most hallowed defenders are as mortal as anyone else. Sometimes people don't come home, and that's just looking at the ones commemorated by this memorial. Just think of how many rank-and-file psychics and street sweepers there are who lose their lives in the line of duty, and then remain nameless in our memories. Izuku swallowed. It was a sobering thought, one that swept through the crowd like a dark mist. He could feel Mineta trembling against his frame, the boys breathing uneven. All attention was on Mr. Senki. None, not even Hagakure, with how solemn the mood had become, took notice of the figure stalking slowly up behind them. Aizawa perked, but Nedzu gave his leggings a tight tug. There was no sin greater than ruining a surprise. We've been over some heavy stuff today, and this last stop is the veritable bedrock of it all. I don't mean to bring the wind out of your sails and leave you disillusioned, but I do advocate for a more realistic view of our profession and the ones with the courage to undertake it. That said, the one last thing I want to present is kind of the big bow that wraps all these other things up. For that, I have one last guest speaker. Almost the moment Hokuto uttered the last syllable of his sentence, Izuku felt a pair of arms wrap around under his arms. At once a chin laid itself on the shoulder opposite Mineta, a puff of teal-violet hair brushing against the right side of his face. I hope you didn't think you were safe just because you left middle school. The spike of fear Izuku had felt gave way in an instant to recognition and a sudden breath of excitement. Turning partially to the speaker, and then having to spit out a bit of teal-magenta hair that got in his mouth, the greenette exclaimed, "Ms. Takami." Bingo. The woman lilted, unhooking him from her grasp as she drifted backwards. The crowd that had been focused on Mr. Senki did a swift about-face at the newcomer, Hagakure in particular looking rather off-put at being snuck up on. Bakugo had by far the best reaction, his eyes going wide as dinner plates before he abruptly turned his head in the opposite direction, squaring his shoulders and hunching slightly to decrease his profile. Only being at the now back of the gathering saved him from the scrutiny of his classmates, Kirishima in particular. Takami, catching sight of her former student with brutal ease, threw up a hand and started waving wildly. Little Katsuki is here too. Hello, little Katsu. If she had been anyone else, Bakugo may have been tempted to explode her. Hokuto, ever the social hero, speared through the student herd to reach their newest guest. Arms spread wide like a game show presenter, the red-shirted man began a grand rotation around the woman. Boys and girls, for your viewing pleasure, Yuzu Takami. The emphasis on words was quite intentional. Besides the tie-dye hair, Ms. Takami was a literal mess of colors. The leather half-jacket she was wearing was a gradient of hues, running from hot orange at the top to a cool burgundy at the bottom. The fur lining peeking over her shoulders was fucking pink. Her undershirt was a loose cotton thing that seemed to depict the noon sky, solid blue with white poofs all throughout. And those pants were just terrible, a shimmering azure fabric with a persistent scale pattern. It was like someone found an off-color alligator and decided its skin was destined for fashion. Absolute madness. Takami took her most dramatic bow, one arm curving beneath her as the other stretched out towards the ceiling. All the while Hokuto completed his orbit, stepping off to the side as the notable lack of applause continued to play out. The rather chromatic woman allowed the moment to drag on for an almost daunting period of time before sharply drawing her stance upright. Despite the utter lack of support from her listeners, the brightest grin lit up her features. Indeed, but please, in this context, Dr. Takami would be more appropriate. Even looking away from the woman, Katsuki suppressed the urge to roll his eyes. She would notice and he really didn't want any more of her focus. Izuku, on the other hand, just looked more and more excited seeing one of his favorite people again. Toru picked up on this pretty quickly. Midori, you know this lady. Izuku presented his classmate with his biggest smile. Sure, Ms. Midoriya froze at the sudden rush of malevolence. He could almost feel the face-splitting grin, clenched eyes, and deathly aura radiating into his flank. Dr. Takami, the wave of malice faded, was our counselor back in middle school, Kaken and me. The mention of his name made the blonde bomber flinch. Now Kirishima was trying to console him, which just made Bakugo grit his teeth tighter. Hagakure tossed a curious gaze between the boy and she of many colors. Okay, but what is she doing here? Midoriya raised a finger that was promptly snapped up in Takami's grip. Mr. Midoriya, I'll be doing the presentating, if you don't mind. The middle school therapist looked out upon the mass of teenagers. Now then, I'm sure your other fabulous chaperones, at this, Hokuto beamed to the crowd, have drilled in the simple truth that being a pro hero makes you neither infallible nor invulnerable. I know that's easy to understand right now, but when you've got a nation's worth of people praising your name and you're given your free license to use your quirks to their full potential, those thoughts can get a little muddled. Takami reached into that abominable coat of hers and pulled out a stack of cards, shifting one into Izuku's hands with the dexterity of an expert dealer. Then she started a path through the gathered students, as my dear former patient blurted out with such zeal, I'm a counselor by trade, I look after the emotional and mental well-being of others. She made fast progress through the throng of teens, flicking cards left and right with swift precision. Ikaruga snatched her own out of midair. Kisuke's flew high and ricocheted off his considerable pompadour, the Spider-Girl's free hand lashing out to catch it as well. There was a brief rustling beneath the bottom of the perplexed top before Fujiko raised her own hand and snatched a card between two fingers. Kisuke whistled before pinching his card out of a stunned Ikaruga's grasp. Izuku, with Minoru glancing over his shoulder, read over the rigid slip of paper, noting Dr. Takami's name, an address, phone number, and hours of operation. He sent his old confidant a curious look which she returned with a quick wink. And as a more recent development, I've gone semi-independent. Mr. Senki threw up his arm and stepped into frame in front of her. To sum things up, the principal of Aozora has brokered a freelance agreement with the good doctor for her to operate as an out-of-facility therapist. As far as you students are concerned, the school itself will be footing the bill for any services you require of her. Dr. Takami jabbed two fingers into the space beneath Hokuto's left armpit. An even-pitched bzzzt sound pushed through her teeth and the brunette with one strand of blonde leapt away like a startled cat. Osmond offered the puppy equivalent of laughter, earning him further head pats from an enraptured May. The freelance counselor reclaimed center stage. Barring some people's lack of patience, she sent a withering glance towards a somewhat nervous Hokuto. I'll be happy to work with you. A hand rose. Takami nodded towards the boy with the spiky red hair. Ijiro roused to action by Bakugo's poor response to the woman. Why's the other school relying on you? Don't they have an in-house therapist? Aozora is becoming a pretty big name in the hero community, aren't they? The doctor never wavered from her good mood. The answer to that is twofold. On one hand, sometimes it's easier talking to somebody outside your circumstances. Not always viable to confide in a person who we see casually on the daily. A few heads nodded at that, the UA attendees in particular. Aizawa had given them flat directions towards Hound Dog in the event that any issues, tangible or otherwise, came up in their schooling, daily lives, or state of being. And while it was nice having a dedicated member of staff qualified to support them as well as being an accomplished pro in his own right, some could see where that may lead to awkward discussions. Speaking to someone removed from all that did have its merits. Second is that I was offered a position in-house. Turned it down, not feeling the vibe of working under an institution anymore. That drew some questioning gazes, the most intense of which coming from Izuku and Katsuki. Throwing up her arms and crossing them behind her head, Takami declared, "Feel free to come see me during those hours of operation I laid out. Any other time, call the number and I'll see what I can do. That goes for you UA brats too. I'll just send Nedzu the bill afterwards." The mouse, dog, bear gave his little paw a twirl, flicking one of Dr. Takami's business cards into view between his digits. "Oh, I'm sure we can have a nice chat about all that later. But yes, students, feel free to seek outside help if it makes you feel more comfortable." Takami bowed to the strange mammal, straightening before she continued, and for added ease, the woman thrust her thumb back over her shoulder, pointing through the orchard's massive windows to one of the high-rises resting across the street. "My office is literally right next door. You can't ask for easier access than that." Before any questions could be asked, Aizawa pushed past a still-shaken Hokuto and started to elaborate. "For those of you unaware, most of the train lines and a few bus routes that come through Shepherd Station are free for students. As long as you have your school ID, you can ride anytime." The chromatic doctor piped up. "This place is a pretty major transport hub and sees a lot of traffic during rush hours, but things stay fairly moderate on off times and there's a good amount of shops and eateries within a few blocks. Plus, this spot gets a lot of hero patrols, so there tends to be a lot less chaos if you ever want a place to hang out and unwind. Allowing yourself to relax now and then can be just as important as training and study. You can have that bit of advice for free." With that, the good doctor clapped her palms together. The sound was louder than it had any right to be, and again Katsuki had to suppress the need to twitch. Aside from Toshinori, none of the adults appeared anywhere near as fazed as the students, their eyes all looking towards the still silent Mr. Senki. The man still looked a little taken aback. Osmond wiggled free of Hatsume's grasp, scrunching up his tiny body in preparation. Nedzu grinned openly as the little pup bounded from the girl's arms, taking a terrific leap from the young engineer to his frazzled owner. In particular, he was aiming for the man's head. Puppy paws wrapped around Hokuto's skull as Osmond clutched his front onto the teacher's face. The man pitched backwards, catching himself at an angle that would make a limbo champion smile. Osmond's tail gave him a furious beating around his neck and cheeks. Naota planted a hand against his teacher's upper back. Somehow, he had crossed from the back of the group to the front without anyone's notice. Toru looked completely taken aback, bewildered by the fact that now two people had maintained stealth in her presence. The silver-haired boy then threw his instructor into an upright position. He'd used a fair bit more force than necessary, ending with the man stumbling forth before toppling forward. Mr. Senki landed on hands and knees, Osmond still happily whipping his tail across the man's features. Naota continued to stand nearby, stoic as his teacher was laid out, almost prostrated before him. It was apparent, even if not on his face, that the boy took a good deal of joy in all this. Hokuto raised his head, his canine mask still wagging away, and panned his head slowly across the crowd in front of him. This in spite of the fact that he obviously couldn't see a thing with Osmond in the way. After a long moment of this, he graced them with his closing statement. "All right, that's enough for today. Fuck off, people." Katsuki spat out a bark of laughter, already stomping down the stairs at a swift march. The opening of this chapter really dragged me across the coals. I ended up restarting this so many times that I had to forego my usual practice of writing it out on paper first and just went straight to typing. It was originally going to be a much longer segment with greater characterization for the U18s and more interactions between them and the main cast. I scrapped that pretty quickly since I didn't want to spend more time on public transportation and felt the need to move on. Finding that balance between keeping things from dragging and still making an amusing scene was much more of a challenge than I was banking on. Sometimes writer's block gets us bad. Couple of references here to go through. Shepherd Station is a pretty clear-cut nod to Mass Effect. I don't think it needs any clarification. I do like transport hubs as an environment, so we'll probably see this lace again. Possibly more than once. I feel like places like the Memorial Orchard should be fairly standard in modern hero society, especially with the way people elevate the profession and those who hold it. I like the idea of this artificial grove of memorial stones surrounded by actual plant life, more of my environmental preferences shining through. There's little meaning behind the couple hero names that Izuku recognizes while passing through the orchard. Kiba and Kyoko Izumi are the names I picked out for Kouda's parents, and the theme there was names that begin with K. Seriously, about 0.1% of thought went into that. Eiko Toyotomi's alias, Swordbirth, is a nod to High School DxD, it being the name of the sacred gear held by Kiba Yumuto at the start of the series. Yes, that's also where I got the name for Kouda's father. Her ability to cleave a building in half is an image straight out of One Piece SNI's lobby. The whole thing with Stalwart's death at the siege of the 12th Precinct is a nod to the movie Assault on Precinct 13. Throwing this out there in case anyone feels inspired. But I would love to read a My Hero Academia take on the plot of the movie. Also wanted to take a moment to build up background for the MLA in this universe. There's a lot of potential in that group that canon just doesn't explore. Crimson Riot's Memorial has some Mass Effect flavor thrown in. Urdnot is the clan name of Rex and Grunt, your Krogan squadmates throughout the original trilogy. Any disaster that could take down the manliest hero deserves a suitable namesake. The ending blip of He Held the Line is ripped from one of the most iconic moments towards the end of the first game. If you know, then you know. Fujiko is a character I added a small cameo appearance in an earlier rewrite chapter. There's a tiny section during the Freshman Crush where she makes a brief showing before diving back through the crowds. This is a more proper introduction to her. Fujiko's name is derived from Fujiko Mine of Lupin 3 fame, and her last comes from Fudo Nomura, the main character of Armed Girl's Machiavellism. A big part of this chapter is getting Izuku up to speed somewhat on the history of One for All. It always irked me how clueless he was about Nana's very existence, what with how much Yagi seems to revere her in some ways. I also wanted a way for the information to be conveyed that would lend itself towards showing Izuku's attention to detail, even if in a small way. Hence Toshi's story having just enough connective details for someone in the know to pick up on the actual narrative, Midoriya managing to connect the dots pretty readily. Aizawa's moment is a nod to the Vigilantes series that preluded main MHA. If you read it, you already know whose name he's looking at. Operations is the slang term I'm using for the PSC's more underhanded tactics. Like the mention of the MLA before, it's another direction I'm trying to build the setting. I do feel like Hero Society would turn a blind eye to the shadier dealings of their protectors so long as the outcomes are more often positive than negative. Whether or not that will last in this world remains to be seen. The bit with Uraraka on her knees hit me all at once. I instantly added 3 pages worth of content on that gag alone. I hope Mina appreciates the lengths I go to for her amusement. Ada comes from a long line of heroes, in his own words. I imagine they'd have a section all their own in a place like this, almost like a memorial tomb of sorts. This definitely isn't his first time here, but it never gets any easier. Decided since they aren't as close in this universe that Midoriya would stay largely out of his business. Wanted Ochako to go along to show solidarity with her friend, classmate, and it was also a convenient way to clear her out of the more intimate scenes with Izuku and Toshinori later. Main cast only, please. Takami comes back, and we get her first name. I have to throw this out there. The name Yuzu comes straight from one of my Earl friend's dogs. Pooch stares straight through people, can go like half an hour without blinking. If either of them ever read this, you're welcome. And with that, we've reached the end of our field trip arc. Next time, plot progresses and some new actors step onto the stage.